Hey there, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com, and I want to thank you genuinely for buying this series. It's a really big deal. The whole Ctrl Paint experiment would not exist if you weren't going to the store and buying these videos, so it really counts. I'm especially excited about this 5-part series. Here you have part 1, maybe you also have the other parts, but what we're going to do is a difficult challenge. And the challenge is to pick up your stylus and to do nice, clean line drawing in Photoshop. But you go on the internet and you ask this question, and it just kills me. The answer that all the pros give is just practice. You practice a lot and you're going to be better. Well, that's sort of true, but I think it's a little unfair. So for the last year or so, I've been trying to think about what's the right answer to this question. What am I doing when I make a drawing that I've now totally internalized, but that at one point wasn't obvious? How could I break down this mechanical skill of sort of moving your arm and explain it in simple steps? Well, so that's where the idea of these 5 parts came from, is the acknowledgement that it's not just one skill that you're practicing. It is building up various skills and sort of using them in concert to eventually do something that'll feel very natural. Well, at first, it's not going to feel natural. I just want to get that out there right away. This is a hard skill, and like learning the piano, it's going to be messy and it's going to be rough at first. But if you stick with it, it's going to get better. Now, as I break it down, I ask you to sort of trust me, to have faith that what I'm explaining is not arbitrary, because it's not going to be a direct path. Well, my thesis is actually that the best way to draw a confident, tight contour drawing is to start by drawing wide, blocky charcoal drawings. To get narrow, first we need to go wide. To go slow and controlled, first we need to go fast and loose. It's not obvious. And of course, I can't promise results. The only way you can get results is by practicing, and I can't force you to do that. But if you stick with me through part 1 here, and then hopefully parts 2 through 5 as we progress, I'll lay out a path towards making that contour line drawing in Photoshop. Along the way, we're going to be doing lots of weird scribbling and all sorts of stuff we'll get into, none of which looks like stuff you have in a portfolio, but it's all got a purpose. So get out your stylus, limber up, and let's start drawing. If you've been coming to Ctrl Paint for a while, you know that I have sort of 2 opinions on custom brushes. One is that you don't really need anything fancy. All you need are basic brushes. The hard part is actually doing the painting. The other opinion I have is that sometimes custom brushes are really nice. Sometimes they give you a really specific look, and that's great. Well, I went back and forth on how I wanted to handle this series, but ultimately what I decided is to include a set of custom brushes. But don't think of them as the brushes you're going to use for every painting you do in the future. Think of them instead as something that is just part of this training, like your school supplies. And if we all start with the same school supplies, we are just going to be able to focus on the exercises themselves and not worry about brush settings. So I don't want to spend the time right now, but if you want to know more about the included brushes, go to the resources folder and you'll find a video that explains each brush in detail, as well as how to install .tpl files. So before you proceed, you might want to go ahead and install those just so you're ready to follow along with the rest of the videos. But before we get started with the drawing, I have to say a warning. And this is serious, really. Don't hurt yourself. I've known too many artists that work too hard and then find themselves with a repetitive stress injury. You might have heard of carpal tunnel, for instance. Well, these are no joke. You can get them by working too hard and by ignoring your body when you're in pain. So I'm going to be recommending we do a bunch of exercises that are repetitive. They have you moving your arm repeatedly for a long period of time. Well, as soon as you start to feel sore, stop. Take a break. Do some stretching. Figure out a more comfortable way to draw. There is nothing more important than your health, so take it very seriously. Now, none of these things are dangerous, and all of the exercises that I'm encouraging you to do, I've done plenty of myself. But it is important to mention that you are going to feel sore at some point, and when you do, stop drawing. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get our school supplies installed, and we'll start some drawing. So the other night I was trying to figure out how to introduce this very basic first exercise we're going to do, and I had a great eye-opening experience. I was actually cooking a bechamel sauce with my wife, and I'm not that great at cooking, but she's really good. And at the moment, it was my job to stir the sauce. So what I was doing was this. Big, slow arcing motion right around the outside of the pot. You know what was happening? It was getting lumpy. At first, I didn't even really realize it was getting lumpy, but once I knew that it was getting lumpy, I didn't know why it was, and I didn't know what I could do to change that. And she said, well, you're stirring it wrong. Obviously. I mean, look at your technique. It's just totally wrong. So she took the spoon and said, no, here's what you need to do. Faster, smaller strokes in a bigger circle. So you're sort of moving your arm more quickly. I'm sort of holding the whisk more firmly, and then I'm covering more ground like this. Well, the second time I made the sauce, it was so much better. But I kept thinking about this, and it was totally not obvious. Who stirs like that? I mean, now that I've been taught how to do it that way, I'll do it in the future, but I never would have just guessed that randomly. And I realized this is exactly the same as drawing. The way that you hold the stylus, the way that you move your arm, these are not obvious things. If you've been drawing for a really long time, you're probably not even thinking about how you do it. So there's going to be 2 aspects to the exercises we do during this course. One aspect is going to be trying to recreate what I'm making, and that's important. But the more important aspect is trying each exercise in different ways to figure out what feels best for your body. It's going to depend on how tall you are, how you're seated at your desk, whether you're drawing on a Cintiq or a traditional USB tablet. But we're going to think a lot about the way our body is physically moving and what result that yields on the page. Okay, now my little introduction here with the soup is actually pretty relevant because what we're doing for the first thing is drawing ovals, sort of like stirring the pot. I had an excellent drawing professor one time that said, okay, I know some of you know how to draw. Today you don't. Pretend we've never drawn before. Take this charcoal. Here, if you want to follow along, you can use a charcoal tip. And we're going to draw ovals. We drew big ovals, we drew small ovals, light ones, dark ones. We did it literally for 2 hours. At the end of it, I felt like I had been at the gym working out. I mean, it was really intense. It was eye-opening. So that's what we're going to do. You and I, we are just going to draw ovals like this. Now, like stirring the pot, it might not be obvious to you how I'm making sort of big, smooth marks. The technique does matter, and it's going to vary a little bit, but what I'm doing is I'm drawing from my elbow and from my shoulder. This is weird. If you've never done this before, it's going to feel a little strange. So what I mean by that is my hand is actually pretty stiff. I'm sort of resting the knuckle of my smallest finger right on the tablet surface, just for stabilization, but my fingers aren't really moving. What's moving is my shoulder, my elbow a little bit as well. And the bigger the mark, the more my arm gets involved. If I were to stop making big circles and instead make like a little slinky like this, well, now I'm doing a different motion. To accomplish this tight of a swirl with only my shoulder would actually be really hard. So for this, I'm going to do what you might do naturally, which is just anchor the palm of your hand and to draw with your fingers. Small marks, fingers are okay. Big marks, you can't just draw with your fingers. There's no way you could draw this sort of oval with your palm planted and just drawing with your fingertips. But that's why a lot of people sort of can't get past this hump. They only ever draw with their fingertips with small little marks like this. So what that means is they might have cool, tight control, but if they needed to do a big gestural mark, they wouldn't be able to do it. So there'll be time later for drawing with fingertips and drawing tight little stuff. For now, let's draw from the elbow and draw from the shoulder. So as you're drawing your ovals, this is a great time to just look at your hand. Think about, is this a comfortable way of holding the stylus? There are a bunch of different grips that people use. None of them is the best. It's really up for you to decide. But it's important to be able to have your hand sort of comfortably firm. So right now, to make these big marks, again, my fingers are not moving. They're just sort of gently grasping the stylus such that my elbow and my shoulder can do the work. Another thing to consider while you're doing this is what is the angle between your hand, the stylus, and the surface of the table. Some people like to draw with the stylus tip straight up and down. I personally have trouble with that, so mine's more at an angle. But drawing these ovals is just a great time to kind of forget subject matter. Just think about, what am I doing? What is my body physically doing to make these marks? Do it long enough and you can sort of detach yourself a little bit. It becomes a muscle memory, almost like you're practicing sports drills or playing scales on an instrument. And that's really what we're moving towards. This sort of motion is not going to be something you think about actively. Right now, I hope you're thinking about it actively. But like my wife and cooking sauces, down the road, this stuff is going to be totally second nature. But it's important to try a variety of different motions. Try seeing what is possible with just your fingertips. See how big of an oval, actually let's practice that with blank sheet here. How big of an oval can you draw with your palm anchored on the page? If I stretch, that's about as big as I can get. So there's something interesting to know, that essentially if I'm limiting myself to drawing with my fingers, I have about that much real estate that I can draw inside of, because that's about the extent that I can sort of stretch my fingers while keeping the palm of my hand like planted right on the tablet. So that's something that I've learned about myself. If I need to make a bigger mark, say I need to go from here all the way to here, I obviously can't plant my fingers. That's not going to work. Instead, I'm going to need to lift my hand, sort of remove the force from my palm, and instead graze across the surface of the tablet, draw from my shoulder and my elbow. But we'll hold off on lines for a minute and deal with that in another video. Right now, really just draw ovals. Now you'll notice there's been sort of an axis to my ovals. They've been in this orientation. Well, that is no accident. That's just the geometry of my body. It is harder for me to draw an oval in this direction than it is in this direction. That's another thing that I've just learned about myself. If I was left-handed, it might be the opposite. But you sort of find this comfortable zone, motions that are, something that you can reproduce over and over and over again, because it's just sort of natural for your shoulder or your elbow to bend that way. So if what I needed to do was draw an oval that was this shape, what I'd do is I'd rotate the canvas. So I could rotate the canvas and then essentially draw the same oval that's actually in a different direction. And if you've ever drawn on paper, you probably just do this without even thinking about it. You're moving the paper around your desk. You're maybe zooming in to kind of get close to do a small something, zooming out to do a bigger something. Well, Photoshop shouldn't be any different. The newer versions of Photoshop all have this canvas rotation feature, which is really very easy to manipulate. So between a couple hotkeys, I can rotate and really quickly find that comfortable spot. And I actually don't do this a whole lot while I'm recording just because it makes the video a little harder to follow. But when I do my normal sort of personal artwork, I am constantly rotating the canvas. My arm is good at making a few marks, and that's about it. So I just move the canvas to get in the right position. So the first assignment I want you to do is just to draw ovals and fill a page. See if you can do it for a half hour straight, maybe 40 minutes straight. See if you can go from dark to light, modulating pressure as you go. Can you make this slinky shape using your fingers and get bigger and bigger and bigger? If you wanted to accomplish that, how would you do it? So here I'm sort of playing with how much of the palm of my hand is resting to make that anchor, which is a little bit different than if I were to make a big oval like this one. I'm sort of using a different grip. Here I'm gliding my hand over the surface of the tablet, using more control from my forearm and my elbow, whereas here I'm kind of modulating how much palm is anchoring me down and allowing me to really just sort of fling my fingers around. But this is an important step. I know it does not seem glamorous. It doesn't look anything like drawing dragons. Really, it might not seem obvious why we're doing this. The more of this you do, the more the sort of later power is going to unlock. This just builds a mechanical foundation for the more detailed stuff that we're going to do. So please, please, please take it seriously and draw lots and lots of ovals. Now, I know it's going to be tempting to hit next and just to watch the next video right away. I don't think that's a good idea. We are going to move on and start talking about other things, but I'm going to make the assumption that you've spent some serious time doing ovals before continuing. All right, let's draw some straight lines. This is hard. I'm not going to lie. You're not going to be doing this perfect on your first try, but that's what we're here for. We're here to practice, right? So go ahead and get the charcoal tip out. I'm going to use sort of a dark color here. Now, if you want to draw from A to B, it seems obvious, right? You're going to just start at A, draw, 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 go to B, and stop. Well, what we need to start working on is dynamic mark making, something that can be done from the shoulder or from the elbow, not necessarily from the fingers. If you wanted, for instance, to draw a line all the way across your page, it'd just be hard to use that strategy. So what we're going to practice is called overshooting. Now what that means is that I might put down my stylus tip here on A, and I'm going to go past B. So watch how this works. It's going to be a quicker line. You can see here it started a little lighter, gets darker, and then it gets lighter at the end. That indicates that here is where I was sort of giving it the most pressure. Well, the nice thing you can do now is just erase what you don't need. So this straight line I got here was much easier than trying to start, accelerate, and then stop here at the end. I'm going to exaggerate, but probably what you end up getting here is you don't quite get to the end, or you draw and you kind of have a hitch at the end. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you kind of tense up and try and stop at one exact point. Instead, just go past the target. You don't need to go so far past it, but go a little past it. And you've definitely seen people drawing this way before. Maybe you didn't realize what they were doing. If you've ever seen someone drawing like a cube and they're kind of extending these line segments past the intersections, well, that's what they're doing. They are exaggerating the length of these lines because they want really this sweet spot. The center of the line, that's the good bit. The beginning and the end, sometimes they're not so good. So if you have an eraser, you can just erase those away. But what that allows you to do is to just use the best part of the line and to sort of anticipate it and to draw with that in mind. Now, just like with ovals, the angle of the canvas is really going to help you out here. For me, as a right-hander, it's easiest to draw lines in this direction, harder to draw lines in this direction. I feel like I'm kind of straining against myself to draw this way, so the lines just aren't going to be as straight. Well, I'll use that to my advantage. So if I needed to draw, for instance, A to B here, drawing up is really hard for me. Well, I'll just put it in a direction that works to my advantage. So there, I could draw a straight line that way, regardless of the actual orientation of the page. Another thing you'll learn while you're doing exercises like these is that a certain length of line is going to feel the most comfortable to you. So we'll play with zoom to help that to our advantage. So if you wanted to draw a small line or a big line, they could be essentially the same size as you draw them, just like the ovals, nothing different here. Another interesting trick is to draw a long straight line. Sometimes it's easiest to pull straight down the center axis of your own body. You're sort of pulling it towards your belly button. And this works best if the stylus and the tablet are right in front of you. If the tablet is sort of off to the side on your desk, this is going to be a little bit harder. But if you're able to align your hand to be literally like on a string straight out from your belly button and sort of pull in towards yourself, you can pull an amazingly straight line. Here I'm sort of resting my palm and sliding it along the tablet surface. So I'm doing a bit of stabilizing. My fingers are still, and the muscles and bones that are moving are really more my shoulder and a little bit of elbow. Remember, big mark, big muscle. Small mark, small muscle. So this will be my fingertips. I could make, short little hatching lines like this. But if I wanted to make bigger line segments, I'd be sort of locking my hand and wrist and pulling from the elbow. But once again, there's no perfect way to do this. My encouragement is that you try this with a variety of different grips. Try holding the stylus as lightly as you can. See how that happens. See if you can make a bunch of light marks in sequence. It's harder than it looks. Don't worry so much about exactly where they're ending. Maybe you pull 2 long lines and then do a bunch of hatching sort of like this. Don't worry if they're not starting and stopping in exactly the right spot. Just get used to kind of the mechanics of pulling straight lines. How is it going to work best for you? Zoom out and try it. Zoom in and try it. Pull directly down towards the center of your body. Just play around. Nobody is watching. You're not putting this in your portfolio. Just see what line making feels like. And remember, what we're doing now is loose drawing. We are just kind of trying to shake out the kinks and get used to using the stylus. We're going to do accuracy, technical drawing in later videos. But right now, just focus on moving. It's like a dancing class or something. You just got to kind of loosen up and see what your body's capable of. And a lot of it is really possible only through repetition. So put on some good music and just make a bunch of lines. Now the next technique is a little bit hard to see because you can't see what my hand is doing, but it's called ghosting, or doing sort of a practice swing. And if you've played golf before, you know exactly what this looks like. Instead of seeing where I want to start and where I want to stop and immediately just drawing a line, instead I'm going to kind of get my body ready. So what I'm doing is I'm moving my hand hovered just above the tablet. Now in this case, I am dragging that pinky knuckle, so my hand is sort of grazing across the tablet surface, but I'm just telling my body kind of how far and how fast the stroke is going to go. And when I feel like I got it right, then I'm going to do the same motion, but I'm going to drop the stylus and actually make a mark. So what I've done there is I've kind of trained my brain with a couple practice strokes. So you do a couple ghosts, and then you drop it down. Now, it's not going to be perfect every time, and that's why we're practicing this. But a really fun exercise to do is to just make a bunch of dots all over your page, and then let's just connect them dot to dot. And you're going to ghost before every one you do. So I'm using the zoom and the canvas rotation to find kind of a comfortable sweet spot for it, a line that's not too long, not too short, and then just figure out how you want to connect these. You could make triangles. You could make sure that you're pulling straight towards your body if you want. Sometimes those lines are slower. Maybe you can zoom out so you can make a faster line. But you're ghosting as you do this. And only once you're feeling comfortable, then you drop the stylus and make your mark. Now you notice that I'm not erasing. I'm not caring about if it didn't work out quite right. This is just a bunch of practice dots. The goal here is just to keep moving and not be too critical. There I did undo one and step back, but really I should have left it. You don't need to be so perfect and finicky about this. This is about kind of making quick marks and teaching your brain how to move your hand around the page. The next exercise is to make a bunch of sets of parallel lines. These are going to be sort of your A and B. So once you have those set up, just see if you can start at one end and draw to the other side. And see if you can kind of have evenly spaced hatching marks to connect the two. Once again, you're going to be moving the canvas to find that sweet spot. But we're keeping our fingers still and drawing from the elbow if possible. If you wanted, you could try sort of zooming into a distance where your finger could be what you draw with. And here I'm anchoring my palm drawing this way. But really the idea here is to get used to using more of your arm to do the drawing. These are big marks, big muscles. A variation of this assignment is to start light and then get darker and darker and darker as you go. Another thing is to start with big spacing and then get smaller and smaller and smaller. The point is you're sort of teaching yourself to draw a certain length line and just repeat over and over. And if you can see them wavering like mine have done here, figure out why it was. In my case, it's because they got physically too close to my body, and here my elbow is actually kind of bumping into my stomach. Well, that's a good indication that I'm drawing with improper form. So for those, I might kind of erase those away and figure out a better place that I could place the camera to help me out. So maybe what I want to do is move it to about there. So there I can use the angle of my arm much more comfortably. And so I'm just going to get straighter lines. So once again, don't worry about precision so much. What we're focusing on is moving our body, drawing from the elbow and the shoulder. So we've mainly been talking about position, as in where is the stylus tip. What we've not been talking about is pressure, or not so much anyway. Well, that's going to be the next thing we focus on. We're not going to be drawing dragons yet, so don't get hasty. But what we are going to do is draw the same oval exercise, but see if we can sort of emphasize one end. So what I did there was I had a light mark that came around, and then I got darker and then lighter again. This might be if you were sort of indicating a light source and there was like a cast shadow down here. This would say, there's a little bit, heavier line weight. But for now, we're going to strip subject matter out of it completely. This is a purely mechanical exercise. Let's start with arcs, because arcs are easy for the body. And what I'm going to do is be keeping my hand still and just moving from the elbow and making this sort of arc, right? This is sort of the natural bend of my elbow. It's very easy to make that shape for me. So since the position part is easy, I'm just going to focus on the pressure part. So I'm going to start by going light, and then I'm going to lean in and make it dark. So light to dark. So now we're sort of doing two things at one time. We're thinking about the position, and we're also thinking about the pressure. This is where practice really starts to pay off. Because if you've gotten pretty good at drawing, we'll say straight lines, you kind of taught your body a little bit about how to draw straight lines, you can then stop thinking about the position part quite so much. For instance, if I've said, I've practiced this straight line down towards my body tons of times, well, then it becomes easier to practice pressure. So I can lean in and then ease off and then lean in. So here I'm sort of modulating the pressure to the best of my ability. Light to dark. It's good to practice these things both very slow if you can, and also really fast, and just see if you're able to do it both ways. So I said we were going to do three things, and here they are. The first one is curve. Can you go light to dark or dark to light? The other one is a straight line. And then the third is an oval. So as I said, we've done light ovals and we've done dark ovals, but can you do an oval that just emphasizes one bit? So let's say I want to do just dark sort of up here and light down here. So it's going to be light, dark, light. Light, dark, light. Definitely takes practice. This is going to be maybe easier if you've practiced doing a whole bunch of warm-up ovals for a long time, and you say, okay, I'm ready, I'm in oval mode. And then what are you going to do? You're going to try the pressure oval. Where can you emphasize around the oval? Now, sometimes this is easier if you start at different places around the oval. Again, there is no perfect, correct way to do any of this stuff. For instance, your oval might work best if you go counterclockwise and you start at 3 o'clock. So maybe I do an oval like that. Or maybe I'm going to start down here at 6 o'clock and go counterclockwise. There is no perfect way. In handwriting, there are sort of official ways to do it, but a lot of people kind of do it their own way. The same is true for drawing. You might draw a perfect oval if you go counterclockwise, and then can't draw an oval at all if you go clockwise. This is why we're practicing. So again, back to the pressure. Light, dark, light. So here I've been hitting some hitches. Well, this is a good time to investigate what's going on exactly. Maybe what I need to do is to zoom out a bit. Maybe I need to go more slowly. Maybe I need to go more quickly. Maybe I want to try anchoring my palm and drawing just with my fingertips. It's good to figure out what are the limits of your body, what feels natural, what do you need to practice. We're just trying to gain mechanical control over this relatively simple tool. It's only got position and pressure. So let's work on both of them. And really, there is no perfect way to practice this. It's all about kind of trying different marks and figuring out how to confidently go from light to dark and back to light again. Another favorite of mine is good old slinky. Go from light slinky to dark slinky, back to light slinky again. So I get that this looks repetitive. I hope you can understand the utility in this is more of a feel thing. Watching me make ovals, I know, it's not very enlightening, but I hope that you are practicing along and really just sort of seeing the limits of the way your arm moves, seeing how you can control this pressure. Because eventually, you're not going to be thinking about it. What we're doing right now is focusing very hard on what is ultimately a very simple thing. These are just going to be the way your arm moves when you're doing more complicated drawing. So for now, forget the complicated, just practice the simple. So the various exercises I've gone over here so far have represented, 30 minutes of film. This should represent days, weeks, or possibly even months of actual practice. But realistically, I don't think you're going to sit there and draw ovals for that long. So one really excellent thing you can use these skills on are gesture drawings. Hopefully you know what a gesture drawing is, so I don't have to explain it in detail here. But the general idea is we are doing a very loose impression of a drawing. It's a quick, maybe 1 minute long drawing, and all you can do is capture the essence of something, not the details. But it is the simplest and most direct way to make a sketch. I think gestures are a combination of really fun, but also really hard. Because what you're doing is you're sort of constantly analyzing what you're looking at and keeping that pen moving. Now, it's not to say I can't lift up the stylus, I just did right there, but you're just sort of getting the essence of what you're looking at. And you're working with very light pressure usually, and you're sort of building up shapes. And then when it becomes an important, heavier mark, then I'll kind of lean in a little bit. But you're really just implying what you're seeing. It's almost like you're seeing with your stylus, if that makes any sense. And so clearly I'm not going for clean. I'm really just kind of putting the marks in place. And this is an excellent extension of what we've been practicing, right? Big flowing lines. I'm not using the eraser at all. We'll do that at a different time. But here I'm just sort of finding the gesture, the sense of motion in this ant. And that's what I'm picking up on, not worrying about little details. And traditionally, thumbnails are actually done much smaller. So if you want to try it this way, it won't record quite as well, but as a practice, this is actually probably a better technique. And the idea with it being small is that you really can't get fussy. You can't focus on those tiny little details if the whole thing is 2 inches wide. I think for the few more I'm going to do here, I am going to zoom in a little bit further just because it makes for a better video, but know that this sort of zoomed out method is really an excellent way to do it. But I'm not erasing. I'm just kind of making gestural marks. There's really no better way to say it. This is going to become second nature to you at some point, but it's going to feel weird at first. Just don't get too fussy and don't worry about details. And I think gestures are great because they're quick. So you don't have to kind of get married to the result. If it's a really bad gesture, it doesn't really matter. And I think when you're learning to use the stylus, they're extra great because it's pretty much just a tactile exercise. You don't care about the result. All you're going for is just sort of the fluidity of using the tool. That's really all we're doing here is we're using the tool. Now, there's a lot of different reasons you might do a gesture, but it's a great way to just sort of let go. It's really easy when you sit down to draw a dragon or sit down to draw something in your portfolio that you kind of clench up and do these tight little marks. But gesture drawing, well, it's just got different rules. It's all about kind of following through and making these long lines. And I think that is just a great way through repetition to get used to using this stylus. It's not going to happen automatically, but if you force yourself to draw a lot of gestures, well, you're just going to start to loosen up over time. So if you haven't already guessed it, that's right, we're drawing gestures. My recommendation is that you do 50. If you could do 100, you would learn so much. Because even if my gesture might look more polished than your gesture, that doesn't mean yours should take longer. The goal is do a 1-minute drawing. What it looks like, that's secondary. So go find some fun photo reference. I recommend finding casual photos of athletes are really fun. When people go take their camera and take pictures of their kids playing soccer, those are really fun action poses. Because what we want is motion. So just get that arm moving and don't worry too much about the particulars of what you're drawing. Just make the motions and have fun with this. Really, this is the fun way to get used to your tools. All right, I got to admit, I'm pretty excited about this one. This is sort of the core of the course, in my opinion, and I've had to kind of build our way up to it. But what are we looking at? Well, this is a gesture in the exact same way the last things we've been doing are gestures. The only difference is that the tool is much wider. So to make something like this, I'm using a big, wide charcoal brush and the eraser instead of a very narrow sort of linear approach. But the essence is exactly the same. I'm capturing the motion of the subject. I'm implying details. I'm drawing very quickly. It's still sort of an action drawing. It's still a gesture. We're just using a different tool, and Photoshop is going to help us with that. But before we get into the specifics of sort of what tools and commands I'm using, I think it's really important to understand why we're doing this in the first place. In order to get to the very detailed contour drawings that we're going to do later, we have to start with confidence. That's where it all comes from, is the confidence of your arm and your eye. And in this weird way, confidence is actually harder to build up with a narrow tool. When you're drawing with a narrow little brush like this or a pencil, it's like there's sort of a smaller target. And it's immediately obvious when you didn't hit the target. And so you sort of clench up and it becomes this really bad positive feedback loop. When you're working with a big brush like this one, you can't hit a small target, so you don't worry about it. So it's hard to explain exactly the psychology behind this, but just trust me on this one. The goal is to be controlled with a pencil. But to get there, we're going to start with these big wide tools and sort of figure out how to get what we want out of them. It's going to feel very weird at first, but just trust me on this, stick with me. This is an excellent exercise. So let's see how it actually works in Photoshop. So in the briefest of terms, I can use the brush tool to make a mark, switch to the eraser tool, and erase away what I don't need. This is something you need to memorize. Keyboard shortcuts are essential for this. So what we're going to do is just practice sort of making shapes. Here's some goals. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use charcoal side. So if you want to follow along with me, go ahead and get out the charcoal side. So how do I make this one right here? Well, what I do is I make a straight line. And then to achieve this kind of hooked fall off, I'm going to use the vinyl eraser. And I'm going to do another hard stroke. So there I use a curve, almost like I'd pull a curve for a line, but I'm just using the eraser tool. So see how that worked? So I made a big mark, and I switched to the eraser, and I carved away that edge. Sometimes it might take 2 strokes. And then I made it very easy to get rid of the excess. Because it would be really hard to try and make this shape in a bunch of little marks. You know, if I tried to kind of do this and then fill that in, that's not what I want. Right? So it's the largest stroke you can. Now we're talking about lines, not really painting here, but if you're using charcoal, traditional charcoal, you could use the side of it to make these, really big expressive marks. But sometimes you're not going to want these edges, so maybe you would then go back in with the eraser and kind of shape it. So in order to make this fluid, you have to memorize these keyboard shortcuts. The defaults are the B key, the E key, E for eraser, back to the B key again. B, E. So let's make some more of these shapes. So for this one, I might make a single mark from sort of light to dark to light. You can see there's that gradation here, light, dark, light. And then I'll make 2 eraser marks, like that and like that. Not bad. Do it one more time. Light, dark, light, 2 eraser marks. So in this way, I'm really using the brush and the eraser in equal measure. And this is a big deal. You are going to need keyboard shortcuts to make it easy, and another one is new layer. So what I'm doing is I'm making a new layer, painting a mark, erasing away what I don't need. So here are maybe 2 eraser shapes, okay? And then I'm flattening it back down, because you don't want to end up with 1,000 layers. What you want is a temp layer, which is the new layer we just made. And then you make your marks and you're happy with it, and then you flatten it back down, merge down, which is Control or Command E, and then you're back to the normal layer count. And I do this all the time when I'm sketching. So let's say I want to draw like a soda can. So I might draw both sides of it, but I don't need both parts. So I'll make a new layer, and then I'll erase away what I don't need, and I'll flatten it down. And I'll make a new layer, erase away what I don't need, flatten it down. New layer. I'm drawing extra because it's kind of easier to draw an entire oval, but then I'm going to erase away the part I don't need. The rest of the drawing is intact. I'm only working on this temp layer. In fact, if I wanted to move it a little bit, I could, or free transform it, and then flatten it down. So in this way, I'm sort of building up a drawing by temporarily isolating little elements and then erasing away what I don't need. So maybe what I want to do now is add a handle. You see I've rotated it so it's at a comfortable position. I make a new layer, and maybe I'll make the handle sort of this shape. Just like before, I'm drawing further than I need to, and then I'm erasing away what I don't need. Maybe it should have a little loop-de-loop there. Okay. So here I'm getting such a nice dynamism, real expressive mark making, because I don't have to worry about messing up the rest of my drawing. But then I can merge that layer back down, recenter my canvas, and I have a single layer to work with. But this is really only possible once you get this keyboard shortcut dance down. So it's draw a line, switch to the eraser, get rid of some. Make a new layer, draw some, erase away what you don't need, make a new layer. It just becomes second nature, but it does take practice. But I don't want to get the wrong impression. It's not crucial that you're constantly making new layers. It's really just whenever you feel it's necessary. So for instance, if I were drawing sort of 3 overlapping balls here, it's not clear which one's in the foreground right now because I'm not using overlapping to my advantage. Now these are all drawn on the same layer. If I want to make the foreground big ball here really stand out, now I'll switch to the eraser tool and start erasing what I don't need. So here I didn't make a temp layer for that part, but maybe I'll want to if I want to add center lines to these balls. We'll say they have a narrower, we'll use charcoal tip, like a seam line. So maybe I'll put the seam line right there. So I'm drawing through as if this were a transparent ball, but I actually don't want this back. So I'm going to erase away this back part. And I can see that was a lot easier because I didn't have to worry about disrupting the rest of the drawing. So once again, I'll make a new layer, put in a seam line. Now for this one, I'm going to be erasing away a lot. In fact, I might actually want to shift this a little bit. So I don't need any of it here over this ball. And I also don't need the back for this ball. And maybe if this ball got a little too heavy-handed here, I can go back down to that original layer and erase away some. And then I can just flatten all these back down together because I don't need these layers in the long run, just for the moment while I'm making marks. So let's make one final seam line here. I'll adjust the canvas to be comfortable. Make that seam line there, and then erase away the parts that I don't need. So when you decide to make a new layer versus just making overlaps and then erasing is totally up to you. The whole idea here is just to do free-flowing drawing. So you're constantly sort of making marks very fluidly. Sometimes it's going to make sense to add in new layers, but sometimes adding layers is just going to kind of slow you down. And we don't want to get out of the groove. So do what feels best for you and sort of keep it loose. And sometimes that's going to be making new layers and sometimes it's not. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about very basic mark making. Lots of ovals, lots of straight lines. Now we're going to apply that to some thumbnail sketching. We're going to do some photo studies, but we're using the same exact ideas. So you're not allowed to clench up and get tight now. We are doing big gestural marks. These are gesture drawings. So my recommendation to keep it as loose as you can is to use the biggest mark making tool you're allowed to. Here I've included one called Charcoal Side. You can use whatever you want, but something that is way bigger than a pencil tip. And then combine that with an eraser to kind of cut away shapes. But you're going to be using big lines, which is going to force you to keep it loose. There's no way to get too detailed if what you're using is a big half-inch wide mark. It's just going to stop you from being too fussy. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the big shapes in the photos that we're studying, and we're going to kind of capture the essence, not make a finicky little contour drawing. So let's get started. All right, time to do some hybrid gestures. Now don't worry, as I said before, this is going to look more intimidating than it really is. We're just drawing big sweeping marks and sort of making use of happy accidents. As you'll see here, this drawing only takes me 1.5 minutes. This is not sped up footage, I'm just not including many details. So really part of doing this photo study is learning what to ignore. I'm pretty much ignoring the background. That line right there that I put in for the horizon, that's pretty much it. So now it's just down to blocking in the big elements, and where they overlap, using the eraser to get rid of what I don't need. It's really just like all those ovals we've been drawing, it just happens to have a name now, and the name is fruit. But pay special attention to just how large these marks are. I am not being too precious, and I'm getting a nice sense of urgency and energy because the mark is just so wide. And then once I do have the big shapes blocked in, it's time to start adding the smaller details. And clearly at 1.5 minutes, I'm not going to add too many details, but it's nice just to put a few things here and there, just so we know what we're looking at. And here you'll see that I'm adding in the areas of shadow, because when I do a gesture like this, I'm not thinking in terms of contour or line. I'm thinking in terms of shape. So yes, I am drawing with line, sure, but I'm also blocking in areas of light and dark. Because when you only have a few minutes to quickly explain a complicated subject, sometimes it's easier if you use areas of tone and not strictly tiny little lines. So here I have told enough information without getting too detailed, so it's time to move on to the next one. It's the same exact approach with this one. Here I have large geometric shapes, and so I'm actually going to pretend that I can see the cutting board as if I had x-ray vision. So I'm sort of ignoring the fruit for a minute and drawing the shape that I know the cutting board to be, even though it's covered up by the fruit. Then once I start to block in the food shapes, it'll be easy to just erase away the background, but I don't need. Again, overlapping, you've seen this before. But remember, I'm focusing on big, smooth marks. I'm not caring about details. I don't mind that I get some of the shapes a little bit wrong. It doesn't have to all be about accuracy. This is just about the impression of the food. I'm working on fluidity and dynamics more than I'm working on a perfect replica. Remember, this is a gesture. And even though we're not drawing athletes yet, it still has motion and energy. Now you're going to hear me say this over and over again, but really pay attention to how I'm using brush and eraser back and forth, adding and then carving away. It's a great way to get more control out of a big brush. And then here, as just sort of a last final touch, I'm going to erase away a little bit just to further refine that shape. But at this point, I'm really just nitpicking. Now I know this one's going to be tougher, so I actually spend a minute ahead of time just giving myself some block-in marks. We'll call that the silo. This one is the height of the barn. These are really just sort of measuring tools more than anything I'm actually seeing in the image, just sort of giving me a reference point. I'm also going to be a little slower and a little more careful about these initial angles. With something so big and geometric in perspective like this, these angles determine a lot about the image. If I get them wrong now, it's just going to kind of mess up the rest of the image, and there's really no salvaging it. But just like before, this is a big reduction. It is big, simple shapes first, and then you sort of get a little more specific. So it was ignore this point on the roof until now that I've got the rest of the roof established. So the windows are just 2 brush strokes. Put them in on a temp layer, carve away a little bit just to sort of shape them. And now here you see I'm using subtractive erasing just as much as I'm adding. And really, this is the fun of using charcoal and working so loosely. Once you have these big strokes overlapping, you start implying detail instead of outright drawing every little slat. I think working with an eraser and charcoal is really just a fun medium because you can tell a lot without really working very hard. You can add and subtract, and you start getting these happy accidents that happen. It's all about sort of staying loose, not zooming in and using tiny little marks, and letting the charcoal just sort of be charcoal. And so here, once I've got some of the major elements established, now I can start erasing away and adding in more specific details, sort of carve out this and that. But I wouldn't want to start this way. It's great to start with those big sweeping shapes. Now in this case, I think I actually am going to add in the sky. The sky is going to be a little different treatment because clouds are big and soft, so I have to think about how I can more imply clouds than really render them out. And this is a perfect opportunity for temporary layers. Here I can draw clouds right over top of the buildings because I know I'm just going to go ahead and erase back away most of it, and I don't have to worry about disrupting the rest of the drawing. Make a new layer, draw extra, and then erase away what I don't need. It's really an easy system once you memorize those hotkeys. Now I could noodle around with clouds forever. I really enjoy drawing them, but today I think this is going to be enough detail, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, let's do a female pole vaulter. What a cool gesture. So this is a great opportunity for temp layers, right? Because I have this big straight element that I'm not going to want to mess with. I want to put it in the frame and then just sort of leave it alone. So now I make a new layer, and on this part I'm going to start doing the athlete. So clearly this is not super accurate to begin with. The really nice thing about this is you're sort of pushing and pulling by both adding pigment and removing it with the eraser. So you don't have to get every mark right the first time. So these first marks might just represent the overall shape. But then I want to start indicating the clothing, and so I might add a few extra marks and then sort of erase away to define the difference between areas of value and color. Now, one of the reasons I want to show this one is because it was a great opportunity to use an implied shape. Because if I were doing a contour drawing, I would define her arm with an outline. Well, here I'm using a negative space. I'm subtracting to define where her arm is. And the reason that works is because it's surrounded by a dark garment. And one of the reasons I love working with big, wide charcoal like this is because it's really easy to define sort of two shapes at once. You're using areas of tone and shape, not just thin little outlines. And it's fair to say that this is not all planned. Part of this is sort of drawing intuitively. So I might make some big marks, and then as they start to build up and make intersections, then these happy accidents start happening. So if I see a new shape that's sort of created by the accidental overlap of two intentional shapes, well, I'm just going to run with it. So I'm sort of finding the drawing inside of my intentional marks. And over time, it starts to sort of emerge out of this cluttered beginning. So if I were to continue in this way, I could go from being a gesture and kind of refine it into a finished painting, where you start out very loose and abstract and then kind of tighten as you go. But for this case, I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to call this one done, and let's move on to the next one. Same approach. I'm going to start with a bar, and that's going to be on its own layer. And now I'm going to start feeling the major gesture of his pose. What's the sort of motion line? And from here, I'm going to use that as a scaffolding and kind of build it out with details and with light and dark. But it's this general shape, sort of a swooping shape, that's really the core of the action. I could stop here and really call this a gesture. It would have enough information. Really all I'm doing now is adding details and resolving it. But at this point, this is when I start to think in terms of costume and light and dark shapes. So I am using big strokes, as big as I can, and then getting the definition by carving away what I don't need. So here I'm actually using more layers than some of the previous ones, because there's just more shapes sort of overlapping. And when I start having more shapes overlapping, using temp layers is a way to retain control, because I like the immediacy of these lines. They have a sort of a nice clarity. If I had it all in a single layer and I was trying to carefully erase this and carefully erase that, it'd be hard to keep the energy. But by making individual layers when I add a new element, it allows me to keep some of that freshness and some of that energy, so it doesn't get too stale. Now it's really interesting how these drawings slow down. In the beginning, I was covering large areas of the canvas with big active marks, but now, even only a minute and a half later, I'm already sort of fussing around with smaller and smaller details. It would be safe to say this is the time I should be done. I should stop fussing. That's what gesture is all about. It's achieve enough information and then put your pencil down and move on. It's a hard discipline, but it's worth getting in that mindset because you can make a lot of these in a short amount of time and you really learn. Now I want to pause a minute before doing this last one because this is, I would say, the most complicated of my examples. It's complicated because it's got architecture, which as we know is challenging, so the angles are really going to matter. But more than that, it's an excellent use of economy. And what I mean by economy is that there's really very few shapes in this image. I took a complicated photo and my gesture is much reduced. It's essentially a sequence of choices where I decide what is essential in this photo, what's really telling me house and path and woods, and what can I just leave out. So as I make it, make sure to watch for exactly how big of brush strokes I'm making, because it's these big strokes and carefully made edges that are what help you kind of tell the essential without putting in all the extra details. And as you work on your gestures, this is what we're going for. How can you capture the whole story in 1 or 2 minutes? It certainly takes practice. I start out in a familiar way. I'm using really relatively narrower lines because I want to be really certain about these angles. If I were to get one of these major angles wrong, it'd be very hard to salvage through pushing things around. So I lied when I said I used big strokes the entire time. That's not entirely true. But once I get this skeleton set up, now I start to look at the areas of light and shadow, the value pattern. And so really it's the shadows of the shapes that are defining it. It's leaving out a lot of the contour and instead just adding a few carefully placed areas of light and dark. It's really amazing how our brains work. We can just indicate detail and our brain fills in the gaps. Now, when I add in these large swooping shapes, this is definitely an opportunity for temp layers. So here I can not worry about messing up the house when I add in all these foliage and grass around because they're on their own layer. So I'm able to use these huge brush strokes and then carve away what I don't need. So I'm actually going to speed up the footage now, but what I want you to watch is how I'm carving these areas of light and dark, shadow and illumination. I'm not defining any of this with outlines really, it's just a shadow pattern. And I want you to try this when you pick your reference. Pick subjects that have a very visible light and dark shadow pattern and see if you can focus on areas of light, not contour outlines. Working this way is not going to be immediately easy. It's a tricky discipline, but what it really allows you to do is condense a very detailed subject, like architecture, into a very simple, clear result. And this is an essential skill for drawing. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've ended up with. There are linear gestures and there are hybrid gestures. Both are great practice, and I encourage you to do a fair amount of each. But my guess is you are going to tend to be more linear, as most beginners are. It's just easy to think of drawing as a contour. Well, my hunch is that you haven't spent a lot of time thinking of drawing as these big, wide charcoal marks. Well, the secret is when I went to art school, I was in the same boat. I thought of a drawing as a very specific thing, which is contour lines, narrow, sharp pencil. And so sure enough, when I got assigned charcoal drawings from still life, I was not really interested. I wanted to make sharp, controlled drawings, and they had us using this messy stuff that I didn't really like. Well, it was too bad. I had to do it. I was getting grades for it. And in retrospect, I'm really happy I was forced over that hump, because now I love it. It took a little time to kind of get used to this new tool, but now that I'm more experienced with it, I get it. You can tell so much more information in a few carefully made strokes than you really could with a few pencil lines. So take this stuff seriously. I encourage you to do a whole bunch of these hybrid gestures because it's going to change the way you think. Remember, the end result is not important. You're not going to put these in your portfolio. What is important is the way you break down the reference, the way you capture the essence without going into all the details. And that just takes practice. So as we come to a close here at part 1, a totally reasonable question to ask is, well, am I ready to move on to the next one? Am I done now doing loose drawing? Is it time to move on to tight drawing? Sadly, this is not a question I can answer for you. The truth of the matter is these skills all build on each other, and you're going to do different types of drawing throughout your life. In fact, it's possible that being introduced to this idea of drawing with big, wide marks really appeals to you. You may have gotten this series with an intention to learn how to draw tight contour drawings, but now that you've tried this, you actually really like big, wide gestural marks. Well, maybe that is drawing for you. But more likely, you want to continue learning about different ways to make controlled, nice line work in Photoshop. Well then, as I mentioned before, parts 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all about this. I'm going to show you different ways to use Photoshop's tools to make careful, clean contours. But I do so with a word of caution. Just because you've watched this hour-long series all about drawing gestures and loose mark making, that doesn't mean you learned it. My thesis is that the way you're going to get to have the best, tight, careful lines is by being truly confident using wide, loose lines. Not to say that you're going to be drawing loose and gesturally for your whole life, but that is a first step towards making those controlled lines. So if you were to rush through this process and really not get comfortable with drawing loose, I think it's going to be hard for you to start drawing tight. Now, of course, you're going to take this at any pace that feels natural to you, but I just wanted to get it out there that I think you're going to have better results and be happier with the later videos in this series if you genuinely practice drawing loose. And again, a great way to do that is with these hybrid gestures, but really there's all sorts of different ways. Getting better at this stuff takes time, but I hope these videos have helped give you a more targeted way to practice. So get out there, move your elbow and your shoulder, and start drawing loose. Thanks for coming to the site, guys. Hey there, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com, and first off, I really just want to thank you for buying this series. Your support is making the entire project possible, and I mean that seriously, so thank you. Now, if you don't already know, this is part 2 of a 5-part set, And the idea is to go from very, very loose to very, very tight drawing. And as this is part 2, I'm going to have to just assume you're already comfortable with making gesture drawings, because those gestures, well, they're going to form the foundation for the next step that we do in this part. Also, I want to mention that I've included a pack of brush presets. This is just the school supplies. If you bought part 1, these are the exact same ones. So it's a variety of traditional media, just so we're all working with the same tools and don't have to focus on brush settings. Now, if you want to know more about these, make sure to go to the resources folder where you can find the files themselves, as well as a video that explains how to install them. As you know, this whole collection is just trying to figure out how do we get better at careful drawing. The first section talked about how do we loosen up and make big gestural marks. Well, now we want careful, clean line work. What is it that really good draftsmen are doing in Photoshop to end up with these nice drawings? Well, the conclusion I've come to is that it's not about knowing Photoshop tricks. I think the artists that have the best digital line drawings have spent time drawing with a pencil. They've learned to essentially make do with a very limited tool, but to take that limited tool and to make a huge variety of marks with it. And then when they come into Photoshop, they bring with them that breadth of problem-solving skills. The idea that a narrow mark can be anything they need it to be. Now, this might be sounding like I'm encouraging you to get out an actual pencil and actual paper. I'm not. There's a reason I included these custom brushes. We're going to do a variety of exercises that replicate that process of learning to draw with a pencil. We just happen to be doing it with a stylus. Now, in this series, we are going to talk more about the idea of layering. So here we're going to go from those loose gestures that we did in Digital Sketching 1, and then we're going to use them as a framework to kind of zoom in, get slower, make narrower lines, and start to get more detailed. And then because we're using layers, we can remove that framework and just have that clean line drawing left. But really, that's just the technical part. And I think that's what you're going to learn at a lot of other tutorial websites. What I want to focus on are the building blocks, the fundamentals, the drills, the kind of stuff that you're forced to do at art school that are going to build up your ability to use a very basic tool to do very complex things. All right, so get out your school supplies and let's do some drawing. Getting better at drawing lines in Photoshop involves a whole variety of skills. But 2 major different skills are freehand basic coordination, as in just being able to draw a straight line or a circle without any assistance. And the other category is using Photoshop sort of trickery to help improve your lines. First things first, I think it's important to talk about actual hand-eye coordination, learning freehand drawing. In Digital Sketching 1, we talked a lot about this, only we were using a wide, loose mark. Well, now the idea is to take a much sharper pencil. It is a narrow mark, and so it's going to take a finer precision. It's harder, honestly, but we're going to practice it in a similar way. Now, before we go any further, I have to mention the potential ergonomic hazards of what we're doing. The way we learn these skills is repetition, but do it sensibly. If you find yourself drawing lots of lines based on the recommendations I'm giving you, and then you're tired, or your arm hurts, or your wrist hurts, stop. Take a break. Take a day off. Take a week off. Your body can get hurt if you don't listen to the way you're feeling. Now, I've done all these exercises for years, so I'm not encouraging you to do something that is outright dangerous. But you're not being a hero by practicing for 16 hours a day to try and become the best draftsman the world's ever seen. You're just going to hurt yourself. All right, enough said. Let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to tackle some straight lines. Here, I'll make a new layer, and the goal is to draw a line from one to the other. I like to tilt my canvas a little bit because this just helps the geometry of my arm work better. Now, we have a smaller mark that we're working with. If you were doing this with the charcoal side before, you'll notice that doing it with the pencil tip just feels a little bit different because here the target is smaller, and so it takes a more precise mark. You might want to practice doing it zoomed out. You might want to practice zoom way in. Try it at different angles to see what works for you. I have a harder time drawing in certain directions than I do in others. Just like before, if you pull straight down towards your body, you can do nice straight lines, but get to know the feeling of this narrower tip. The next exercise is to draw a single dot and to radiate lines away from it. So on a new layer, I'm just going to pull lines off in the direction starting from the dot and going towards whatever you like. This is sort of like doing perspective if you've ever drawn lines to a vanishing point, but we're pulling them without any mechanical aids. So you'll see me rotating the canvas here. This is, again, because my arm works best in certain directions. I could try pulling straight down towards the center of my body. I can probably pull the longest straight line that way. So I would rotate the canvas to make that possible. But this is great practice. Light lines and dark lines. The next one is a little bit more challenging. So here I'm going to draw a new dot, make a new layer, and now I'm going to try and draw lines from any arbitrary white space towards the black mark. So sometimes ghosting is a great way to practice this. I'll do a fake line hovering over the tablet surface, and then I'll drop my pen when I feel like I've got it right. So here you're kind of leading with your eye, seeing if you can aim right at that target. As you can see, I'm not even that great at this. This is a really challenging thing to do. The shorter the line you do, obviously the easier. So if I were to just do that, I would not have as much trouble. It's when you are making kind of long lines like that they become much more challenging. So this is really not an assignment about making something pretty. It's an assignment about learning how your body moves. Because here I am, to make a long line like this one, I have to draw from the shoulder. Again, this is something I cover in much more detail in part 1. So if you haven't heard that argument yet, make sure to go ahead and get part 1 and you'll hear all about it. But I think that even just doing this with a narrower tip really does feel different. Another one I like to do is to give myself an L here. And now I'm going to draw arcs that start on one leg of the L and go to the other one. And the idea is that they're supposed to be sort of concentric arcs. So they should match the similar curve, be generally evenly spaced if possible. Going this way. Now here I am using the hand essentially. I'm not really using my shoulder or elbow for this one, which means I have to zoom out the canvas pretty far because I don't have a large range of motion with just my fingers. But I'm sort of anchoring my palm and pivoting around my palm. An arc like this is very natural for our palm. If you wanted to, you could definitely do it from the shoulder. That would have a different feeling to it. It would give you sort of a looser feel, but you wouldn't have to change the camera so much. And with all these, try doing the opposite. So if that was maybe easy for you because of the way your wrist works, how would you tackle this problem? Now it's a lot harder. You can see I'm having trouble getting kind of the wider look that I wanted. So I'd have to figure out an angle that would work better for me. Maybe it would make more sense to actually kind of rotate the page and give myself this same left to right shape. A lot of times it really is just kind of figuring out what's comfortable instead of trying to fight the hardware. The tablet's not going to move around your desk in the same way that a piece of paper would, so you have to figure out solutions. The final, and in my opinion, most challenging exercise we're going to do here is to draw 3 dots and to connect them with an arc. This is tough. And since I've hit the record button here, of course I'm going to get it wrong, but here's what it's supposed to look like. Okay, I hit 1 and I missed 2. It's still not bad though. The idea is you make a single arc that starts at one point and then proceeds through the middle and lands at the end. So here I didn't get it quite right. Drawing these with a Cintiq is actually a little bit harder than doing it with a USB tablet, because right now I'm actually covering up this dot over here with the palm of my right hand. So I have to kind of rely on ghosting more so because I can't really see what I'm doing. You wouldn't have that same problem with the USB tablet. So that was better. But try a variety of different arcs and see how you can do. Big ones, small ones. This is very relevant for the way you'll be drawing. Now, you're not necessarily going to have these dots to work from, but you'll have some aspect of your drawing that has a curved surface, and it's best if you can do it in a continuous line. Now, even if you have to erase away the extra, that's fine. But that energy of this line is much better than if you were to do the same thing as kind of a scratchy, pieced together line. We don't want this. So giving yourself this discipline to be able to draw curves on demand is really valuable. It is not easy. It definitely takes practice. And once again, this is nothing you could put in your portfolio. So it's really only for you. And no one is going to know if you're doing it or not. As you see here, I'm trying different directions, left to right versus right to left. That's another way to figure out which works better for you. For some people, they're going to have sort of an equal opportunity doing it both ways. Other people are going to have a much easier time going in one direction, and the other direction is going to feel kind of awkward. Just figure out what your body likes to do. Okay, what are these ridiculous little creatures? I don't really have a name for this bunny character, but this bunny character is my excuse to draw essentially boring ovals and work on overlapping and work on just pen control. So I'm going to draw a number of these guys. I'm going to explain why this sort of exercise is useful. Whether you want to copy my exact bunny or make your own character, that's totally up to you. But this bunny, even though he's a little malleable, is essentially just ovals. I start big, this is his major mass, and then I'm going to add in his extra features. So he's got these bunny ears, which have a smaller oval, and then I erase away where the overlaps are. I happen to be doing this all on one layer, although there's different ways. I'll show you in a minute. Inside of this, he's got a mouth that's essentially a sphere where I intersect it and cut the top off. And then he has cute little eyeballs. He has these dangly arms and a bunny tail like that. Now, of course, you're going to erase away wherever these intersections are. So what am I practicing when I do this? Well, I'm practicing drawing past where I need to go and erasing the intersections. That alone is a really useful skill. So, each one of these is not beautiful and certainly not going in my portfolio, but it gives me a target that is repeatable. I can kind of have fun by picking a different pose for him each time, but in general, I know the formula for drawing this guy. He has ears, maybe I'll enlarge him a little bit this time. And the tail, erase away those overlaps. And what this is doing is just kind of giving me an excuse to practice the important stuff without worrying too much about, thinking of a new thing to draw. Maybe I could modify it a little bit, but ultimately these are just ovals. Now, different ways I could approach this guy would be to use temp layers, for instance. So if I were to draw his body, maybe like that, now I'll start a new layer. So I'll make a new layer for his tail. Erase away what I don't need, and here I can not worry about erasing his body, as you know. Flatten it down. We'll do the ears. Now here, what I need to erase is actually the lower layer. So I would switch to the lower layer and erase away that. So I'm not messing up the ears. And then if maybe I want to shorten the ears, I'll go back to the ear layer. So here I'm sort of isolating individual parts of the drawing and remembering which lives on which layer. Then I can flatten this all together and continue drawing. So that would allow me to practice just temp layers. Again, I don't have to worry about what I'm drawing because I know what this little character looks like, but it's just a fun way to kind of get my muscles used to doing temp layers. Another thing I could practice would be line weight. Sometimes it's nice to have a variety of line weights in your drawing. So I might use a heavier hand for his outer contour here, and then a lighter one for his face shape. Maybe heavy for his eyes because I want them to kind of stand out, and heavy for his mouth. And I'm also going to do heavy for the outer parts of the ears, and then light for the inner parts of the ears. And I did those on a temp layer, so here you can see the benefit of working with individual layers. Now I can switch to the lower layer and erase that away. I'll do the same. I'll do a heavy tail. I guess I'll do heavy arms, and then maybe a light belly. And then light whiskers. So here I am practicing modulating pressure. Heavy for the outer contours, soft for the inner contours. And I could even give him extra little details. If this is just a practice, maybe he has some sort of patterning element here with, I don't know, camouflage or something. He's starting to look a little Pokemon-like. Well, maybe those are all sort of light pressure, all the patterning. So when you zoom out, the primary contours are mainly what you see, and those are the heavier lines. Jumping ahead a bit, here is a whole page of these silly bunny guys. This is weirdly useful practice. It's a way to just sort of zone out and draw something that you don't have to think about, but it allows you to practice some objectively challenging skills, especially when you're starting out. Ovals, overlapping, these are not easy or obvious things, but giving yourself a way to practice them and also have a little bit of fun, it just kind of gets you better at them in a quick way. So I encourage you to invent your own weirdo little Pokemon thing, or copy my rabbit, whatever you want, but it is a good practice, so give it a try. Now, as you do your homework for this video, I encourage you to take it seriously, but the one caveat is that this is maybe harder than it looks. Learning to draw straight lines is not something that happens over the course of a day. This is going to take you a while. In fact, one thing worth considering is to not think of it as a single homework assignment, but rather a new thing to practice before you draw every day. But through discipline, this is something you can definitely improve, and it's going to get better over time. So have fun with it. So far, we've talked about using line to make contours, the outside of a shape. We haven't talked about tone. Like, for instance, if you wanted to make a value scale like this one, with paint, we know how that looks. But if all you have is a pencil, you'd have to have a different strategy. So instead what you do is hatching. So here you lay the pencil on its side and you make marks back and forth, and optically they look like a tone. You lay them down in these slow layers, and especially if you're working with traditional media, you can really build up a very uniform tone. You're using the same pigment or color the whole time. If you want to make a darker tone, you just make more lines and more close together. You need a lighter tone, make lighter lines and make them slightly further apart. So it's a very subtle practice, but it really does reproduce the sense of tone, even if it's all the same value. And naturally, I would encourage you to make one of these. So go ahead and just make some squares on a page. It doesn't need to be 5, it could be 3, it could be 10, however many you want. And pick the target tones ahead of time. So put those target tones down below or above the squares, and then try your luck at it. Now I will say this is a little bit easier if you have a slightly wider tip. So maybe don't use the included pencil, but rather the charcoal tip. It's a little bit wider and it will allow you to kind of get through this quicker. If you do decide to use the charcoal tip, I'd recommend lowering the flow a little bit. This is one of those things that it can be easy to put down too much pigment too quickly. So instead, if you lower the brush's flow, it allows you to build up that tone more slowly. And for this assignment, that helps. And don't be afraid to use the eraser. You'll notice here that I've finished my applying tone, but then I went back and looked at it and it wasn't quite right. So I used the kneaded eraser to lighten them up a little bit. This is very much a push and pull. Even with traditional media, it's very unlikely that you would get this correct on the first try. Okay, now I'll admit this is not very exciting. This is one of those building blocks. The things we do after this are going to build on this mechanical skill. Because my guess is you've done a lot of contour drawing, but you might not have done a lot of hatching, and certainly not on your tablet. So even if you only do one value scale, I do think it is a useful step in this sort of traditional media approach to learning your stylus. Once you've figured out how to do this, the next step is to learn how to let that hatching tell a richer story. In the case of a cylinder like this, if I wanted to give it a little bit of light and shadow, we'll say there's a top-down sort of 3/4 lighting, I can use the direction of the hatching to reinforce the shape. So in this sense, the three-dimensionality of the image matters. It's not like a paint by number where I just look at the border of a shape and fill it in any way that I want to. No, here I'm actually drawing lines that are the long axis of the cylinder. And in doing so, it reinforces the volume of the object, not just flat 2D shape. And you can see here, I happen to be using temp layers, so it's much easier to kind of draw further than I need to, and then erase away the extra. Additionally, since they are on a separate layer, it allows me to use the kneaded eraser and kind of knock it back a bit, lighten up those tones. But here you can see I have used line to describe light and shadow. I didn't use a big wide brush, just a narrow tip. Well, what else can we tell? Here we have two spheres. They're both lit by sort of strong top-down light. The one on the left is very basic. That's what you might be expecting. Well, the one on the right, let's pretend that is birch bark. It's like a birch bark covered ball. I know it's a bit abstract, but we're doing an exercise here. If that were our challenge, to make this sphere look like birch bark, we could use the hatching to sort of solve two issues at one time. It could talk about the surface texture, as in sort of stripes with little bumps here and there, but it also would have to talk about light and shadow. So just like with the cylinder, I'm using the directionality of the ball to kind of reinforce that volume. I'm not drawing flat hatching. I'm drawing round ovals of hatching because that's what the surface of the ball is. And then where I want to indicate shadow, I'm using a little bit more pressure. I'm kind of darkening up the hatching, making more hatch marks, making them closer together. And then to really reinforce that core shadow, I've gone ahead and done another layer and done extra hatching on that bottom half. But you can see the impression here tells a lot of information. We can tell not only which direction the light's coming from and what the volume of the sphere is, but we can also tell a bit of surface texture. So what is all this applied to? What type of drawing is actually going to use this sort of hatching? Well, I think this birch log is a great example. If you take a close look at this, I've only done it with narrow pencil lines. Now, it started with gesture drawing. And as you know by now, gesture is defined by being quick and decisive and energetic. Well, a hatching drawing like this is the totally other end of the spectrum. What I'm doing here is slow, careful, and methodical. I'm going to be zoomed in further. So with that in mind, I don't want to have to waste any time. A great first step is just to make the outline. It's sort of like giving yourself your own coloring book to then follow inside the lines. I start with the outer contour, and then I also make sure to block in these sort of dark shapes. I know that the birch bark that it's mainly white, but it has a few areas of black, so I'm going to make those outlines as well. And now that all the outlines are there, it's time to actually start doing my hatching. Now you'll notice I've left myself an area of shadow and an area of light. It was sort of implied with my gesture. Well, I'm going to use that as a bit of a guide. Just like I did before with the sphere, I'm going to use narrower, more prominent hatching to tell shadow, and I'm going to leave it much more empty and open where it's going to be highlight. You'll also notice that I am not doing flat hatching. The directionality of these hatches explain the cylindrical nature of this object. Remember, we're thinking in volume, not flat 2D images. Now eventually I'm done needing the guide. Now it's time to kind of tweak and add and subtract and do the final polish. Okay, there's no homework assignment for this video. At some point, if you do want to do an exercise like this, I encourage you to, but there's some more basic exercises that I want you to try first. The reason why I showed you this practice from start to finish is to kind of broaden the definition of what lines can be. Because I think it's so easy to fall into this trap as a beginner, thinking of line as contour outline. That's it. But the humble little line can tell such a richer story. So in my opinion, learning to make good line drawings in a lot of ways means learning how much a pencil is capable of. And these are things that happen naturally if you go through the traditional drawing practice. If all you have is a pencil, you have to figure out how to make it work. So I'm not arguing that you should render all of your drawings with cross-hatching, but I hope this has served to expand your definition of what a line is capable of. In the next video, we are going to do some doodling in a controlled way to get used to making marks like these. So we've seen this in action, right? We've used lines kind of built up in interesting ways to tell a richer story, to talk about lights and darks, even though we're not actually using any tone. Well, sure, one way to practice this would be to draw things like the birch bark. But let's take a different strategy. I think that actually can be a little intimidating if you're just starting out. What we need to do is just get used to using the stylus and having fine motor control. So instead what we're going to do looks a lot more like your old math notebook. We're going to be doodling. And what we're doodling today are pattern squares. So I encourage you to make a page or multiple pages full of these pattern squares. They don't need to have any particular look, but they are going to be practicing some essential skills. And before we get started with that, let's just take a look at some types of marks that are going to be useful to practice. The first of these things that I like to do is just to make radiating curves that try and end at a single point. You're trying to keep the starting points equally spaced, and then the ending point as the same dot. The next one here is like making a rainbow. So the idea here is I'm making arches that are a similar curve, although they are more tightly spaced on the left side and then more spread out on the right side. This one here is a bit like making ovals, although each of these is made from 2 line segments. So you have sort of tips at both ends and similar curves along each axis. Another classic is squiggle line. So here I'm starting with a big, wide, loose squiggle and then getting increasingly tight. But notice that I'm following the same number of curves and humps. So these aren't arbitrary squiggles. Each one matches the one next to it. Leaving curves behind for a minute, now I'm going to make some angular polygons. The idea here is something like a carefully cut stone wall, or something where you have puzzle pieces fitting in next to each other, and you just sort of doodle like this. One of the things I'm practicing here is spacing, so I'm making sure there's an equal padding between each of these polygons. Of course, I'm also making sure that I don't extend my lines too far, so I'm trying to have nice, clean, straight lines, but that terminate at good intersections. And then I'm also sort of picking an exterior shape that these all fit into, a bit like a turtle shell that has smaller shapes inside of it. Here we're going to do some opposing triangles. You could think of this as like sharp teeth in a cartoony mouth, and then begin to fill these negative spaces with even more opposing triangles. What this practices is dynamic curved lines that all sort of mirror each other. You are doing a controlled spacing between each of the triangles, but also keeping a nice dynamism and energy to your marks. So now that you've seen, generally speaking, what I'm going for, let's put it inside of a square. So now I've made a document that has just a basic square, and I'm going to start filling it with these graphic marks. Notice that I'm happily rotating the canvas while I work because I need to make it comfortable for my arm. I don't want to have to fight against the tablet. And unlike those examples I showed you before, I have a bounding box now. So as I make these shapes, I have to consider the shapes themselves, but also the square that they live inside of. So you see now I'm trying to extend lines right up to that border, but not go over the border. And this isn't arbitrary. It's not just so it looks like nice little tiles. The idea here is you're often going to be using lines inside of a larger containing shape. Maybe you start with the outline of a character and then you fill it with fur. So even though this square is not a character, the idea is the same. We're learning how to make small detailed shapes inside of bigger ones. For this next one here, I'm actually going to use a similar exercise that we've already tried, connecting parallel lines from a starting point to an ending point. And then I'm going to do a bit of rotation in here too, just a bit like the last pattern. But really, there's no rules to what we're doing here. The goal is just to find a more fun way to practice these very mechanical basic skills. Because I don't know about you, but I know I've spent plenty of time doodling like this, just as a way to clear my mind while listening to a lecture. But I think it really does train our brain to be controlled and to be detailed. And there's really no rules to what sort of line weight you use. Here, once I got the framework in place, now I'm going back and sort of calling out larger edges. So I have a bit of depth with thicker lines and thinner lines. Oftentimes when you're using lines to describe details or texture, you're going to have a wide variety in your line weight. And all that's to say, it's a good idea to practice this stuff, even if you're not drawing characters yet. All right, these examples so far have just been essentially shapes kind of fit nicely into boxes. Well, another job that we've seen lines have is to talk about tone. So we've essentially been doing texture, but what if we wanted to describe a transition from light to dark, and all we had to use were lines? So let's have the next pattern squares incorporate a light to dark tonal transition in addition to having neat shapes. For this first one here, it's going to be similar to those matching doodle curves. So it starts out with a big curve and then gets into sort of a narrower curve. And I'm going to, match that curve with each of these other lines. But as these lines get towards the right corner, I'm also using more pressure. The idea here is light pressure at the start and then gradually easing into heavier pressure. So 2 things are happening here. The lines are getting closer to each other and they're also getting darker. And the net effect of all this is that we have a light area on the left side, a light tone, and then in that bottom right corner, we have a dark area or a dark tone. And don't be afraid to use the eraser with this. You notice that I just lightened up on my lines a little bit. That's fine. The idea here is to just get used to the tools, and the eraser is totally okay. This is a similar exercise. So here I'm trying to go from light at the top to dark at the bottom. And I'm doing so with these very careful parallel curves, waving just like before, kind of gently rocking back and forth. And I'm doing these slow and methodically. These are the sorts of lines that would be tough to do fast and to also have this carefully controlled pressure. Because you'll notice I'm going from light pressure at the top to heavier pressure at the bottom. Additionally, they're a little bit wider in their spacing at the top, and they get to be a little bit narrower in their spacing at the bottom. So these 2 factors, the pressure and the spacing, are leading to that illusion of light at the top and dark at the bottom. Okay, instead of doing parallel lines this time, let's work in ovals, because ovals are just good to practice in general, good for your pen control. But what if we were to use them as a textural element? Maybe we're drawing stones at the beach or some sort of gravel, so you've got big stones and little stones in between. This is a good practice for a variety of reasons. But trying to incorporate that tone change is going to be interesting with this one. So it's going to be less obvious because there's just more negative space. But my goal is the same. It's to have generally a lighter tone at the top of the image and in the sort of lower right-hand corner, a darker tone. So you see one way I'm achieving it is by having smaller rocks or ovals more tightly spaced together and then having a little more breathing room up in the top. And so just that different spacing is giving the illusion of a tone change. Okay, now I'm going to try doing the same idea, but with those sharp football shapes. And in this case, you're going to see the exercise starts out like the previous ones, where there's really no tone change evident. I'm just kind of filling the space with randomly sized football shapes. And then I get to this point where I'm filling up the whole composition and there's not as much contrast as I'd like. You can see it's a little bit darker in the lower left hand and a little bit lighter in the upper right hand, but not enough. So now it's okay to go back and to really accentuate it, because this is not a one direction thing. I can just work in more detail into certain areas or erase away detail from other areas. These are malleable things. We're experimenting to try and get a certain result, but we don't necessarily know how to achieve it. So really, I'd say trying a bunch of different approaches, even if it means erasing or throwing stuff away, is better. Because remember, this is supposed to be fun. What we're doing here is practicing in a fun way what would otherwise be pretty mundane exercises. There are tons of different ways to master these skills, but I think making a big page of pattern squares like these is a good start. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk about a more practical application of this sort of linear texture. But I really do encourage you to do some practice with these sorts of pattern squares first. There's no need to rush. You're going to have plenty of time for photo studies later. So have some fun with this. Now that you've tried your hand at some of these textural pattern marks, I think you're a little more prepared to tackle a study like this one. So I'm not going to show you this all the way from start to finish because it would just take too much time, but I want to show you the major milestones that I use when creating an image like this one. The first is to block in my major contours. So here's where I'm giving myself that blueprint. It's the outline, but then in the case of this particular bark pattern, there are very strong sort of jagged lines. They're what define the way that this looks and feels. And I know that I'm going to go in there and make fine, small-scale microtexture later, but it's this sort of roadmap that's going to help me know where to put my textures. Unlike the birch tree, with this one I'm actually going to fill in those dark, shadowy crevices first, because I know the other hatching is going to be more directional. It's going to have more of a textural aspect, but these areas are dark enough that I'm essentially just filling them in. Just like we practiced with those pattern squares, here's where I get to sort of problem solve. If I have a shadow, well, then I'm going to use a darker hatching. If I have a lighter area, then I'm going to use a lighter hatching. The creative part becomes, what do the patterns themselves look like? And here's where I look at the photo reference for inspiration. But this is why we did those pattern squares, because there's a million different ways to make a dark tone. The way you do it says a lot about the texture of the surface. And of course, this all takes time. But eventually I get to the end of sort of the first pass on it. And now I have to step back and consider, how's it working? And this is where I'm going to squint my eyes and really try and assess what the values are doing. And generally this is when you start pushing and pulling and tweaking. This is when I'm going to use my eraser. I'm going to lighten up certain areas. I'm going to also darken other areas. If you've ever done any black and white rendering, this is exactly the same. Really, the only difference is instead of making big brush marks, we're doing hatching pattern work. But eventually, I'm satisfied with the way the image looks. Now, the real question is, should this be your homework assignment? Should you do a study that is detailed just like this one? In my opinion, yes. Now, this is obviously different from a portfolio piece because you're not going to have any work like this in your portfolio. But similar to the other exercises we've done so far, there is something learned along the way when you do an image like this one. When you look at a photo texture and all you have is a narrow pencil tip to reproduce that texture, you have to get creative. You have to use mark making in interesting ways, and two drawings will never be the same. The downfall is a study like this can take a really long time. That's one of the hallmarks of drawing with pencil. And even though this is a digital pencil, you still have the same slowness. You have to lay down one stroke at a time. So the best advice I can give is to find a subject matter that is relatively small or simple. Something that allows you to experience this challenge without having you render an entire city block. But if you do set aside the time and make a carefully cross-hatched drawing, have fun with it. This is a great discipline, and I think it's going to show through even in your contour drawings in the future. Perfecting your hand-eye coordination is not the only way to get clean lines in Photoshop. Another way is to draw a line that is not quite right, and then let Photoshop sort of fix it for you. And there's a few commands that are especially useful for this. So in this video, that's what we're going to look at. So as a word of warning, all of these are potentially bad habits. They're going to fix a bad line and make it a better line. Now, sometimes that's the efficient thing to do, and it's smart to use that. But as you use these techniques, keep in mind, they're not teaching you to be a better draftsman. Now, that said, I use these in my professional work all the time. So it's not to say it is cheating to use them, but in a way, it's cheating your own growth. So just be aware of that. But let's go through some of these and we can see how they work. The first and most basic, you are very familiar with. So when you make a line and you do it incorrectly, to hit the undo command, Ctrl Z. So the nice benefit of this is very obvious. The downfall is that you can get this sort of twitch where you draw a line, undo, draw a line, undo. This can be a bad habit. When we are going from a loose underdrawing to a tighter drawing, sometimes the best thing is just to let the line be a line. It doesn't need to match perfectly. You're not tracing something exactly. And so trying to kind of match it exactly to the border might just be messing up your flow. So if you find yourself drawing and undoing over and over, watch out. This can be a bad habit. The next one is one I've talked lots about in other videos, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but is the idea of temp layers. So if I have one line down and I want to have something that maybe intersects it, I would make a new layer, draw that line, and then erase away what I don't need. Once I'm done, I can merge the two together. So it's new layer, erase, merge. These commands are the lifeblood of the way I paint. And you could argue that they form some bad habits. So be aware of sort of the ups and downs of each of these techniques. It gives you extra control, but it does so at the expense of your planning. If I were to draw on a sketch pad, I'd probably draw more slowly and avoid making mistakes in the first place. Whereas if I'm drawing digitally, I know I can go way beyond the sort of intersection point and then just erase away the excess. Now, when you are using temp layers, a few other options become available to you. Let's say I want to work on this curve right here, and I get it wrong the first time. Instead of just undoing and then drawing it again, I can actually tweak it in place. And this is where things get really dicey. Some people will find this to be totally cheating, and they'll say you'll never get better at drawing if you do them. Some people live by this and tweak every line they make. So I'll let you decide how to use them yourself, but just to show you how it works, you could use free transform. That'd be the most basic. So here, if I needed to rotate it a bit and maybe shrink it a bit, it would be easy to do so with free transform. And since it's on its own layer, I didn't mess up any of the stuff around it, including I could erase away the edge there and kind of tweak it to my heart's content. The slightly more advanced version of that is to do free transform and hold down the Control key on the PC and to do some tweaking. So here I'm distorting the image in perspective to kind of wiggle it around and get it to be the shape I want. Once again, I have the ability to do erasing because these are each on their own layer. I could also move and scale any way I want. Once I'm done, generally, I will then merge these together. Now, another variation of this that's even more powerful is if you draw a line and you like, we'll say the ends of it, but I didn't get this curve quite right in the middle. Free transform on its own doesn't help me with that. Everything I do to it is a uniform change. And sometimes that's all you need. But sometimes you're happy with part of it. So we'll say the left and the right I'm happy with. It's just this middle bit I don't like. Well, I'll make a selection that's a bit bigger here. Okay. Then I'll free transform. And so it's free transform from this boundary. And now while free transform is up, I'm going to right click and use the warp command. Now what this allows me to do is just modify part of the image by moving this lattice around. And if I wanted to get in tighter, I could make my selection smaller, free transform, and warp. And so here I'm really only modifying the middle bit and leaving the ends alone. So this is very powerful, as you might imagine. Sometimes when you are working with ellipses, you'll have two ellipses that are very similar next to each other. And it is extremely hard to by hand draw two very similar ellipses. So you could modify the second one to kind of make it match if you wanted, or you could just duplicate the one you've already made. So the way I'll do that is select the layer that it is on, and in this case, this is the only contents of the layer, and then I will hold down the Alt key and drag, and that makes me a copy. Now you'll notice that this often creates these overlaps. So here's where you start to run into sort of layer challenges, where you're trying to keep track of what's on which layer. Well, I know that the previous layer was directly below it in the stack, so I can erase where those overlap. And then I can kind of fill in the gaps, and then just merge those two together. So now I have one layer that's both of those pieces. And I could merge all these together now because I'm done using them. So in that way, cloning a curve can sometimes be the best way to make a similar curve. Definitely won't make you better at drafting, but it'll get the job done. So this brings us to the main question, which is when is it appropriate to use these? And I can't give you a perfect answer. The way I tend to use them is on long, important lines, I will use some crutches. On shorter lines, I'll let mistakes happen. So for instance, if I were doing this paint bottle right here, this line is going to be really important. The interior lines are going to be less important, but this contour describes so much of the shape. So here I'd be comfortable to make it its own layer and to use various free transform options to kind of skew it into place and then erase away what I don't need. I'm comfortable with that. The same would be true for this curve over here. I might use the warp command just to kind of nudge this into position and clean it up a little bit. Now, do I use that for every line I make? Absolutely not. I think that's where you get into really tricky territory. So I'd say the important takeaways here are to be familiar with the ways that you can modify lines once you've drawn them, but don't rely on it. And if you are going to use them, use the hotkeys. These each do have menu items, but boy, does that slow you down. So the good hotkey to know is Ctrl T. that is free transform. And then once you're there, either holding down Control to use each of these skewing points, or to right click and go to the warp command. And with those, you'll have just about all the power you need. Now, whether or not you're going to use these all the time, I would still test them out for your homework. So go ahead and find the gesture drawings I've included of these paint tubes, because these are a great combination of long curves and ellipses, things that are a challenge to get right the first time. So go ahead and just do a nice clean line drawing on top of them, and whenever you find yourself making a line incorrect, instead of erasing it or redrawing it, try the warp command, the free transform command, and the duplicate command. They do take a little getting used to, but I think you'll figure out how powerful they are pretty quick. Have fun. All right, so in this first case study, what I want to focus on is going from big to small, from simple to complicated. So I'm using the loose gestural underpinning, and now I'm going to make sort of choices. I have to sort of pick a line and live with it. If we were writing, the gesture would be my rough draft, and now I'm doing the editing. And when I do cartoon characters like this, I really focus on that outer contour first. This is like the paint tubes where I'm talking about getting those big, long exterior lines in. Well, I'm making them on temporary layers for that reason. These are hard curves to get right the first time. So sometimes you're going to have to put it in a line and then shift it around a little bit. Also, make sure to watch how I'm zooming the camera in and out. I'm using it to help my arm. If I want to make a shorter line, I'll zoom in a bit. If I want to make a longer line, I'll zoom out a bit. And clearly, I'm rotating the canvas a lot. These are all things that start to become second nature. You will just start making lines in specific hotspots on the screen, and you're going to rotate your document to facilitate that. But I said I wanted to focus on big to small. So why have I chosen these particular lines first, and for instance ignored the beak? Well, things like the beak and the eyeball protrude from this larger shape. They're sort of secondary shapes. And what I found works the best for getting these clean lines is to first make the biggest shapes I can find. After that, then on temporary layers, make smaller shapes. And if there are any sort of intersections, that's when I'll use the eraser to fix any mistakes I've made. But you sort of work like a funnel. You make the biggest lines first, and then only later do you sort of zoom in and work on the smaller details. And if you learn to work with temp layers, one aspect of that is figuring out a strategy for your layer management. So you see there, I just merged a bunch of different layers together. Well, that's because at this point, I'm happy with everything I've got and I don't need them to be separate layers. So now I can go ahead and work on the beak on its own layer and I don't have a huge layer stack. But as you see, having the beak on its own is really nice because I can sort of tweak it and skew it using those tools we've talked about. And I don't have to worry about messing up the rest of the shapes. And then when I'm done, I just erase those intersections. So you can see as I draw the eye here, I'm really not afraid to paint way past where I want to. Overshooting lines like that gives you this nice dynamism. They just have such energy because they could go way past the finish line. But what makes it all work so well is memorizing those keyboard shortcuts. And at this point, I'm really only aware of the key presses I'm doing because I'm making videos for you guys. If I'm going to sit down and paint for a whole day, this sort of stuff just fades away into the background. The reason we're doing all of these drills, if we're just using keyboard shortcuts and basic techniques, is just so you memorize this stuff. And you will memorize it, I promise. And once you do, it just feels like an extension of your body. It's really fun. So remember I said big to small? Well, now we're getting to the small. This is when I start zooming in my camera a little bit more, adding details like the nostril on the beak or these little feathers. This is tempting to do at first because they're fun little storytelling details, but are going to be so much more effective if you've knocked in the big shapes first. Now you'll notice in my gesture, I have the indication of lots of little feathers. Well, now that I'm doing the tight line work, I have to make some design choices. I don't necessarily need to draw every single feather. So now I pick individual ones and make a pleasing composition. So I'm essentially using that rough draft, my gesture drawing, as a basis, but now I'm doing the actual drawing. And you'll notice I'm choosing to have more of these feathers in the darker, more shadowed area of the bird. And that's not an accident. Just like those hatching studies we were doing, I'm adding a little bit of artificial darkness around the bottom of the bird just by adding more details. So it's a little design decision, but it subtly adds weight to the bottom of the character. Now, clearly there's feathers everywhere on this whole bird, and it would look really ridiculous if I drew every single feather. So here I'm deciding where I want to add a little bit of visual interest, and also where I want to imply a little bit of shadow or darkness. I know it's not quite like the hatching because we're just doing careful cartoon lines here, but it gives that same impression. In fact, this is one of the reasons I wanted to do those pattern squares that we did earlier in the series, because there's all sorts of opportunities to indicate texture and pattern. Even when you're not rendering a form, like here I'm just drawing contour outlines, I can still indicate a little bit of texture, and it makes the drawing that much richer. Okay, here when I go to make the eyeball, you can see I am doing actual hatching instead of just making a bigger brush. And I've done it on a temp layer so that I'll be able to erase out that highlight a little bit better. Now, do you need to do this? Not necessarily. I could have used a big brush at the end of the image, but I think it just gives it that nice pencil look. It's a very subtle thing, but there's a certain human element when you shade with hatching instead of a big solid brush. Every time you work from a gesture drawing and add a clean drawing on top, you eventually hit a point where you don't need it anymore. So here I'm going to hide the underlay and just look at the line drawing for what it is, because sometimes it's hard to know exactly what your lines look like until you truly hide away the underpart. And now I'm going to go in and just clean it up a bit. So if I want to emphasize certain areas or de-emphasize other areas, here I'm going to use the eraser tool. Because those feathers, for instance, were a little bit too dark. So I wanted to lighten them up, make them feel a little softer. And this wing is such a big element of the design, it felt too empty. So in this case, I'm adding more details, subtle details mind you, but still details that weren't part of my initial gesture. But I don't want to add too many extra details. This is supposed to be a pretty clean drawing, so I'm ready to call this one done. When I drew the cartoon bird, I made a special point to do big stuff first, followed by small stuff. And that is an excellent way to break down the drawing process, but as you get more experience, you'll find you sometimes mix it up a little. As I draw this rhinoceros, you'll notice that I'm not exclusively doing big first, followed by small. This time what I want to focus on is texture and detail. As when we look at the photo reference here, there's a lot of texture and a lot of detail, but I want to make a more simplified photo study. I want to make a contour drawing, not a final rendered image. But I'm starting in exactly the same way, picking some long contour lines, making temp layers, and starting to block in that major contour. The real difference here is now as I continue this shape on where it connects into the rest of the skull, I start getting a little more detailed. Here I'm indicating that bumpy, scratchy surface, but then I jump to a different part of the image. So you can see here, based on my experience, I kind of know what the final result is going to look like. I've done enough drawings like these that I'm starting to draw in kind of a non-linear way. I don't necessarily recommend this, but I just want to show you as a more realistic look into a more professional artist. Working on the ear here is a great example of me using some Photoshop crutches. I'm having a little trouble getting these contours just right. It's got a very particular curve, and they just have such a neat shape that I want to make it right. As a result, I'm making temp layers and erasing away what I didn't like, and I'm also undoing. This just happens sometime. The more you practice, the less it'll happen, but it is, I think, impossible to think you're always going to make perfect lines all the time. Another thing to notice with this ear here is that I'm using line weight to my advantage. Here I have sort of lighter lines that represent these wrinkles, surrounded by heavier lines that define the outer contours of the form. And the way I choose this is not just a stylistic thing. It tells something about the surface itself. You can think of it in terms of depth. A shallow surface detail is going to have a light mark. A really deep groove, well, that's going to have a darker mark. So when I think about adding wrinkles or bumps or nooks and crannies, I can use line weight as a descriptive tool. It can tell the audience a little bit more about that surface. Again, it's all shorthand. I'm sort of reducing down the photographic details into a more cartooned approach. But especially when you're doing that, line weight difference really goes a long way to tell about this form and about the textural details. And there's really no rule on how you have to do this, but when I play with line weight, I tend to draw the heavy line weight first. So here I'm blocking in the major exterior contour of the eyeball, and then I'm going to add supporting details. So these little wrinkles around the eye are lighter line weight, thinner lines, and I'm using them to sort of dress the primary form. This is another case where I'll use the funnel. So I'll draw the bigger shapes zoomed out, and then I'll zoom in that camera and start to add the little tiny things. Because if you just live in always zoomed in all the time, you risk kind of getting tunnel vision, and that's when big mistakes can happen. But if you use the camera to your advantage and have large lines drawn when zoomed out, and then small details once you've locked in the major forms, then you're less likely to make mistakes. Now, clearly, you're also less likely to make mistakes when using an underdrawing like this one. If I skipped the gesture step and went straight to drawing the clean, finished line drawing on a blank page, then I'd really have to be careful about getting too zoomed in. But since I do have this gesture to work on top of, I don't really need to worry about getting the major proportions wrong or anything like that. It's already established. Now, especially in this area down here by the nose and mouth, I know I'm going to be adding details later, but I just want to lock in that primary contour first. Old habits die hard. So here I am establishing the jaw and the sort of envelope that these surface details are going to live inside of. And once those are established, now I feel a little more comfortable about starting to add in those surface textures. Remember, they're complementing the major shapes. They're not the star of the show. So here I'm using a lighter pen pressure, I'm making thinner marks, and I'm trying to use as few marks as I can to describe a bumpy surface. It's really an exercise in economy, more so than trying to tell every tiny little photographic detail. And when you're deciding how much detail to add, remember, it matters what the final result is going to be. For instance, if I were going to make a painting out of this, I don't need to indicate too many details. That's all going to be done in Paint. Really, I'm just giving myself a clean structure to then do a painting inside of. But if the final result was only ever going to be a line drawing, well, then I might add a few more details. So once again, with the ear here, it's big shapes first, followed by smaller and smaller supporting details. And just like in the previous videos, here I'm using texture, surface texture, to show shadow. So I'm kind of telling two different pieces of information with a few different strokes. I'm adding extra wrinkles, which I could really put anywhere, but I'm choosing to put them in this crevice between the ear and the head. So it gives it almost like a little bit of visual weight, as if you can feel that crevice between the two different parts of the form. But at this point, I have most of the big shapes locked in. So now it's time to add in details. Again, it's a careful balance between too much detail, in which case the drawing gets cluttered and unnecessarily busy, or not enough detail, and it doesn't really tell the whole story. This rhino reference has such cool surface texture. I really want to capture that in my sketch. And this is where doing those texture studies and pattern squares really comes into play. It's what kind of interesting mark making can I indicate the texture with, instead of spending hours and hours and hours perfectly reproducing everything I'm seeing. So I've sped up the footage here because, well, there's a lot of repetition in drawing. There's really no way around it. You can see I'm just adding all those little surface details in, supporting the big lines, using light line weight, and using the eraser, because again, I don't want to distract from those major contours I put in place. This is just the icing on the cake, not the cake itself. And then eventually I'm ready to be done with the underdrawing. So I'll just turn that off and reveal only the lines themselves. And like every time, this will show sort of the truth of the drawing. And sometimes this is when you see those mistakes that you've been missing before. So now I just go ahead and balance it out and make sure it works on its own without any help from the underdrawing. And just like before, I'm going to speed up the footage because, well, you don't need to watch all this. It is nothing different. I'm using the same tools and the same keyboard shortcuts. It just takes time. And here I'm debating how much detail is right for this image. But eventually I'm happy to call it finished. And I want to do one more case study to show you a final type of clean line drawing. So let's get to that. Most of the videos in this series focus on the idea of sort of building up to a drawing. You start with a gesture and then you layer on top and you take away the gesture and what you're left with is this refined image. Well, this demonstration is a little different. You can call this a straight ahead drawing, as in I am moving in a linear direction from start to finish, and I'm not relying so much on layering. In fact, this is a lot more like drawing in a sketch pad or drawing on paper. It's sort of a traditional approach, a very basic, no frills drawing. And I want to bring digital sketching too to a close with this demonstration because sometimes it's just casual. I'm teaching you a bunch of specific ways to draw and specific ways to use Photoshop, but the truth is there's not always a map to follow. Sometimes you just get out a pencil and start drawing, and you can do that just as easily in Photoshop. Now, as you've seen here, I am starting with larger, sort of faster, more gestural lines. I'm still giving myself that framework. The difference with this drawing is that I'm not actually keeping it on its own layer. Here I'm just using it as sort of my first lines. And then as I draw tighter, narrower lines on top, I'm leaving the other ones there. This means I'm going to rely much more heavily on the eraser. And so I'm going to be switching back and forth between brush and eraser, brush and eraser. And as this drawing progresses, you'll see eventually there's going to be less of that underdrawing. But I don't achieve it with Photoshop tricks. The way I'm drawing here, I could just as easily draw on paper. But the really important takeaway to all this is that the stuff that I learned with the exercises about cross-hatching and using long lines and all the things we've talked about so far still apply to this sort of drawing. Those foundation skills that we learned will always be useful. It doesn't matter if you're painting or drawing, you're just learning to describe what you're seeing and to do so by making marks. And even when you make a drawing that is simple like this one that doesn't have any complicated layering, I'm still thinking about all those techniques. I'm thinking about using heavier line weight to describe maybe a primary contour or something that has a little bit more weight to it, and then thinner lines to describe the secondary details. I'm trying to draw from my elbow or my shoulder whenever possible. I'm thinking of ways to do shorthand surface texture. So just like before, I might want to have more texture in areas that are darker and less texture in areas that are lighter, even though the reality is that this lizard has texture all over its entire body. But as I draw in this straight ahead method, you'll notice that the eraser becomes much more important. I'm adding a lot of lines, sure, but I'm also then pulling that pigment away. So I really think about both tools with equal weight. I might add a line and then erase away on top of it, and in doing so create this sort of overlay texture. And especially when you only have one layer, you're going to be doing a lot of erasing, honestly, and you're going to be erasing in a way that's different from the way you do with temp layers. It's not draw a big line and then carve away the excess. This is more careful erasing. The more and more marks I get down on the page, I have to kind of carefully erase around them. If you've had experience drawing on paper, this is not news to you. This is how drawing's always been since the beginning of time. It's only now that we have Photoshop that we can sort of take a different approach. But again, with this demonstration, I want to show that the fundamentals that I've been teaching you apply just as well to a straight ahead traditional drawing just like this one. From a strategic standpoint, sometimes drawing like this can be a little more dangerous. Like for instance, you'll notice I'm putting a lot of detail around this eyeball when I haven't really even finished the rest of the composition. Well, that is a risk. If for some reason I were to get, I don't know, another 20 minutes into the drawing and realize that something was the wrong proportion, then I'd have a challenge on my hands. But in this case, I just put down essentially a sketched loose framework and then dove right into the details. As a warning, that's not always the safest way to go. I'm giving this demonstration as sort of a casual example, as in maybe I'm just doing loose warm-up sketches, but anytime I do a more serious drawing, something that needs to be accurate, I would not work this way. I've learned the hard way too many times. If you just jump right into the details without thoroughly locking down that composition, you can run into trouble. And I'll speed up the footage here to show the final detail pattern work here, but this is no different than those pattern swatches we did. I'm looking at my reference, I'm thinking about how could I describe all of this photographic detail without drawing for 10 hours. I think this entire drawing took me about 20 minutes. So you have to think about what's the most efficient, most concise way you can describe that information. Really, that's what drawing is most times. It's communicating something to the viewer efficiently. After all, we are not photographers. I do center my details around the eyeball though, because this is just one of those compositional tricks. If you want your viewer to focus on one specific area, make it the most contrasty, make it the most detailed. Because when you make a drawing like this, you're in charge. You don't have to copy things exactly as you see them. You're making an image, and that's what your audience is going to see. So make some critical choices. As you continue on with this collection, we're going to talk about ways to really flesh out these drawings. We're going to talk a little bit about shading, and then we're also going to talk about really technical drawing, using Photoshop to make very mechanical, tough subjects. And the way we achieve that accuracy is actually with some Photoshop tricks. And then after that, it's into imaginary subject matter, where we take all of these different skills we've been learning and then apply them to something that's never been seen before. But before you proceed to any of those videos, this step is important. Being able to draw clean, freehand lines with a pencil inside of Photoshop is an essential skill. It is hard, it takes lots and lots of practice, and it's probably not going to come as easily to you as maybe coloring did. So give yourself time with this. Take the exercises seriously, those are really good homework, but beyond that, do some photo studies. It's easiest to learn these skills when you have reference to look at. Then you don't have to worry about design. So for now, things like the iguana I'm drawing here are great practice. It's a tricky subject matter and you're going to have to use all those different drawing techniques, but ultimately you're essentially copying a photo, which allows you to just focus on the mechanical act of drawing. So thanks again for buying the series. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I know you've got no shortage of work to do. But whenever it is that you do feel comfortable and you're ready to proceed, I look forward to seeing you in part 3, where we'll talk all about shading. Until then, thanks for coming to Ctrl Paint, and have fun drawing. Hey guys, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com, and first off, I just want to thank you for supporting the site by buying this series. It really makes a big difference, and I appreciate it. And I think this series is a really interesting middle ground, because you notice that it is part of the digital sketching collection. And digital sketching, as I've described it so far, is primarily linear. You have loose lines, you have tight lines, but when you look in artists' sketchbooks or at storyboards, something you'll commonly see is what I'm going to describe as tone. And the idea here is that you are using simplified light and shadow to describe a little bit more information without spending a whole lot of time. As you know, this whole collection is trying to demystify digital sketching, to break it down into its component parts. And that conversation wouldn't be complete without talking about tone. Because no, it's not, strictly speaking, linear sketching. And it might not be what you think of when you think of sketching. Well, my argument is that it is essential. And in this series, we're going to talk about why. So when we look at a sketch like this one from Michelle Hafner, you can see it tells a lot more about the form than a simple contour line drawing would have done. If you squint though, even though this is hatching, it's really just two tones. You have the white of the page, and then you have a single value that is the shadow. This is totally different from the sort of rendering we do in the basic rendering series, where you have the full value range represented in an image. You could think of this as the shorthand version, the simplified version. Clearly a drawing like this takes less time, but it tells a lot more information than just lines. These thumbnails are another great example. Yes, it's cross-hatching, and yes, it's probably done with a ballpoint pen, but if you squint your eyes at it, you can still see that two-tone breakdown. You have the white of the page, and then you have a shadow value. And then, of course, there's also the contour lines. But it is a great shorthand of form. Here we've broken away from the idea of cross-hatching, and we're using a wider marker. So here, spot blacks, those little areas of shadow filled in, really help break up the form. So this is very stylized. Here, this is nothing like a full value rendering of light and dark. This is more of a poster. It's two values. But as you can see, it gives more information than a simple line drawing would do. Now this might look really different at a glance, but it's actually the same idea. So here there was, granted, a more detailed sketch that was made, but once they made the sketch, they toned it with a single value. You have light and you have shadow. It would take much quicker to do a drawing like this than it would to do a full illustration, but you can tell there's a lot of information being conveyed here. So this is one step further. Here we have three tones. We have the white of the page, a middle gray, and a black. And when you have three tones, it gives you even a little more flexibility. Now we have the ability to differentiate between the black rubber tires and then the body of the motorcycle. They're literally different materials. And I know that because the tires are solid black, but within the body of the motorcycle, the core shadows are gray. So this indicates to me that the material is different. It doesn't necessarily tell me what the material is. This is not a complete rendering with specular highlights and all that, but it gives me a little bit more information. And it does it while still being very distilled down to the essence. Another way you can go with it is to use it for purely graphic reasons. So here we have cast shadows, and we also have graphic shapes. They sort of look like cast shadows, but on closer inspection, you can see they're actually just sort of black areas used to separate the object from the white of the page. So here, tones are not being used to describe the formal qualities of the object. Rather, they are being used in a 2D graphic sense, like a piece of graphic design or page layout. But even still, two tones, the white of the page and the black of the cast shadows, really pop that image out. It gives it a little something extra that you wouldn't have with just the line drawing alone. With these ones here, yet again, same idea. They are just giving it a little bit of something extra, a little more visual interest that a strict line drawing wouldn't include. Now, it'd be impossible to talk about the subject without talking about storyboards. Storyboard artists have to be absolutely fast. If you're doing 100 drawings a day, you do not have the option of doing a full value rendering. Your job is to convey as much information as you can, but to do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. So with this in mind, storyboards are a great use case for, we'll call it abstracted lighting. Here you can see the tones are spread around the canvas with very specific intention. All the characters in the frame are not treated equally. If there are shadows, they're maybe only used selectively to draw the eye. This is not a traditional lighting and rendering. This is just telling a story. And when you see a halfway toned drawing like this, it's not because the storyboard artist is lazy or that they're bad at lighting or don't understand how to do shading. In fact, I'd argue that they know very well how to do traditional lighting and rendering. But what you're seeing here is the absolute bare minimum. They are communicating the message they want to tell you with as few marks as possible. So toning, in my opinion, is sort of a puzzle. You're trying to indicate form and indicate lighting or material, but to do it with just the essence, nothing extra. And I think these marker landscape sketches are a great example of that. If you sit out in the field or out in your neighborhood and you look around you, there are so many details. Figuring out how to capture that with a big thick marker like the ones he's using is really tricky because he has to have some strategy. He has to decide, okay, I'm going to use black to describe the darkest cast shadows. And I'm going to eliminate a lot of other little tiny details, but I'm going to use just these few specifically chosen values, and I'm going to tell the entire story with that. It's an amazing challenge of reduction. How much can you strip away? How much can you simplify while still giving the impression of the scene? Now, in this example, as well as some of those earlier sketches I showed, the artist has one advantage that you might not be aware of. They're actually using markers that are a specific value of gray. Now, I use these in college a lot, and they're popular with industrial designers and comic book artists. And the idea is you might have a 50% gray marker or a 10% gray, which is very, very light. And so you choose ahead of time, maybe 2 or 3 of these different tones, and you throw them in your bag with you. And then when you go to make your line drawing, the only values you can apply to it are the ones that you have represented by your markers. So you leave with the white of the page and then a couple values of gray plus the line, and that's it. The media is literally restricting your palette to those few values. So unlike using cross-hatching to describe various gradations of light and shadow, you have flat tones, and that's all you have to work with. And if you're not intimidated by that, it gives you this great efficiency. You don't have to spend time trying to carefully block in light and shadow. You just lay down flat color and move on. And that's what I want to talk about in this series. We're not going to be literally using markers. I'm going to show you how to do it in Photoshop, but we're going to talk about strategies to have a shorthand for lighting and shadow. As you can see, these artists all have very different looking artwork, but what they all share in common is a strategy. I bet if you looked at other images created by these artists, they would have a similar treatment of light and shadow because they're just used to doing it this way. It's not a finished artwork, it's a sketch, but it tells a lot more than a line drawing would. So let's take a look at how to set this up in Photoshop. For the sake of this course, I'm going to assume you've never used those grayscale markers, so you don't really have the same reference point that I do. And we are going to be focusing on Photoshop. So if we look at this sketch right here, the important thing to notice from it is that it has one tone. Right here you can see I've sort of sampled it off to the side. Now, why is this important? It's important because, like the markers, you are doing your strategizing ahead of time. Now, in other videos in the digital sketching series, I've really encouraged you to practice in exactly the way that I've included. Well, I've not included a set of tone brushes, and I've done that on purpose. As you saw with all the other artists, this is so much personal preference. So instead of talking about the exact brushes I think you should use, this video is going to be about setting up a system that works for you. So I'm going to encourage you, when we're done with this, for you to actually take some time and design your own, and know that it's going to be something you tweak as you work. But like I said, designing your system ahead of time is the crucial part. Because if I have a single tone here, and I've given myself a little sample on the side, when I go to draw, I don't have to think about it. All I have to think about is it a shadow? Yes. Let's say there was another shadow being cast in from the side of the frame. I don't have to think about what value I'm using. So if that's the case, there's a couple different ways to handle it in Photoshop. The simplest of which is to literally just give yourself little swatches before you start. So this is a single tone, but maybe you say, well, I want a 3-tone. Okay, so I have the white of the page. We'll call this my middle, and then I'm just going to give myself another dark one. For all the examples I give in this series, you'll see mine are actually relatively light, maybe a 10% and a 30%. And that's just old habit. There's really no rules to this. But if you have your 2 values here, now you use the same tool. So here I just have a brush tool selected, and I'm just going to Alt-click on the sample to essentially change which marker I'm using. So I'm just grabbing from a preset palette, that's all, using one brush and the Alt key to switch back and forth between the 2 values. That is the most direct and simple. But it does require you to have these dots on the side of your image, and it requires you to set the same dots up every time you make a painting. So another approach you could take would be to make tool presets. Now you've seen me use these in other videos, but the way it would work would be you start with your basic. We'll say this 40 pixel brush is about what I want. So it's got all the qualities I want. Now I'm going to set the value. So this would be like going to the store and buying a 10% marker or a 50% marker. I'm going to set the value at, here I'll do my real light one. So that would be about a 10% marker. And now I will save a new tool preset. Now it's important with this to include the color. So here I'll say hard round 10%. And then I'll change the value to whatever I want my second tone to be. And here I'll make another one, hard round, and we'll call this one 50%. Okay, so the way this works is I just have my markers. Well, they're tool presets in this case, but the same idea is true. So I have a brush out, and let's say I want to add some of that light value. I just click on the 10% marker. Okay, now I want to add a little dark value. All right, well then I click on the 50%. So with this, it's just a single click. It gives me the right marker, and I'm ready to go. The really nice thing about this technique is that your system is absolutely set up every time you make a painting. Here in my tool presets, I could keep them at the bottom, I keep them at the top, wherever I want. It's just like having physical markers in your bag ready to go. No thinking necessary, you're set up ahead of time. So here as I'm drawing this robot, you can see I'm using a similar approach. I have a white page, I'm using a couple simple values. And this is good. It gives you what I would call very similar to a traditional sketchbook feel. Now, some artists prefer to avoid the white of the page and instead have one of the tones be a toned page as the starting point, which they can then have a darker tone as a shadow on top, but they can also use a opaque white to pull out highlights. This is a technique that I associate with doing life drawing because it's common with life drawing to have a toned page that you use as the skin tone. The core shadow would be a darker charcoal, and then you'd use a white Conte crayon as the white highlights. But there's nothing that says this has to be traditional media. It is just as easy in Photoshop to start with a toned canvas and then go a little bit darker and a little bit lighter. So keep in mind when you're designing your system, the color of the page is going to matter. That's going to be sort of an anchor in your tone breakdown. It's possible you would have 2 sets of tools. You'd have your white page tools and you'd have your toned page tools. And you can even make a document preset that has a specific background color. You don't have to start with a white document. Now, the final thing I want to mention about the actual technique side and the tool side is the way I'll be applying paint. As you've seen in tons of videos at this point, the way I like to apply tone is with temporary layers. So here you see me adding a little bit of pigment and then erasing some away, and then making a new layer and adding a little pigment, erasing some away. Nothing changes when I use tone. Now, I've talked a lot about markers, and so it might seem weird that I'm painting with soft edges, for instance. Well, what I want to point out here is that what I like about these markers is that they have set values. In the same way that some people like painting with specific tubes of paint. The really important part here are the values themselves. So I'm not going to try and reproduce all those other inconvenient aspects of markers, things like needing to use whiteout when you make a mistake. The part that I am trying to reproduce is having some tools that you always keep with you and that work in a very predictable way. But I want to reiterate, this is personal preference. I encourage you to pause the video at this point and to think about what works best for your workflow. What kind of brushes do you normally like using? Think about how you can handpick a few that you're going to set aside and call them your toning markers, although obviously they don't need to look anything like markers. The only important thing is that you do planning ahead of time, that you have your strategy ready to go, and then we're going to start tackling challenges and doing photo studies using that strategy. So give it some thought. I really wish I remembered the attribution for this quote, but it stuck with me regardless. So one time, a very famous artist was asked, how long did it take you to do one of those thumbnail sketches? And instead of saying the truth, which was it took, 30 seconds, what they said was, it took me my entire career. Now, obviously they were not being literal, but their point is an important one. The thumbnail sketch on its own does more than the sum of its lines. What it's doing is it's simplifying a very complicated idea in a really small package, a very quick execution. But then when the artist looks at it, they remember the much more detailed thing in their imagination. So a thumbnail sketch can only be done after years of experience of drawing the long version. Well, the same is true for lighting and rendering. What I'm going to be advocating in these next videos relies on the fact that you know how to render for real. In order to do the shorthand version or the reduced, simplified version, you have to be able to do the real thing first. Long story short, we're about to fake it. And faking it only really works if you're good at actually doing it right in the first place. Okay, so what two major things are we going to fake with this sort of lighting and rendering? The first and most important one is form. And form is simply shadow describing the way an object exists in 3D space. So you have a spotlight on an object, it casts a shadow, it has form shadows, and our brain looks at those things and understands the three-dimensional shape or form of the object. Okay. This is what really adds information quickly to a drawing. What were flat lines a moment ago now give body and dimension with just a little bit of form information. So here with these paint tubes, all I'm doing with the marker is indicating form. I am faking a light source. The light source doesn't exist in the scene. I'm just kind of throwing one in there. And the way that I'm applying the paint is pretty straightforward. Just like I showed in the last video, I'm just doing temporary layers. So I'll start with the biggest shapes first. I'll apply large areas of pigment. And then generally speaking, I will remove pigment with a soft eraser. So for me, the way I like to do it happens to be add pigment with a hard brush, remove it with a soft brush, and you get good control that way. Now, this part is totally personal preference. But don't be distracted by the way that I'm applying the paint. The real important thing I'm doing here is I'm imagining a light source. And once I've practiced and learned a lot about lights, I'm able to pretty convincingly make these look like three-dimensional paint tubes. This is faking it. I'm not looking at reference. I didn't make a 3D render as an example. This is just combining all of my history and experience with doing still life drawings and doing life drawing and really understanding lighting. Now I can kind of fake it well enough that it looks convincing. And I'm intentionally using very, very simple objects here to serve as the first example. And if you're new to this, this is what I'd suggest for you. Starting with a essentially cylinder with a few bumps here and there, is a really great way to test kind of the basics of this technique. But truly, the best way to practice this, especially if you're new to it, is to start with photo reference. So here I have a slightly more complicated form, and I've already done the line drawing for all these examples. Let's not focus on lines for now. You have your sketch, you have the photo reference. Now all we're trying to do is simplify the light and shadow. Now clearly the photo has a whole range of values. There's the very dark cast shadow, and then on the red hinge itself, the shadows are a little bit lighter. We're going to ignore all that for now. Remember, we're simplifying. We have one marker. It's not really a marker, but you get my meaning. And with this flat tone, I'm going to describe all of the shadows. So the first low-hanging fruit, the very easy choice, is the cast shadow. Of course, we're going to include the cast shadow. But then it becomes a question of which shadows in this photograph are essential for describing this object three-dimensionally. I'm not trying to reproduce the photo. It's not a photo study in that sense. What I'm trying to do is give it a little more of a believable 3D nature, trying to make it pop off the page. In a sense, I'm sculpting with light. That's the way that I'm describing the 3D form, is I'm using shadows and the areas of dark and areas of light to describe the three-dimensional qualities of this object. And you get better at this with practice. There's a reason that I do a lot of studies from photos, studies from observation. This is how you cement those general rules of thumb. And then once you've figured out some things that generally work a certain way, then when you go to design your own subject matter, it's so much easier. You already know what happens when a cylinder is hit by a spotlight. You've seen it 100 times and you've done those studies. So you could think of a study like this one as an opportunity to learn how basic shapes exist in light. And then you file away those lessons you learned for another day when you're going to not have photo reference and you have to be able to imagine this stuff. So with all that said, how would I approach a beetle like this one? Is it cylinders? Is it rectangles? Not exactly. It's obviously an organic form, but we can apply all those same basic rules. Like I generally know that I'm going to fill with a hard brush first, and then I'm going to erase away to indicate the roundness of the form. So I want to start with this big major shape as my first element. And, it takes a little bit of precision to get those edges in, and then you just fill in the rest. Now it comes time to erasing it away and explaining that form. So I'll use a big brush, and I'm going to erase away essentially the highest area of the 3D form that's pointing at the light source. And then as it gets into these smaller forms, I have to be more specific about the way that I erase. But you can see really quickly there, it went from being very flat to giving a general sense of form. Now, is it perfect? Is it absolutely realistic? Probably not. But it works well enough. And this is what I'm talking about with sort of faking it well enough. You learn the lessons by doing photo studies when you have essentially the answer to look at. But then when it comes to your real sketches, like this beetle, you don't have an answer. There's really no way to know if you're going to light it just right. So you have to trust in your experience and those lessons you've learned in your studies to apply them to whatever subject matter you might invent. But all the same technical lessons apply. I'm using tone in the exact same way I did on the hinge. This just happens to be something with no photo reference. So this, again, is why those studies are so important. Especially as a beginner, I think you can look at a subject like this and think, ooh, that's pretty detailed, that's pretty tricky. But what I'm doing mentally is quickly reducing this into essentially cylinders, spheres, basic things that I understand the rules for. Because when I do the hinge study, it's not so I know how to draw hinges in the future. What I'm looking at is essentially cylinders in space. And so what I'm filing away in my mind is how the light falls on top of basic geometric objects. The fact that it's called a hinge is really not important, because at a glance there's not much similar between a hinge and a beetle. But when you simplify them into geometric objects, they become a lot more similar, and then you can apply the same rules. All right, so now let's up the ante. You're thinking, all right, I was with you on the beetle. The beetle's pretty cylindrical. This is a totally different story. This tank is very complicated. There's no way I could invent a simple toning solution. Well, that is not true. This is all very basic shapes if you're willing to mentally simplify it. And so you're going to apply tone in the exact same way. I don't want to dwell too much on the specifics of how I'm envisioning this light. This is really something I talk more about in basic rendering too, and I encourage you to check that out. But the fact is, these rules are very versatile, and the things you learn on a hinge apply just as effectively to something very complicated like this tank. It takes a little longer to describe the form, and you can see here I'm just getting started, but let's flash forward to the ending, and you can see that there's no difference. It's the same steps repeated over and over. I'm using a single tone for all the shadows on the entire tank. It gives it a nice, clean, graphic look. It gives much more information than the line drawing did on its own, but ultimately it's shorthand. This is simplified light. It's great for sketching. Now, if we flash back a bit, you might remember I talked about thumbnail sketches using cast shadows, but also graphic shapes, just to kind of make an object pop out from the page. Well, in this example, I'm going to do the same thing with my tank. I'm going to use the same single tone I've been using for all the shadows. And now I've gone ahead and selected the shape of the tank ahead of time just to make this a little easier. But the idea here is I'm just going to put a big graphic shape in the background. The reason I'm doing it at the top of this composition and not at the bottom is because I was sort of losing the silhouette, and it was a little hard to see the shape of those top elements. And then the design works better as a single page layout. It makes it, a unified composition. But again, the whole thing is one tone. And if you have something that is very simplified and almost posterized like this, then it can be kind of fun to go ahead and do some post-processing, and really quickly with a few tweaks in Photoshop, you can take what was white and gray and turn it into something that looks more like a blueprint. But that's a discussion for another time. The essential lesson I want to leave you with in this chapter is that form matters. In my opinion, form is one of the most important aspects of sketching with tone. So doing a still life like this one is a really great way to practice that. The objects in this case do have their own materials, and some are shiny, some are flat. They all have different colors. But for this exercise, I'm ignoring all of that. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the photo reference, and all I care about is the light falling across the objects. I'm focusing on the core shadows and the cast shadows, because these are the lessons that I'm going to need to apply to who knows what subject matter in the future. But the wonderful thing about still lifes is that they are three-dimensional objects in space, and light is falling across them, which means they teach you invaluable lessons that you can use for your entire career. It doesn't matter that one happens to be porcelain, one happens to be a pear. What I'm looking at is light. So I really encourage you to do drawings like these. The way I created this one was actually to take a photo, and then I traced the photo to get my line work because I wasn't focusing on lines. All I wanted was lighting. I want to practice my lighting because I want to learn those lessons that I can apply in the future. And then once you've got your traced photo ready to go, pick a single tone, and you can use whatever kind of brushes you want, but you're just using a single tone for the shadows. and then light your whole scene. And if one still life went pretty well, do a second still life, do a third still life. This is one of the best things you can practice when it comes to just making believable 3D objects. And I understand it's not the sexiest subject matter in the world. It's not all that exciting. But take my word for it, this is how you improve. All right, so you've been practicing a while and you think, all right, I got this. Take one marker, describe the form of the object with tone. Very simple. Totally makes sense. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's only one of the things that we are going to simplify with markers. A different area you can simplify is what I'm going to call the value pattern of a scene. Remember when we looked at these really nice marker sketches of these outdoor environments? This is a great example of value pattern. What he's done here is he's broken down a very complicated full either color or full black and white scene into a few specific values. And to do so, he needed to do some problem solving, he needed to simplify, and he needed to make choices. Well, that's what we're doing next. When we look at this very boring, uninteresting photo of an arch window, we'll notice that there's a lot of different information happening here. Now, I picked something that's intentionally not very round, like the form objects I've been describing before. Here we have essentially a flat wall with a hole cut in it. But on the flat wall, there's light bricks and there's dark bricks. So now we have a new challenge. It's not using tone to describe form while ignoring materials. Here we're going to essentially forget form and just think about where are there dark areas in this image, where are there light areas in this image. Now, some of the dark areas, like inside the arch, are because of lighting, as in it's darker in there and it's lighter out here. But some of the light and middle values are just because of the color of the bricks, as in we have light bricks and we have red bricks. So now I've got decision making to do. It's time to take those 3 tones and to break the scene down into a value pattern. Now, it's not going to end up looking exactly like the photo, obviously. We're still trying to work quickly, we're trying to simplify, but it's a totally different challenge. Before, in the previous examples, what I was thinking about was the 3-dimensional quality of the object. I was ignoring everything else. But here you see I'm looking much more specifically at the distribution of lights and darks in the scene. And eventually I end up with something that I'm happy to call finished, and with a quick before and after, we can see that there's a lot more information here than there was with just the line drawing. Okay, let's try the same idea, but this time we're going to use a skull. Now, skulls are a really tricky subject matter for one specific reason. They're sort of like a face. And as soon as we see a face, we start making mistakes like crazy because we know what a face looks like, really specifically know what it looks like. And what that translates to in a drawing is we try and get too detailed and too specific because we're just so hardwired to analyze faces. But remember, what we're doing is trying to simplify any subject into 3 tones. We're trying to think about the value pattern, not necessarily just the form. So the trick is to try and forget that this is a skull, to squint my eyes at the reference image and to find those areas of value separation. What should be the dark value? What should be the middle tone of the page? And then what should I reserve for highlights? Remember, I'm applying the exact same process to this that I would to a boring archway window. I have to forget that this has eyeballs. They can really throw you off. So the trick here is really just simplification. I'm not trying to reproduce the lighting of the image perfectly. I'm trying to capture the sense of the image, and to do so with simple, flat tones. As I add the opaque white into the image, this is another area where you can start to get a little too fussy and slow down. We want to keep it simple. I want to try and ignore all the tiny little surface imperfections and bumpiness of the photo reference and really think in bold graphic separation. If you want to think of it as poster art, think of it as poster art. The idea here is simple and clean, not finicky and detailed. Now, the final thing I want to show here is where I'm selectively choosing to describe form. Here you just saw me add a little bit of shadow on the edge of the jaw. Now, the reason I put that there is because the jaw was the same color as the ground in the background. And what that led to is you can't tell the two apart. Well, I want to have a clear visual separation. I need to make this composition read clearly. So to do so, I'm going to fake the lighting a little bit. Now, you'll notice I'm not applying that same treatment to the forehead of the skull. If we look at the photo reference, the forehead is actually darker than the background, whereas in my image, the forehead is lighter than the background. Well, this is where it comes down to those decisions you have to make. I only have 3 tones to work with, and what I decided was more important was that the eye sockets were darker than the forehead. I wanted them to stand out very clearly, and I also wanted there to be the highlight on the left side of the skull to be brighter. Well, that's my 3 values right there. So when you're doing a value pattern like this and you're working with a limited tone palette, you have to decide what's the most important. And by definition, what that means is some things are not as important and you're going to have to kind of break the rules a little bit. But that's what this assignment is all about. Looking at a complicated full value range reference photo and then figuring out a way to cram that into 3 flat values. It's really tricky. And that challenge only gets harder when you have a full scene. With the skull, we just had one object and a simple background. Here we have a much more complicated subject. The bridge, the sky, the trees, the building, they've all got different values, and in this case, even color. So the challenge, once again, is to strategize on how I can break them down into 3 values. I have the gray of the page, a shadow tone, and a highlight tone. So you can see here, it's really not a question of how do I carefully paint brushstrokes. The brushstrokes are a little bit sloppy. It's not really the focus here. Now, what we're doing is a puzzle. And it generally starts with me deciding what are the most crucial areas of contrast. In this case, I knew the sky needed to be white, and I knew that the bridge needed to have those dark shadows under the arches. The rest is all relative. I have the big areas blocked in, and now it's just a question of how do I add a little bit of detail to, call out some of those details from the photo while still only using those 3 markers. I have 3 flat tones. That's it. Got to get creative. And this is such a great exercise to focus on simplification, because what I have established here at the block-in phase is obviously a lot more simplified than the photo. But in graphic terms, it reads more clearly than the photo, so that's good. As an illustration, this would be a clear starting point. And I don't want to focus too much on painting for this course, because what we're talking about is sketching with tone. But know that this is a great building block towards designing your own full paintings. Paintings always work better if they have a clear thumbnail or a clear block-in to start from. And so in a way, you're practicing some painting skills by being able to look at a complicated photo like this one and to force yourself to describe it in only 3 values. And as I continue here, I do start to break up these larger areas into more contrasty details. I'm picking specific areas of cracks or mold, the things that really pop out about this bridge, and I'm deciding which of these are important enough. Because every detail I add threatens breaking up the clarity of that big original shape. So it's kind of a balancing act, and you'll see me going back and forth here. The clean, bold separation of 3 values from the beginning is something I want to keep. But it's also important to be able to indicate details. So it's up to you on how you want to balance these 2 factors, but that's the central challenge at work here. How much detail is too much, and where do you want to put your contrast? And of course, those are challenges you make in every drawing. They're just more obvious when you only have 3 tones to work with. That's when it really feels like a puzzle. Now you've seen a few of these in action, let's pause before continuing with this mountain range. Before you thought about the idea of using just a limited tone range, looking at a photo study like this might seem like an exercise in small details. There's a lot of low contrast, interesting details happening on the mountains. In the clouds in the background, there's a lot of sort of subtle striping. Really, in general, there's a lot of details here. But you've witnessed how a complicated scene can be distilled down into a simple value pattern. So we have 3 tones to work with, complicated mountain range to capture. It turns out this is actually a lot more straightforward than it looks. If you squint at this photo reference, it's pretty much 3 tones. So just like before, I start with the large areas of contrast, lock in those important relationships, and then using my 3 values, I figure out how to make the rest work. I have to cheat a few areas and kind of bend it to my whim. But now that I'm finished here, you can see all the major important information is there. There's not a lot of details, but the whole thing took just a couple minutes. And I think that's largely due to the fact that I really limited myself to just 3 tones. So before we go any further, I strongly encourage you to find some challenging photos and to try this yourself. Your 3 tones don't have to match my 3 tones. You could do 4 if you really wanted, but pick a limited number of tones, set them up ahead of time, choose the brushes you're going to use, have all those decisions made before you get started. Then get your photo reference and see if you can simplify them down into a basic 3-tone value pattern. And it's entirely possible that this is harder than you're expecting, that it's going to be frustrating and that the results aren't going to look that great. But that's okay. That's why we're practicing. This is a mental exercise more than a brushwork exercise. You're training yourself to simplify and to break down a complicated thing into a simple result, and that's not easy, but it's worth trying. This is an essential skill for sketching and later for painting, and you're going to be happy you've practiced it. So now we've talked about 2 totally different things to simplify with tone. On one hand, we talked about describing form, as in the 3-dimensional qualities of an object. And on the other hand, we talked about breaking down an entire composition into lights and darks. Well, the fact is, those 2 are not separate ideas. You can mix and match as much as you like. As you can see, I have one of the paint tubes from earlier, and I've cloned it 6 times and given it a little bit of a background. So let's see how we can combine those 2 ideas. Here, what you can see I've created immediately gives a wide variety of options. Once again, I've started with a very simple 3-tone setup. So you can see here I have sort of a dark one, a middle one, and then the white of the page. Those are the only tones that I used for all these examples. They're all done very quickly, but you can see there's a wide variety in the results. I'd also say that these represent different needs for an image. This first one in the upper left-hand corner, for instance, this is much more like I would just do a normal page of sketches. Maybe I was creating the front view and the side view like I did with these robots, and I just want to give it a little bit of body. And with that in mind, I'm really just thinking about form here. I'm indicating a little bit of specular highlight here on the cap, so you can tell that there are different materials at work, shininess. But by and large, I'm really not separating materials here. I am not thinking about black and white at a compositional level. I'm just making the objects a little bit more three-dimensional. And for me, this is the quickest. Here is a variation of that where I did the same but on toned paper. So this actually took fewer brushstrokes because a lot of the image is a midtone. I pulled out a few highlights, as you can see, and I also put in these drop shadows. But really, this was very, very quick. And this is the same idea as using toned paper, dark charcoal, and light Conte crayon. And pretty quickly, you can establish a tonal relationship without making a whole lot of brushstrokes. Now, these other examples have a much stronger compositional feel. I'm using a value pattern in the way we talked about with those photo studies. The difference, of course, here is that I didn't start from a photo. So the idea here is to show the way you spread value around your canvas really matters. This one, I changed the lighting completely. Here I have like a spotlight kind of shining across the tube of paint, where the other ones have much more uniform lighting. Maybe it's fluorescent lighting or sort of a overcast day with light coming in through the window. So this one up here deals more with the importance of light. So I reserved high contrast to describe illumination and shadow. I don't really get very specific about what materials this object has and what material the table is, because really what I wanted to emphasize was light. This one, on the other hand, is completely the opposite. Here you can see I reserved my value distribution exclusively to describe materials. As in, we've got a plate. That has to be lighter than the table. The table is actually the same color as that cast shadow because I ran out of values. I needed to make the tube lighter than the table, and I knew I wanted the tube to have a specular hotspot, so that needed to be my lightest value. And then the table was the darkest, so there's my three values. With that in mind, I was willing to sacrifice the separation of the cast shadow from the table because in this example, materials are more important. I wanted the viewer to look at this and know, okay, it's a striped paint tube, and there's a plate, and there's a wood table, and there's maybe the corner of a room, and then here's a doorway. It gives a very quick breakdown of separating the objects from each other, which is a very different challenge than here, where I'm separating light from dark. Even though these two had the exact same line work, this one doesn't necessarily give the stripes of the paint tube as obviously. You can't necessarily tell that this is a plate, but they were both done very quickly and efficiently. And that's really the beauty of just using a few tones, is you're sort of balancing total free range of ideas with the efficiency of doing your thinking ahead of time. And these two, again, are just totally different examples. This is a dark paint tube that does have a little bit of material identity here. We can see that whatever these stripes are painted with are a shinier material. They have a tighter highlight, and then the tube itself has a wider highlight, so it's maybe more of a matte finish. But because I'd used my tones to describe a lot of detail on the paint tube, I was left with fewer tones to work with for the rest here. Now, another thing I wanted to do was to have the tube stand out from its surroundings. Remember, contrast is a very valuable tool. So here I wanted a dark tube with a dark cap, and I knew I had to have a little cast shadow underneath it. But here you'll notice the cast shadow is actually lighter than the object. So what this indicates to me is maybe the table is a white table. So anything cast on a white table is going to have a lighter shadow than the same shadow on a dark object like this paint tube. So the net effect of all that is that the paint tube stands out in a stark relief to the white objects surrounding it. And you might notice these storyboards have a very similar tonal treatment. They all use a very narrow range of tones, perhaps 2 or 3 markers, just like I was using, and none of them give a full lighting breakdown of the scene. Here you can see they're using light selectively. Each character is casting shadows here. This probably has the most uniform lighting of all the pieces. Whereas in this scene, he's clearly aware of the way that light is falling across these forms, but it's very much an indication. And then there's nothing at all in the background. Whereas here, we are using a dark, essentially solid tone just to call out this foreground element. Maybe they're in a shadow, and then the character in the middle ground here is really the focus, so he is more illuminated. And then the light on him is, yet again, kind of a flat tone. So really, this is efficient storytelling tone breakdown, not naturalistic rendering. And even though this is a single story sequence, the artist is using a different treatment of tone from shot to shot. These are just tools that he has at his fingertips, and he doesn't need to apply them in the exact same way every time. So with all that in mind, let me show you one of these in progress to see exactly how efficient all this is. So I've got my line work, and for this one, I think I just want to give it a bit more body. Now, I do want to make the cap its own color, so I'm just going to leave that as a flat dark tone. Okay, that's enough information. And a lot of times I'll use layers order to my advantage. So here I move that cap to the top of the stack, just so it gives me one fewer edge to have to worry about here. And then I really use erasing as much as I use applying material. That's, again, personal preference, but I really get the best results that way. And yeah, I'm going to add a dark cast shadow. With sketching, being clean is optional. It all depends on how quickly you need to generate the idea, who the artwork is being seen by. So normally I wouldn't let a painting be that sloppy like that edge is, but for this purposes, it's fine. And then maybe, yeah, I do want to call out the table edge just to have a little bit of object separation. So we'll see how it looks if I put just a little bit of table there, and then I'll use this soft brush to kind of fade that away. Because what I wanted to achieve there is a separation between the background and the edge of the table. So that's this line right here. I wanted to have a little bit of value contrast there. But then as the table surface approaches the paint tube here, I just wanted it to be a white table. So I essentially want the table to have a white color, but then just to separate this edge a little bit. So I put in a little bit of a fade. Now, especially had I not been talking while I did that drawing, that would have been 1 minute probably. And you see here, that is a lot more information than it would be as just a flat line drawing. Flat line drawing is good. I would say this, in most cases, is a little bit better. And I've been using these paint tubes as an example, but clearly that's not normal concept art, where this is a much more realistic example of a workflow. So here I'm using, again, the same 2 markers plus the white of the page. And I have to decide where is it the right moment to use form to describe something versus whether I want to reserve color contrast for material. So here, for instance, I've used the white of the page, which doesn't allow me to make specular highlights very easily. I can add in darker. It's much easier to go darker when you have a white page. So I can describe some of these shadow parts and these recesses between panels, but it's hard for me to go lighter. Now you'll notice that all of these are describing form, but I haven't really talked at all about just graphic separation. For instance, another way I could go with this would be for this arm here, we could say this is a little different than these other two. This is a front view, here's a 3/4. This arm is out of context. If all I wanted to do is describe one part of the design, it might be nice to visually separate that from the rest of the objects. So I could make that just a flat color. See here, I got rid of all the shading. And then maybe on top of that flat color, I'll do a reverse. So here I'm using the white of the page to make this silhouette shape, not doing any form rendering. And then that allows me to have kind of a pop contrast. It looks nice as a page element, but it also gives me the ability to do some diagram information and whatever I might need to include. And that is thinking of this sheet in terms of conveying information. In the case of a 3/4 view, the information I want to convey is the form of the object. I want to explain what sort of a 3-dimensional shape it is. Well, in the case of this breakdown of how the joint works, what I want to convey is technical information. And in that case, it's better to reserve my contrast for just a graphic shape. But none of this took a long time to do. Just like having those physical 10% and 50% markers at your desk, this has a certain immediacy to it. You don't have to think too hard about it. You've made your sketch, and then you just want to add an extra layer of information, extra layer of hierarchy. And having simple, ready-to-go tools to make that happen is extremely powerful. I find myself having trouble summing up why this is so important. Why is toning so essential when what we're talking about is loose sketching, and specifically sketching in Photoshop? But one thing that I keep coming back to in my mind is the idea of an artist's job as someone who doesn't just make pretty pictures, but someone who simplifies information. And I'm going to use information as a really vague term on purpose, because the fact is you don't know what you're going to be drawing. So we've talked about why this is useful for studying and breaking down photos, but it's even more useful when you're doing imaginary objects. Because when you're imagining objects, your brain is sort of doing 2 different jobs. You have to focus on the design, as in what does the object look like? But you also have to focus on, putting marks on the page and light and rendering. So if you can make that mark making and rendering half of the equation simplified to the point where you don't have to think about it very hard, what you're left with is so much more brain power to focus on design. And I can tell you from experience, concept artists are hired to design things. They're hired to come up with clever solutions. Yes, rendering is part of that, but primarily what they're doing is thinking of ideas. So if your job or your hobby involves thinking up cool ideas, the less emphasis you can put on rendering, the better. Sure, you want to make it look nice, but you really want to be thinking about the cool design. The big lesson that I've learned in this over the years has been learning to sort of compartmentalize my approach to rendering. Because sometimes the appropriate response is to use that full value scale, but that's not always the right solution. More often than not, what I need to do as a concept artist is simple communication. So being able to quickly add a little extra information to a line drawing without wasting much time is extremely valuable. So when I say I compartmentalize my approach to rendering, it's to say I have to think about what sort of work I need to be doing right now, and then to pull out the appropriate strategy. And I spent a lot of time on Ctrl Paint teaching the very formalized, very polished rendering. And that's extremely important. You have to know that before you can simplify it in a 3-tone breakdown like this. But what I haven't spent as much time teaching is the importance of knowing when to switch gears and to work in a way that is simple on purpose. Because there's a time and place for each. And so it's important to have both at the ready, to be comfortable working in both ways. So I want to conclude here with a strong encouragement for you to stick with photo reference for now. What that does is it gives you a way to practice with something to look at. Because this whole idea of breaking things down into 3 tones is not easy. It's not obvious, and it's not going to happen quickly for you. Like all the skills I talk about on Ctrl Paint, this one is going to take practice. And in addition, this one also requires you to design a workflow that's more tailored to your personal preferences. Again, I don't think you should copy the exact tools and the exact tones that I'm using here. So with all those complicated variables in mind, at least if you start with photo reference instead of imaginary subject matter, you've got something to start from. And I think that helps build confidence. Once you've been at it a while, then you can start applying the same techniques that you're getting a little better at, but you can apply those to imaginary subject matter. So start with some basic photos, then work your way up to more complicated photos, and then eventually do whatever space marines and dragons you want to do. And if you got this series as part of the larger bundle, you've got the imaginary subject matter series to look forward to, and then after that, a portfolio builder. So there's plenty of opportunities for you to practice these skills in an imaginary context, but I encourage you to start slow and to use photos first. So take some time with this. Think of it like a puzzle and figure out what strategy works best for you. And of course, have fun with this. Thanks again for supporting the site. I really appreciate it. Have fun painting. Hey guys, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com. And first off, thank you for buying this series. Your support really keeps Ctrl Paint alive, and it means a lot. So thank you. Now, this is a very interesting series because I do a lot more freehand, loose gestural drawing than I do technical drawing. But there are times where you need something clean. You need something mechanical. Like for instance, I enjoy designing vehicles in hard surface. If that's what you're designing, being accurate matters. It empowers a drawing. It makes it stronger. So this series is part of sort of 2 different collections I have on Ctrl Paint. On one hand, it's part of linear perspective. A lot of this has to do with drawing in perspective. So that I would say is a prerequisite. Hopefully you have some understanding of drawing in linear perspective before we get started. The other world that it lives in is digital sketching. We just happen to be using different tools. Because in the previous videos, we've talked all about using our shoulder and our body and sort of drawing fluidly and having the ability to draw a straight line without any assistance. This is about as opposite as you can get. Here we're going to be drawing straight lines and curves and ellipses, but Photoshop is going to do the hard work. Instead, we're going to be using essentially really fancy rulers and ellipse templates and compasses. They're just all Photoshop tools. Now, the reason I put this video after the freehand drawing videos is because I think it's very important to be able to draw freehand. This is a different skill. I would say it's harder to do the skills we'll talk about in this video if you've never done freehand drawing. And it actually shares a lot in common with the pencil drawing that we've done. As in, we are going from loose gestural underdrawings, and then we're using the pen tool and using Photoshop techniques to tighten it. Really, said differently, we're tracing. It's very simple. And tracing can be very time consuming. In fact, a lot of people avoid using the pen tool because they feel like it's so different from working with freehand drawing. It's not fun. It's very stiff and formulaic. Well, some of that is true, but a lot of that has to do with how familiar you are with the tools. My hope with this series is to get you really familiar very quickly with some time-saving techniques. Hopefully by the end of it, once you've practiced these basic skills, it won't feel so stiff and slow. You'll maybe even draw faster with the pen tool than you might freehand. So I don't aim to replace your ability to draw freehand. Not at all. This is just a different type of drawing. If we want to call it tracing, fine, we're tracing. But we're going to start with basic shapes and then move our way up to more complex ones. And by the end, I think you'll be much more comfortable approaching a technical drawing like this one, or perhaps using the same skills to make something even more complicated like this one. So let's get to it. So let's talk about tools. Especially if you're coming from the previous videos in this collection, we've done a lot of manual drawing. This is the opposite. So in this video, we're just going to go over the new types of tools we're using, how they work, and what to expect. But this is going to seem a little different than what you're used to. So try and follow along with an open mind, and I really think you'll like this once you get used to it. So when we look at an example like this one, which is what we're headed towards, one of the things you might not have noticed about it is that all the lines are essentially the same line weight. And this gives it a nice look. It looks consistent. And in fact, it looks more like traditional art. Because if you were to use a felt tip pen or a ballpoint pen, you'd have just a line weight. If you want a different line weight, you literally have to switch pens. So a lot of technical drawings have a deadline, they call it, which is it is one single line weight for the entire drawing. Sometimes they'll have two, but it's not like pencil or like charcoal, where you're really modulating with pressure and sort of giving it this light and dark quality. Well, the really nice thing for us is that Photoshop makes that part easy. So I've included a tool preset file, which hopefully you've already installed, but if not, there's a video on how to do so, and you can find it in the resources folder. And this is a very short list of tools. Here you'll see 3 new ones: rectangle, ellipse, and pen. So let me show you what it looks like to work with these. So I can make a rectangle, I can select the ellipse and make an ellipse, or I can select the pen and make lines. Now the nice thing with the pen tool is that it's just as easy to make straight lines like I did there, or to make curved lines. It's also easy to make a combination of the two, where I have curved lines leading into straight lines and corners. And also, since what I'm working with is vector, I have the ability to retroactively go back to these different points and move them around. I can change the way curves flow into each other. This is wildly powerful stuff. Additionally, they are vector shapes with a defined line weight, just like I've already said. So if I make an ellipse and then I want, let's say, another ellipse, but I want it to be really big, well, you'll notice that this smaller one and the bigger one have that same 2.5 pixel stroke. This is amazing. This is something that would be very hard to do with a pen, but it's a snap in Photoshop. In addition to consistency, one thing that this line weight property gives us is the ability to change it whenever we want. And this is really powerful. So here we have a more finished image. And what if I wanted to make, I don't know, all of the lines in this drawing to have a thicker outline? Well, that'd be easy. Right now, once selected, you can see that they have a 2.5 pixel stroke. Well, I can change that. I could make it 5 right now. I didn't have to redraw anything. I didn't have to thicken up my lines with extra paths. I just changed the line weight. But maybe I don't want all of the lines. Maybe more realistically, what I want is to sort of give a little bit more thickness to certain areas, just to give a bit of hierarchy. Well, I'm going to select the outermost contour and then these inner lenses. And then once again, change that to a 5 pixel line weight. Look at that. That's pretty slick. So really quickly, after the fact, I was able to take my existing drawing and then just add a little bit of hierarchy, make it read a little bit better at a distance so you can see the major shapes and then those secondary details, just using a little bit of line weight. So there are certain things that are harder to do with vector, especially if you're not used to it. But the big argument here is that it's so powerful. It is very worth your time to learn how to use these vector tools. If you're using more current versions of Photoshop, they've really beefed up these tools as well. So if I were to make a rectangle here, you'll notice I have the properties panel open. I'll extend this a little bit. These rounded corners are really nice. So what was a normal rectangle, if you hold down the Control or Command key and hover over one of these numbers and sort of drag to the right, you can see in real time I'm changing the radius of these corners. And I can keep going back and forth. Now this is much more limited in Photoshop and much more robust in Illustrator. So if you really like this feature, check out Illustrator. It's got some really neat tricks. But that combined with the ability to make ellipses, which by the way can also be circles, we are quickly into very machined, careful drawing, and it's not hard at all. This is a completely the opposite skill from what I've been teaching in previous videos. This is all about knowing how to use the system, not training your hand to be more hand-eye coordinated. So instead of drawing very careful curves with our arm and wrist and shoulder, here we are learning how all the subtle nuances of these tools work. So I'm going to hide all of this junk for a minute and show you very briefly how the pen tool works. This is not something that I can get into too much here because there's tons of it on the internet. So if you want a refresher on the pen tool, just Google it. But the important things to know are that with my pen tool here, I'm going to be using a lot of keyboard shortcuts. So I'm laying down a point, and then I might click and drag. So I'm holding, I didn't let go. And then when it looks good, I will let go. And then I'll click and drag again. And now, right away, before I even complete my shape, I've noticed something's wrong. I've gotten a little too wide here, you can see. Well, what I do to switch to that white arrow tool is actually just hold down Control or Command if you're on a Mac. Now you'll see the cursor changes, and I can just manipulate these handles. If I let go of the keyboard shortcut, now I'm back to the pen tool. And so I can just continue along my way here. So what I found to be most useful about the pen tool is not worrying about getting it perfect the first time. Some people are just sort of magic when it comes to using the pen tool. I'm not really. But I am much better once I've learned how to use these kind of course correction tools to fix what I'm doing while I'm doing it. Now that's just been moving these tangent handles. You can also move the points themselves. That's handy. And as soon as you let go, you're back to adding points. You can also remove points. Sometimes you'll, I don't know, decide you don't need this one here, so you can just hover over it, click it, and it will remove that point. And then on the same token, you can add points here between line segments if you need to do so. Maybe you want to add a point and then shift it, for instance. Very easy. And since what I'm making is outlines, they don't necessarily even need to be complete shapes. So I can make a new layer now. You see that it's deselected that path. I can select the pen 2.5 once again, and I can make a line. It can be as simple as that. Now I can make a new layer, and I could drag a curve like that. And then maybe if it doesn't do exactly what I want, then I'll kind of nudge this end here. Maybe nudge that just a little bit. So it doesn't even need to be super clean. A lot of these lines are going to get converted back to raster at the end anyway, so they don't need to be an immaculate vector file. They're really just vector as long as it's convenient. They don't need to be taken to a printer or turned into a billboard. So a lot of the strategies you'll build up will be sort of faster, not cleaner. If you're using my tool presets, or if you've made your own, it's good to just kind of know the behavior of making new layers. And this is simple, but very important. So for instance, if I make a rectangle, it creates its own layer. If I were to add an ellipse, it automatically generates another layer. I didn't have to hit a keyboard shortcut, it just happens. Okay, so now let's try the pen tool. I've made a curved line. Once again, it makes another layer. Now, sometimes if you're using the pen tool to draw contours, what you'll want is a couple disconnected lines. That might be a case of you want to connect this right here to get a little thickness, and then I want to do the same on the other side. If I want disconnected line segments, I have to manually make a new layer. So I'll hit the new layer keyboard shortcut, and then I'll make my second line segment. If you don't do that, what'll happen is it'll automatically connect it as in a continued line. So we'll show you what that looks like. So I've made my one line segment, and then I go to make another one over here, and it connects the two. So a good thing to get used to is make your segment, new layer keyboard shortcut, make the next segment, new layer keyboard shortcut, and on and on. Now, if you do want them to be connected, well, then you don't need to make a new layer. Of course, you just keep dropping points. But then as soon as I switch to either the ellipse or the rectangle, that automatically happens on its own layer. Another big one to get familiar with are ellipses. We're going to be doing tons of these. Mechanical objects have lots of cylinders. So the basics go as follows. You can just drag an ellipse, although that's rarely the easiest way to do it. Oftentimes what you want to do is make a circle, or you want to scale it from its central point. Well, the way you do that is you hold down Alt and Shift. And then when you drag, it scales it from the center. The same is true with free transform. So say I like the position it's in, but I actually want to shrink it a little bit. Well, no problem. So I'll do free transform. Then I'll hold down Alt and Shift. And here I can scale it relative to its center. So let's say I wanted a smaller circle inset inside of this one. So I could drag this down to a new layer. I can duplicate that layer. Now I'll free transform it and scale it with Alt and Shift held down, and then I'll confirm. That's great. So now I have two circles. Maybe I want to do it again, but a little off center. So I'll use the Move tool and hold down Alt to make a duplicate layer. Now I'll scale it with Alt and Shift held down, so I'm moving it relative to its central point. And there I have sort of like a speaker cone. Knowing how to manipulate ellipses is very important. So just as a test, let's say I want to make a new one that's the same width as this circle, but very small degree, very short. I could just drag from one side to the other side. So there I've gotten the width correct. But now if I decide actually what I want it to be is taller, very easy. So here I go to free transform, and I could just drag on the top and then I could drag on the bottom. That's not what I want. I want to do them simultaneously. So I hold down Alt, and you can see it moves symmetrically. And that works on either axis. So I can make it sort of squished symmetrically, or I can make it wider or narrower relative to its center point. So Alt means relative to the central axis. Alt and Shift together means relative to the central axis, but also all the axes at the same time. So the combination of knowing when to use Alt and Shift for a uniform scale and Alt to just work on one axis will save you tons of time. This is how you start to feel really confident with ellipses. But just being able to make the ellipse is not the entire story. Once we start making more and more complex documents, the trick actually becomes picking the right layer. And if you don't have a strategy, this can really get the best of you. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. One of the central challenges of doing technical line drawings like these, you'll find, is layer organization. By necessity, we're going to have a lot of layers. There's really no way around it. Now, we might not have them for the entirety of the painting, but at times, we're going to have a lot. This is still a relatively simple drawing here, and look at all these different ellipses that I have. So let's talk about a few different ways to stay organized. The first I like to do is there's a setting here called Panel Options. And in here, you can change the thumbnail contents to be either the layer bounds or the entire document. When you're working with very, very small shapes like this in a large document, layer bounds is actually really nice. So what that does is it just means that in this little thumbnail image here, it's only the contents of that layer. So if you have a very small shape, it just essentially magnifies it. So that helps a little bit. But if I have like 100 circles in my image, it's still going to be hard to tell which circle is which. Well, if you've been following Control Paint for a while, you know that to select this brush stroke, for instance, I would go to the Move tool, I would hold down Control, and then just click on it. And it automatically finds the right layer and it immediately makes that the active layer. Awesome. The reason that works is because I've selected Auto Select to be layer and not group. That's just the way I prefer it. Both will work, but layer means it just immediately goes down to that individual layer. Well, I can do the same here with any of these vector shapes, but I have a few extra options. So the first one is I just select the layer so I can move it. This is the entire path. Sometimes that's all you need. But almost more often than not, what I'm doing is I'm not changing the whole path. I'm just changing one element of it. Because remember, this is vector, so I can change things after the fact and tweak, and it's not destructive. So if I want to go in here and just like change the curvature of this one oval, I don't have to know which oval it is. This is the really cool thing. So on the direct selection tool, the little white arrow, I have the select all layers, not the default of active layers. So make sure you change this to all layers, and then you just drag a box. And it immediately selects not only the right layer, but it also selects this point. So I can move it. It's telling me this was a live shape, which is a special sort of vector. And once you move this point, it's not going to be a live shape anymore. So I say, that's fine. But now I can move this point and change the handle however I want, and then decide, oh, actually, I want to change this one too. So I'll drag a box, and it switched the layer and highlighted just that one point. This is very powerful. This means I can be totally sloppy with the names of my layers or have no names at all, like here, and I can just jump right to the part of the artwork that I want. It allows me to work at a higher zoom level, which can be nice sometimes. And mainly, it just lets the structure get out of the way. It allows me to think about art and design. Another really neat thing to know about this is you can select multiple layers simultaneously. So let's say I like these two weird ovals, but what I want is this central little tangent where they're touching to shift to the left. Well, that's no problem. So I'll select the direct selection tool, drag a box, and that encompasses these 2 points. Well, I'll just click on one of them. Oops. So what I actually selected there was the segment itself. So it's a little tough to see here, but I want to click on the point and drag. And when I let go, you can see it changes. So here I can drag it to the right. These are 2 different layers, and yet I'm controlling them both simultaneously because what I've selected are these individual control points. This is very cool. So once you are set to the all layers selection option, it just sort of fades away. You get in here real close, you start moving stuff around, shifting it around, and you just don't care what layer it's on. This is very handy. Now let's say for some reason I don't want these to be vector anymore. They've outlived their usefulness, and what I want is just something simple. Well, I can select all of the ones in this area with the same trick. So I'm just going to drag a box around all those points, and you can see it selects all of the corresponding layers. And to actually make that even more clear, I will do a square right up there. So now what I'm going to do is just select all of these points, holding down Shift to add to the selection. So I've gotten all of these layers except for this unnamed rectangle because it was outside of my selection square. So I can take all these layers, I can rasterize them, and then I can merge together. So now what I have is a single raster layer. This can be handy if you don't need to modify it anymore and you just want to kind of simplify things. Now this creates its own weird problem, which is that it's easy to select this stroke because it's very wide. It's a sort of a big target to control click on. Well, it's actually not so easy to select one of these thin lines. Like you're more likely to actually click the background or a layer you don't want to just because it's such a narrow target. So what I've taken to doing is I'll actually make a separate mark. So I'll just make like a big color circle. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that layer is merged with whatever layer it is I want to be able to grab. So right now I have all of this and the pink dot on a single layer. Okay. What this means is I'm out here working, I'm shifting stuff around, doing whatever, and then I want to select these lines. Well, I've got a big target now. I can grab it by this essentially handle, for lack of a better term, that just makes the selection easier. And then at some point, obviously you don't want it anymore, so you erase it. But for a temporary thing, these big colored dots are actually quite easy to grab. So clearly this pink dot is no officially sanctioned concept art technique. That's just something I dreamt up to make my life easier. And you're not necessarily going to work in the exact same way that I am. But if you're working with this many path layers, be on the lookout for strategies. Think of ways that'll work for you personally to tame this madness so you don't have to spend time juggling layers and can just focus on the art instead. The more of the stuff you do, the better you're going to get. But in this video, we're going to look at a few strategies for just being efficient, and they're not entirely obvious. Essentially, if you want to create a technical line, sometimes the easiest way to do it is actually to make multiple intersecting lines and then erase away the extra that you don't need. Because yes, the pen tool is good, and we could have made this line with one path, but it's almost always easier to look for basic primitives or general shapes and to use a couple of those and then erase away the extra. An extension of this idea is going to be talking about overlapping shapes. There's lots of this in technical drawing, and sometimes it can be hard to get it to match up just right. But first, let's talk about simplifying complex curves into a collection of more simple curves. For instance, when we do the draw through technique, we sort of pretend that we can see like X-ray vision through this screw head. So I might line this up along the major axis here, and then I would get the degree correct. And then this would give me, the nice bottom curve here, where I'd confirm that. So let's make a new layer and go ahead and put in the top. So I might just draw this one manually with the pen tool. Okay, it's looking pretty good. But we have a problem. With these two layers, it doesn't give me quite the look I want because obviously I don't need this section here. Well, this is where I think Photoshop becomes very handy in a way that Illustrator doesn't capture as elegantly. So I'll select the ellipse and I will make a blank mask. So the way I do that is just click the mask button. So now there's this white thumbnail. Now what I do is hide some of that away. So using the brush tool, and really any brush you want, you're just gonna be painting with black. So let's continue this in the same way. I'm going to make one more ellipse down here for the bottom of the circle. And then using the pen tool on a new layer, I'm going to make these sides of this vertical section here. And clearly, I don't need this part. So this is where I use a keyboard shortcut to give it a blank mask, because this is something I do so much. So blank mask, switch to the brush tool, and then I just hide away that bit that I don't need. Likewise, I'll do the same thing with this ellipse here, give it a blank mask with a keyboard shortcut, and then hide away what I don't need. The really nice thing about this stuff being vector is that I didn't quite get it there, but it doesn't matter. So I can go to the direct selection tool, and now I can pick this end point and just shift it into position. Look at that. Total cheating, doesn't matter. Works just fine. So let's see what we've got here. Hide away my sketch. Looking very clean, very nice. So now that I'm happy with this outer shape, I'm going to go ahead and add in this final detail here. So I could do this in a couple different ways, but maybe what I want is the precision of using an ellipse to get started. So a lot of what you're doing here is just kind of problem solving, trying to use the most precision you can, and a lot of that's just going to come from practice. So I'm seeing this as sort of this quarter ellipse here, where I'll anchor the top as it wraps around the form, comes down to about like that. And also when you're inking like this, it doesn't need to match your underdrawing perfectly. Sometimes you actually correct the line and make it better. So the ellipse is just going to be in a different spot. Okay, I'm actually going to say don't show this again because this is technically a live shape, but now that I've transformed it, it becomes just a normal shape. So I'm going to get rid of that for the future. Now this is a situation you'll see a lot of. I have two similar curves. This curve is going to match this one right next to it. So you can do one of two ways. The first way would be to just duplicate it before you hide away anything. So here I might stretch it out a tiny bit. But you can see it's already starting to get a little visually confusing. Remember, I only want this, like 1/4 of this whole shape. So then I could go ahead, now that I've got both lines in place, and then I could apply a mask and hide away what I don't want. That would be one approach. Let's delete that. The other approach would be to say, I'm just going to mask away everything I don't need first. So blank mask, hide that away. And now that I have just what I want, now I'll do the duplicating. So I'll switch to the move tool, hold down Alt, drag, and now I'm going to sort of skew it into position. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, make sure it's connecting just where I want it to. Now here you can see I've got a little more than I need. So I'll click on the mask thumbnail and then erase that away. And there's actually one more. This has a little bit of an inset. So what I'm going to do is go to the move tool, duplicate the path. So what I'm concerned with here is the shape of it, not necessarily where it ends. I'm going to fix that in a second. So I'm happy with the shape, and now I'll just modify the mask. Then I'll make a new layer, and now I'll just do these last remaining little pen bits here for straight line segments. There we are. Looks good to me. So as you can see, this gets complicated quickly. Having a mask is very, very powerful, but also adds in extra keyboard shortcuts and extra clutter over here. So it's possible you would have a workflow that didn't involve masks at all. You could, for instance, you could rasterize all these layers. You could merge them together, and now you can just erase them because they're pixels. But I think keeping them as vectors is important, at least for a while. It gives you some flexibility. And a vector with a mask becomes very, very powerful. So before we go any further with this, I really want you to try just making very basic shapes, either just making them up or using a tracing from an earlier drawing you've made. and then try doing overlaps. So if maybe you had these two shapes and you wanted the circle to be in front of the blob, then you'd need to have a strategy for getting to the blob layer, giving it a blank layer mask, painting with black in the layer mask, and there you go. So now you have the two overlapping. This is something I'm going to do over and over and over throughout this series, and I'm probably not going to mention what keys I'm pressing. So having keyboard shortcuts assigned to whatever feels comfortable for new layer, add a blank layer mask, and then being able to switch back and forth between the foreground and background color that defaults to X is going to be really handy, because if you have black and white selected, you can just reveal with white, then hit X, and then you're painting with black. So you can switch back and forth to hiding and revealing by switching the foreground and background color. Again, keyboard shortcuts, once you memorize these, you don't have to think about it. But a drawing like this one has lots and lots of overlaps. In fact, I'd say overlaps are uniquely challenging. This is the skill that we are going to be practicing to really get good at technical drawing. So practice it now while the subject matter is easy, and you'll be happy later. Sometimes what we need to do is to thicken parts. This is something that happens all the time with mechanical objects. So let's take a look at this example here. So we have a circular opening, which we made with an ellipse, and then there is a matching ellipse that's just a little bit lower. So we can see inside this recessed space, and we know that it's recessed because of the overlapping. This is actually quite easy to do with Photoshop. So here's how we do it. One way would be to get the path we want. Here it's called inner circle. Alt drag to make a copy. And then just like I've shown before, we would make an empty path, paint with black, and just get rid of everywhere we don't need. You've seen that before. It's something I do a lot. Well, in this case, we can actually do something different. Let me show you. So we will start once again by duplicating it, but we know exactly where we need it to be shown through. We only need it inside of this other existing shape. So there's got to be a shortcut, right? Well, what I like to do is to select that layer's thumbnail while holding down Control. And what that does is it gives me a selection based off of that layer's shape. Now, once I've got that selection made, I'll go back to the one that I want to hide part of and apply that as a mask. It achieves the exact same result. It's just like manually hiding it away, but I didn't need to do that because I already had a shape that would help me define it. Now, the really neat thing is you can disconnect the mask from the layer contents. And the way I do that is by clicking on this little chain link here. And now we have two thumbnails that are separate. So if I click on the shape, not the mask, but the shape, I can move that inside of this window very easily, which in this case gives me the effect of a shallower or a deeper recess. Isn't that pretty cool? Now, another way to do it would be to say, well, I know that there's going to be stuff inside of this hole, but it's going to be more than one layer, and I don't want to have to make mask after mask after mask. Not a problem. The way I do that would be to make a new layer group. Once again, hold down Control-click to bring up the selection of the place that we want to hide everything inside of. And then I'll apply that as a mask, but to the entire new group. And I'm going to make this orange just to make it visible. And now, anytime I make shapes, they're all going to be inside of this window. So I can transform them however I want. Maybe what I want to do is do something like that, and then you have these smaller, things like that. So here you can see I don't have to worry about figuring out that overlap. In fact, I could take all of these new layers that I've just made, and I could shift them around, and they're just going to live inside of that mask. And I can free transform them as a group, and they're being hidden automatically. So you don't always have the option to quickly make a mask like this, but the times that it works is when you already have a shape that's defining what you want to block. Then it just becomes a question of finding the correct layer. In this case, I've called it inner circle, but usually it doesn't have a name. Holding Control-click, and then you can make your mask. Now, another very common scenario we have with thickening parts is when a part has a height like this. So maybe you start with the top shape, and then you need to just almost mirror that shape on the bottom. You need to make another copy. Well, you can drag a copy, of course. The problem is, depending on perspective, it's probably not going to be exactly the same shape. So what you might need to do is to get out your direct selection tool and to move these a little bit. So in this case, the starting point is duplicating it, but that's not the end of the story. This also doesn't solve this vertical height right here. So generally what I'll do for that, I'll just make a new layer, I'll select the pen tool, and I'll essentially draw it. Then I'll make another new layer and draw over here. And I'll clean it up as necessary. So in this case, the cleanup is finding this layer, making an empty mask, and then kind of painting out those overlaps. Now, depending on how perfect you need to be, once you've erased this away, now you can kind of shift things around. So here's where I can zoom in really close, and with the direct selection tool, I can shift and nudge, and it doesn't matter which layer I have selected. It's looking pretty good. And this edge got a little off, so I can, there we go. You would never know those were made on separate paths, but there you are. So I'd recommend doing exercises like these. Just take any shape and then give it a little thickness and space. If you want bonus points, then maybe make a vertical extrusion, which you shrink down a bit. Ooh, now we've got a nice little bevel. Okay, what if we wanted to take that bevel and give it another little bit of thickness? Now I can make this, I'll put some stuff inside of this. So now I want to have a recessed part to go down. And just like I showed you before, we'd use that opening with Control-click to make a mask, and then use that mask to hide the content. So pretty quickly here, you can get used to doing these various ways to add thickness. Sometimes you'll be able to use a mask to help you. That's in the case of recesses. Sometimes you have to mask it away by hand. But these are things that you're going to be doing over and over when you do technical drawing. So just getting used to them in these out-of-context examples makes the whole job easier. It's just an easy way to practice. Now, another common scenario that's going to happen when you're thickening parts is that you're going to have one sort of containing shape that mirrors the smaller shapes that are inside of it, sort of a thick element that surrounds as a frame might. So if we were to make that, we might start by duplicating both of these layers and then scaling them up, I guess, but clearly this has a problem. So maybe I'd have to shift one over and then kind of shift this other one over, but then we have this overlapping problem. This is a problem that's actually very easily solved by later versions of Photoshop. Has something they call live shapes. In fact, you've seen the warning dialog already referring to live shapes, so let's talk about them. How it works is you take two or more paths and then you combine them into a single path layer. A compound shape is what they call these in Illustrator. I'm going to hit Ctrl-E to merge these two together. And then here in the Properties palette, there are path operations. Here I can change these two shapes that have now been combined. I can change the rules by which they are combined. And as you experiment with different ones, you can see there are different types of intersections. For the tech savvy, these are called Booleans if you've ever done 3D. So anyway, what we want is combined shapes. So what we get is perfect. It's the framing element we were hoping for, and that overlap automatically works itself out. That alone is very cool. Where it gets even cooler is the fact that I can then change the size and position of these shapes and it still retains this relationship. So what I'm going to use is the path selection tool, the black arrow, and I'm going to select the smaller one. So select the smaller one first. I can shift it around, and when I let go, you'll see what happens. Automatically updates. That overlap is still welded together. Now I'm going to free transform, because let's say I want a thicker border on this one. Okay, get it kind of centered up. Nice. And now I'm going to shift the other one. How cool is that? Live shapes are extremely neat. They are represented by a single path layer. So here, ellipse 2 copy, if I hide that, it contains both of these paths and their resulting intersection. So let's say you've made two paths. They're each on their own layer, and you don't want them overlapping. You want to use one to cut a hole out of the other. That's very easy too. So what you do, just like joining the two in a union, is to do Control-E to merge them together. And then in your properties bar, you're just going to change the path operation. So it defaults to welding the two together, but you can use subtract front shape. And then just like before, we can modify each of these individually. So here I'll select the ellipse, and I can change it and move it. They have this really nice live relationship. It gets even more interesting when you start duplicating these paths. So for instance, when I have just this ellipse selected, I can hold down Alt and drag, and now I have two holes. This is still one live shape. It is represented by one layer on the layer stack, and yet I have all of these fine-tuning controls on the inside. All this is to say that live shapes allow you to think of both the cutting potential of a shape as well as the welding potential of a shape. It can either be additive or subtractive. You just have to know which of these unions to use. Now this can get a little bit confusing, and it certainly doesn't work as elegantly as Illustrator. So if you come from an Illustrator background, don't expect Photoshop to behave quite as nicely as Illustrator. But what I like to do to keep these things straight is I'll just flag these. So I will make this red maybe, just because it's a compound shape. Because in my experience working with these, they sort of behave a little bit different than other shapes. So if you just have some sort of visual indication that'll remind you, oh yeah, that's actually a compound path, it just makes things easier. Okay, so knowing what we know now, let's try and make a shape that looks something like this one. And we're going to do it using a combination of duplicating paths, but also using live shapes. So I'm going to start with something simple. I'll start with kind of the big lens. And then to make these insets, I'm just going to Alt-drag copies. Alt-drag, free transform. You'll find that these just become second nature, these keyboard shortcuts. This is why we memorize them. Okay, so that looks pretty good. You know, I might even select all those 3 paths and drag a duplicate of all of them. And then I'll sort of put that in position. This is where that set line weight is so nice. I don't have to worry about resizing these elements and making one thick and one thin. Okay, now I'm going to make this little piece right here, which is a little extrusion, so it's got its little cone sticking out the top there. It's looking pretty good. Now we've done the easy part. In fact, I'm going to kind of put these in their own little subfolder. We'll call that lenses. And I'm going to work below that, although it really doesn't matter what order you do these in. Now it's time to make this combined shape here. And this is really going to show off how cool these live shapes can be. So I'll start by making sort of a bounding box around this circle, but obviously it's going to overlap stuff. So I'm going to make a second one around this circle. And then I'm going to make a third one around this circle. But you'll notice on my example, I also have these straight line segments. Okay, so I'm going to make those with the pen tool. Now you'll notice that all I really want is this part here, but I kind of just did random shapes inside just to get over here to where I needed them. Really, I'm only thinking about this bit, and this bit. I just wanted it all to be a single shape for ease's sake. Because the next step is to take all those new shapes and to merge them together. I can then take this shape and transform it as a group. That's sort of the default. Or if I want to modify individual components of it, I go to the path selection tool, the black arrow, and then I'll just select part of it. So like this is just the angular one I drew with the pen tool. If I want to shift that around, you can see what effect that has. I can shift individual points. So say I just want this point right here. Just want to modify that. Cool. So hopefully you can see exactly how powerful this is. Okay, so I'm happy with that shape. I just want to shift it a little bit. Now you'll see in my example, I have a similar, but not exactly the same second bevel. Like it's got sort of layered plates happening here. Now that is no problem either. So what I'll do for that is I'll remind myself by making this one yellow. I'll then duplicate it and make it green. Okay. So if I were to just expand it uniformly, it might work for a short distance, but if I were to make it much bigger, it just wouldn't be quite right. I'm going to need to shift around those individual paths on their own. So maybe, like the example, I want to make this circle here much more pronounced. Well, that's very easy. I just go to the path selection tool, the black arrow, and then I can enlarge just that one circle. I'm trying to keep it centered around this little element right here. Maybe it's a wheel that's sort of inside of a housing. And then maybe I want to, I'm going to shift this point around just to kind of change the way this intersection is happening. And then I think I noticed this circle's getting a little off center, so I'm going to shift that as well. And maybe I could even shrink that down a little bit. And there you have it. So let's put all of these different things together into a single demonstration. Now, this is not as elaborate as the box cover, but it shows all of the exact skills. There's really nothing different between this box and a tank like this one. It's just a little easier to show this from start to finish. Now, the major skill you'll see me doing here is a little bit of strategy. I'm thinking in terms of all these details that are in perspective and still making them accurate. So the way I actually approach that is by making flat shapes like this one, as if you saw these details from straight above, make them this way, and then go ahead and free transform them into position. And I'll use that as sort of a starting point. So for instance, I would take this whole top and then I would kind of get it into position. And because these are vector, it doesn't matter and it's not going to affect my line weight. It's not going to get messy. It's not going to get blurry. It just gives me that nice accuracy. All right, so now that you know the final approach, let's actually make this. What I like to do when I'm going to work with multi-part objects is to just start by making a new layer group. I'm going to call this one Top Shape Master. All this does is helps keep me organized. I might not necessarily keep it in here for the whole time, but it's a good start. So I'm just going to build this with basic shapes. So it's pretty much a square that has these kind of Mickey Mouse ears on the corners. And I can take both those and duplicate them. It additionally has smaller insets where there's cutouts. Okay, so I'm going to leave that one there for a second. Now the previous four, the four that match, I'm going to weld them all together. So you can see here, those are all now one path. And then I will take these new ones, make copies with that. Okay, so then I'm going to weld them all to be another path as well. This one is special though, because if you refer back to my drawing here, this is the circle that's going to serve as a little cutout for these insets. So as you remember from previous lessons, it's going to help me to keep this labeled. So I'm going to make it red, call it hole cut. Okay. Now these Mickey Mouse ears, the larger ones and the square, those are actually going to be a compound shape. So I'll merge them together. Cool. And now we can start to work on the inside part. So you can see these keyboard shortcuts become very important to be able to start from the center and to drag outwards. Now this one has to be rounded. The next piece I need is an X that also has a rounded component to it. So I'm going to make this automatically on its own layer. Click and drag to round out those radiuses. Now I will Alt drag a copy, weld those two together. And then I wanted it to be an X, not a plus. So now I'm going to rotate with Shift held down to snap it to 45 degrees. Now we're starting to get there. At this point, I think that's probably enough information. So I'm going to call this one green and make a new layer group. And this is going to be my bolt. So we'll call this Bolt Master. So this one's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to start with an ellipse, just about that size, which is going to have a slightly smaller, lighter inset. And for this, I think I'm actually going to change the line weight. So here it's 2.5 by default. I'm just going to make it 1 pixel. And then inside of that, I want to have a rectangle that I'm going to make a pill shape by rounding it. There we go. Okay. So I'll move that to the side for now. This group called Bolt Master has a few different shapes in it, and I know I'm going to repeat it, so I'll make that one green as well. And then the final element here are just these very simple side cuts. So I'll make a group called side. And then this is just a very basic rounded rectangle. Okay, so I have my elements. I've made them all green here, just for the consistency's sake. The color doesn't really matter. That's just to help me remember what I'm doing. Now I'm going to make copies. The reason I do this is because you never know when something's going to go wrong, so it's just easier to have these orthographic drawings to begin with. So I'll start with the top shape master, click and drag with Alt held down, and it makes a copy of the entire group. So just for clarity's sake, I'm going to make this one violet. And now I can free transform with Ctrl held down. I can move these corner pins and skew it right into correct perspective. And this is incredibly powerful, especially when you're using vector. So now what I have, when you expand this, is I still have all these individual shapes. You know, they are still vector shapes. They still have the right line weight, and I can move them independently. And I'll need to do that. For instance, I want to make this like a flattened off pyramid that kind of extrudes a little bit. So select the correct path, duplicate it, free transform it, and now my X is not in the right position. So I'll need to be able to move that on its own to make sure that stays in perspective. So it's not to say that skewing it into perspective once is the end of the story. It's just a great starting point. So now we need those bolts. So I'm going to go collapse all this and go back to my Bolt Master. I'm going to make a copy. Just for clarity's sake, make this one violet again. And I need to put it right here in this hole. So I will use my free transform handles to kind of get the perspective in there. If you wanted to be real careful about this, you'd be using a grid, and perspective's out of the scope of this course, but I definitely encourage you to check out the perspective series in the store. Okay, that looks about right. Now I'm not worrying about the overlap at this point. As you can probably guess, we're going to do that in just a minute. So I'll then just duplicate this whole group. So I have sort of a little tweaking to do just to get that perspective correct. And I can enlarge. It doesn't matter because it's vector. Those line weights are retained. I really can't get over how powerful this is. Okay. Now, what we need to do is worry about these overlaps. Well, I've planned ahead. So what I'm going to do is say all of these bolts are going to be masked by one mask. And an easy way to do that is just to select those 4 groups and to put those in a larger group. So we'll call this 4 bolts. Now I need to find my cut hole, and that's why we labeled it red earlier. So I'll go to the top shape. So here when I called it purple, it actually overwrote the red, but I named it hole cut, so we're good. The one called hole cut, if I control click on it, will give me a selection of these 4 holes. Perfect. So I don't need that anymore. Now I will go to the 4 bolts group and apply this selection as a mask. And there we go. Now I can move around any of these individual bolts and they stay inside of that inset. So I can do further tweaking if need be. But the overlapping is already accounted for by that mask. So a little bit of planning ahead made cutting that mask so much easier. So let's follow those same steps just to quickly make these side cuts here. Free transform becomes very important for this process. So you can understand why memorizing these keyboard shortcuts is really important. And this is not a challenging process. It's really just one of strategy. Thinking about what can you combine into a single layer, what makes sense to keep on its own layer. Okay, so these two are essentially the whole. So I'm going to merge them together, call it whole cut again, and I'll make it red. Now I'm going to make a new group, and this is going to be the inset here. We can see these are sort of set back into the sides. But I'm going to start with this same radius, get it here, not worrying about the overlaps. Okay, that looks about right. Get one more copy. Again, not worrying about the overlaps for this phase. Okay, those both look about right. So now I'm going to put those into that group that I just made. I'm going to control click on the whole cut layer to get the correct selection, and then I'll set that as mask. There we are. Once again, we can shift these after the fact and they live nicely inside of these windows. So at this point you could call it done, or you could go ahead and add some line weight thickness. Like for instance, maybe what I want is these four holes to read a little bit thicker. So that is very easy to do. I will set that to be, we could even really make it pronounced. We could say 5 pixels. So then when we zoom out, you can see it has that nice hierarchy. It has very thick, visible edges there. I could even add it to this one. So I select the correct path by control clicking with the path selection tool, and I'll just change that line weight. And you could do this as much or as little as you like. But you can see this was not really a challenging process. You might look at a drawing like this and think that there's so much precision necessary, but really just came down to a little planning. Make these two-dimensional designs first and keep it 2D as long as you can, and then to just use groups to your advantage, skew them into position, and then make any final tweaks. So hopefully making a drawing like this tank now seems a little bit more approachable. Again, it is no different than the things I did for this box. It's just bigger. There's just more bolts and more cylinders and more squares, but all the techniques are exactly the same. So when you go to learn this stuff, I really recommend picking very simple shapes and then studying those. You can either work from your own sketches, starting with a gesture and then tightening as you go, or what I like to do, honestly, is just go to Google image search and I'll type in like hinge or mounting bracket. These are very simple mechanical elements, but they're really good practice. They're not all that interesting and you wouldn't put them in your portfolio, but they're a really great way to work on your precision, to just figure out the bread and butter of these tools. So then when you go to make your own sci-fi designs, you already know the tricks. It's just thinking about art at that point, not thinking about layer masking and all the technical stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Drawing in a technical way is really, really powerful, and a lot of artists don't necessarily know how to do it in Photoshop. Besides, once you start using the pen tool and really getting used to vectors, you might be surprised how much you like it. So thanks again for supporting the site. I really appreciate your help, and I hope you learned something. Have fun drawing. Hey guys, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com, and today we're finally getting to the subject that I'm sure you've been waiting for, imaginary objects. So in this series, I'm going to show you that a lot stays the same. We're still using pencils and charcoal and the pen tool, but what's different obviously is that we don't have photos to look at. We're not using sketching as a recording tool. Instead, we're using sketching as a design tool. We are inventing things no one's ever seen before. Now, in the previous videos, I've talked about this relationship between the tool that we choose and the way it affects our thinking. So charcoal may make a big wide mark, which is nice for getting ideas down quickly. And then if I want to dive into details, that's maybe more of a pencil thing. All the same is true when you're inventing subject matter. But it becomes even more important to be as loose and calm and fluid as you can, because what you need to be focusing on is the art. So in this series, I'm going to focus the most on how we can use tools to get Photoshop out of the way. We'll look at a few different approaches, all of which talk about the drawing tool as a thinking tool, where the tool literally helps us think of ideas and doesn't slow us down. Now, the truth of the matter is that the second phase of the drawing, when you have a sketch already and then you're just polishing it with lines, well, that's pretty much the same. So hopefully you've already watched the earlier videos in this collection, because I'm not going to dwell on that part. The important difference is when you're dreaming up the idea, because we don't have photos to directly copy from, so it's coming from our imagination. So with that in mind, we are going to focus on tools that facilitate thumbnail sketching, tools that get out of the way and allow us to be loose and inventive. So let's get drawing. When it comes to dreaming up ideas while using Photoshop or pencil and paper, whatever it might be, the tool is inescapable. It has an impact. Yes, I'm thinking about what these rocks are going to look like, and I'm choosing shapes and making marks, but the tool still has an effect. It's like a fingerprint. Now, Mike Yamada is an artist that I really admire, and recently on Twitter, he had a great quote. He said, "Don't sacrifice design and art for a bossy Photoshop brush. They're just a tool in your hand. Good design is too important to leave up to chance." And I gotta say, I really agree with him on this one. For instance, if I were to use a brush that looked like this, I'm very limited. The fingerprint of the brush is unmistakable, and I'm always gonna have a very specific look. So we could call this not very versatile, or in Mike's terms, we could call this a very bossy Photoshop brush. On the other end of the spectrum, I could use a brush like this one, which has essentially no visible brush marks, is far from bossy, and could be used for any number of subject matters. But I'd say somewhere in the middle, somewhere between total lack of control and complete tight precision, is a happy middle ground. So here we are tasked with making real-world rocks more interesting. Maybe they're designed for a cartoon background or something that has a little more style. So it still has to reference real-world materials, but I'm just making interesting shapes. With those guidelines, having a tool that's a little bossy is actually going to be useful for me. So the way I do this, there's really no rhyme or reason to. I am making large marks and then using the eraser tool to tame it. So here with temp layers, I can kind of get the best of both worlds. A bossy brush that then I'm able to kind of wrestle into submission. And then as I work, I'll keep making new layers, making new marks. Now, when I get these sorts of overlaps, this is what we could call a happy accident. Or maybe it's a mistake and I don't like it. But let's say I like the way this is going. My next move might be to kind of riff on that, to take that shape and run with it. So on one hand, I'm letting the brush be a brush in that it has its own unique fingerprint, and that's, part of the charm of using it. I've lost some control instead of using a very tight, flat brush. But what I think I've gained here is a little bit of brainstorming power. Here I am letting these interesting overlaps sort of lead me towards an interesting shape. Now, I still am the artist and I'm in control, which means, I'm still deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. This is not a Rorschach test where we just throw a bunch of ink at the wall and see what happens. No, I'm still designing. This is important. What I think Mike is afraid of is when people let the brush do all the work and just sort of accept whatever happens. Well, that's not really design. So what I'm doing here is that happy middle place. I'm going to use tools that I'm very familiar with. Like here, I'll use the mixing cloth to kind of knock some of these details together. And because I'm familiar with these tools, I don't need to do a lot of thinking. It's more of a stream of consciousness that allows me to direct the ship, but not be in complete control. More like riding a horse than driving a car. The horse still has some input in the matter. And I hope it's becoming clear how important these keyboard shortcuts are. You probably can't even follow whether I'm using the brush or the eraser at any given moment because I'm just switching back and forth in rapid succession. For me, this is crucial to the way this process works. It allows me to really take advantage of sort of a uniquely digital workflow, but to do it fluidly. I'm not opening menus, I'm not doing any of those things that would slow me down and pull me out of this design mindset. Because what I'm thinking about is not Photoshop. What I'm thinking about is shape. I'm thinking about the sort of interesting proportional relationships, the weight, the balance, all the stuff that you talk about when you're doing observational drawing with traditional tools still apply. I am still an artist designing shapes. I'm just letting the brush kind of help me find interesting mistakes, happy accidents, if you will. And then that in turn allows me to do a positive feedback loop. I sort of riff off of what I'm seeing and then kind of move in that direction. And clearly as I work on this, I'm not getting too precious with any of these individual drawings. The idea with thumbnailing is just to get ideas out there. Some are going to work, some aren't going to work, and ultimately I'm only going to choose one. But that's the reason why I do so many. It's the way you get all those bad ideas out of the way. Because eventually something interesting is going to happen. And it might only take 20 minutes or an hour. So if I work for an hour and eventually 50 minutes in find the right drawing, it was totally worthwhile. So another skill that you're practicing here is your judgment and your patience. Because I think there's this myth that when you start drawing, you get better and better, and part of that is you stop making mistakes. So if a professional sits down and starts a design, it's just going to be the right design the first go. So if that's true, why even do thumbnails? Well, that doesn't happen. That's a myth. Yes, your judgment gets better, and yes, your design will sort of naturally skew towards more interesting results, but you're still going to make duds. If you get those duds out of the way every design by doing a bunch of thumbnails, your finished work, which is what the world sees, is just going to be better. And I'm not exaggerating when I say happy mistakes. This stripe that you see here on this mountain that I'm currently drawing, that was literally an accident. I hit the wrong button and I was trying to move a layer. Instead, I made this big swipe. I erased away a chunk of what I drew. And then I realized, ooh, I kind of like that. It reminds me a little bit of when you've been in a canyon and you see sort of stratified rock with different colors of layers. Looks cool. Nice graphic choice. So here I'm just pursuing that idea. And while the initial mistake might have been totally an accident, I'm now taking control of that and I'm using it towards my design. So it's not just letting a mistake happen and calling that done. It's letting that mistake inform my decision making. I hope the distinction there makes sense. But a lot of this comes back to the tools I'm using. This particular brush, the charcoal side, and the eraser that I'm using are sort of defining the look. And I've chosen them because I like the balance they serve between being too bossy and not bossy enough. Now, naturally, I like letting brushes be brushes, but the design doesn't end there. So a step I often take after this is to pick a couple of the ones I like, and now I'm just going to sort of chop and warp. If you've seen me do this before, this will look familiar, but it's just kind of a way to play. So maybe I like the bones, but the proportions aren't right. So it's time to just sort of liberally use the free transform tool, including the various warp handles, or the warp command, which just allows me to try different things. Once again, I can't be too precious with this. I'm thinking in sort of large ideas, not fussy details. So I can do things like taking this tree, layer via cut, and then I can just reposition it somewhere. Maybe this tree would look better if we're over here a little bit and a little bit bigger. Maybe I could make a duplicate of the tree and put it here and erase away the background. So there's like one peeking around the edge. So if I'm happy with that iteration, I can put it off to the side, make a copy, and I can just keep working like this. I've already made the big strokes. Now it's just time to try different options. It's entirely possible I'll go back to that original option that I started with, but it's always worth it to kind of run through the motions here. When seen this way, a drawing becomes more like raw materials of which you're going to build a different drawing out of. It's not just the strokes themselves are all you get. So obviously I'm speeding up the footage here, but I think it does a really good job to show my train of thought. And keyboard shortcuts do make this faster and easier, but I'm really just trying out different variations. What would the proportions look like if something was bigger, something was smaller? Because I'm really only using the thumbnail as a thinking tool. I'm going to refine the drawing next. And then it's nice to just go back and start doing little smaller details. So here I've gone from big ideas with a big brush down to smaller ideas with a smaller brush. This is when you can kind of iterate and refine. And I do like to do it on a couple different ones at a time, because what that allows me to do is just have a look across all of my different ideas all at once. And I might like something that's happening on one of them. And even if it's not completely right, it might inform the decision making that I do on this other one over here. I'm definitely looking at my reference as well. This is one of those things where, yes, I'm inventing ideas, but I'm doing it with the real world as sort of a backdrop. And at this point, I realize I've actually forgotten to add a tree. I, from the beginning, wanted to have a rock element, some foliage, and then a big tree. After all, that's why I got this reference. But putting that in with a smaller brush is probably a good idea, because here I've gotten the big shapes down with the big brush, and this falls into the more detail-oriented category. But eventually I come to a spread that I'm happy with. I'm probably going to pick one of these from each category. And that'll work really nicely, because I want to talk about two different things you can use this sort of a thumbnail for. One refined as a tone drawing, and one refined as a contour drawing. And each one is going to take advantage of a different tool. So for this first example, I want to show you a continued refinement. And I'm going to do that with charcoal and pencil. So here you can see I just have a flat background. There's nothing fancy happening here with layers. I'm just going to draw right on top. And I'm still using temp layers to my advantage. But what I'm doing here is I'm now getting more specific. If the thumbnail was just sort of the big idea, which happened quickly and had these nice gestural lines, now I'm going to zoom in and work a little slower and a little more carefully. Now I'm working with more intention and less dynamism. I'm working with, a slower hand. And temp layers are nice because they allow me to retain that underlying detail. And here I'm just adding superficial details on top, deciding which areas should have more detail, which areas should have less detail, while still trying to retain kind of the heart of the gesture. This is an opportunity to clarify certain things. Maybe I'll lower the detail in these background shapes and only add details to the foreground shapes. That can be a nice way to add hierarchy to an image. Sometimes I like to use the mixing cloth to really knock back detail areas, to kind of soften. And then I'll often go over top of these areas with more sharp details. This allows me to kind of reduce and simplify, and then add and clarify. Now clearly I'm speeding up the footage here, but that's because all I'm doing is on-screen blending. The techniques you're seeing are nothing new. The important part is the way I'm balancing the successes of the thumbnail and the additional details. So if I had too many details, I risk losing that immediacy and lightness of the thumbnail. I really liked what I started with. But if I don't add any details, well, then I just have a thumbnail. I really like working in this way because I still feel unburdened by Photoshop. I don't care about layers, I'm not doing any masking, I'm just painting and then flattening down. It's very direct. And generally speaking, when I work directly like this, I come up with more interesting designs because I'm not worrying about polish, I'm just drawing. And as I get more and more specific with this, now I can use a really narrow tool. So here I'm using the pencil. I'm really getting in there and adding those small details. If I had gone to the pencil right away, it would have a very different feel. Because what I did was sort of build from basic to complicated. And in doing so, I got to go from a wider and wider brush down to a smaller and smaller brush. So it's sort of like a funnel. If I had started immediately with the pencil, I would have been thinking in terms of contour. So just changing the tool I'm using, or the series of tools I'm using, has a big effect on the way I'm thinking. Now, neither one is wrong, but they have a sort of a different result. And I would encourage you to try out different methods and just see how the design process goes. And eventually I'm left with an image that I would say combines the lightness of the thumbnail while giving a little more information. This would be a good start for a painting. So if continuing to refine the drawing with values and shading was one direction, sometimes you want totally the opposite. Sometimes you just want line work. So in this way, I'm thinking about contour. And if you remember from the Precise Line series, these skills are all about choosing what you want, choosing which of the lines from your sketch are going to be worth carrying into this final, because you can't replicate every little detail from this value drawing. So it's up to me now to make choices. What stays, what goes. So I'm sort of finding a drawing inside of a sketch. Things that were blobs now have to become actual objects. Now clearly I've sped up the footage here once again, but that's because all I'm doing is techniques you've seen before. And I really like this kind of drawing because it's my sketch underneath. So even though part of it feels like tracing, I know that those big sweeping strokes were mine to begin with. Now I just have to kind of make decisions. This is what design is all about. Adding clarity, removing what's unnecessary, and following through on that initial hunch. Because that's really what the thumbnail was a hunch. Said, okay, something about this feels right, but it's not a finished drawing. So now it's up to me to take that initial spark, whatever was good about it, and apply the knowledge I have of design, balance and composition, rhythm, repetition, all of those compositional rules. Well, now those get to be applied to my very rough drawing. And hopefully what comes out the other side is a drawing that looks nice and dynamic and effortless, even though the truth is it went through a couple different stages. But all that confidence comes from my thumbnail. It's amazing how this works. I can do my thinking with a big wide brush, all the big ideas. And then when I have small ideas, details, polish, well, that's a small tool type of job. But working in this order from big and loose down to small and slow gives me the best of both worlds. Even though I'm using a small tool now, it gives me the feeling and the looseness of a big brush. And I think this is something that a lot of people lack when they draw with a narrow tool, especially when they're designing and don't have photos to look at. It can feel stiff because they didn't start with a loose sketch. They started immediately with this very sharp pencil, this tiny little tip. And the result is something that just gets too bogged down with detail, too specific and fussy. But in my opinion, starting with a big loose tool is a great way to end with a loose pencil line result. So here's the final, and I hope you can see that balance. Some of the lightness from the original thumbnail stayed here, but now I have the clarity and the detail of a contour drawing. So when we look at these two drawings, you might think, oh man, these couldn't be more different. One's a painting, essentially, it's values, and the other one is a contour drawing. But I chose these two examples to show just how versatile that thumbnailing phase is. It has nothing to do with the final result. It's just thinking of ideas. So in this case, we did a thumbnail that started with a big, wide, gestural charcoal. Well, in the next video, we're going to take a different approach. We're going to start with lines in the thumbnail. But I can't overstress the fact that the thumbnail is just thinking. How we resolve that idea into a finished image, that's something entirely different. So in the first example, we talked about tone. Essentially, we were thinking in masses and values, not in contours. Now, we got to contours eventually, but that wasn't how the idea process started. Well, if you want to do something like designing a dragon, for instance, I like to actually approach it from a linear standpoint. Because with a dragon, I know that I'm going to be incorporating different features, eyeballs and teeth and scales and claws and all that kind of stuff. And to my mind, that works easiest if I'm starting with lines. But just like in the previous example, I want to start as loose as possible. So to get both of these aspects, what I do is something called constructive anatomy. So here I'm using the charcoal tip, but I'm using blue because this is just going to be like a mannequin. So if I were to draw a skull, I might first start with, this very basic box form. And then on top of that, I would begin to add my features. Well, dragon anatomy is exactly the same. So I could begin with a very basic sphere that I attach, a neck to, and then maybe the snout would come off in this direction. And so in this way, it's a bit abstracted, but you can begin to see a dragon in here, although all I'm starting with is this 3-dimensional box form. On top of that, I might add, a spot where horns are going to go, maybe some spikes down the neck. Not getting specific at all using big gestural strokes, but I'm thinking of it in 3-dimensional terms. It's not a flat contour drawing. It is a draw through. I have a sense of volume, not just shape. So let's talk about the tool I'm using. It's wide, and it's wide on purpose. When I used to do life drawing, I'd love to use a Crayola crayon. I would start with this big, waxy, fast-moving mark. And then over top of it, maybe the next step would be to change to a pencil in a little darker value here. And then start to pick out shapes. So I'm using that framework as a starting point. It was how I was envisioning the dragon. But then I'm actually picking real details with a pencil. But I want to talk about those thumbnails a little longer before we get into details, because this is where the real thinking happens. Now, clearly, this involves linear perspective. I have to have a general understanding of how to draw 3D objects in space, because what I'm doing here is really shorthand. I am using this wide tool to help envision a shape without getting very specific. It's like doing that 30-second life drawing. I only have so much time to communicate an idea, so I have to be as simple as I can. To do this, I like to sometimes drop in center lines to kind of help me envision how the form is going. This might even be hard for you to see exactly where I'm going with this, because so much of it is shorthand for me personally. Like this I know is going to be a mouth. So put in a little mouth there, maybe some indications of teeth. It doesn't take much to get an idea in place. And if all you're thinking about is the idea, the details are really not important at this stage. So maybe this is enough to kind of flesh out later. So I could put this aside, make a new layer, and then start to think of a new shape. So I like to do ghosting, where I'll make these very light lines and just use it as a thinking tool. So I'll drop in a center line, maybe like that, a mouth, maybe eyes that are wider apart this time. And, there's really no rules to how this works. The goal is to set up your tools in your workspace in a way that just fosters looseness, that fosters experimentation and the ability to just try drawings. Maybe I like this one, maybe I don't, but the only way to find out is to get enough information to make a critical decision. So maybe I see this and I think, not sure, maybe try a little bit longer. And if it's not going in a direction I like, I'll put it over here anyway. But I'm just gonna move on to the next idea. You'll notice I'm not moving the camera around very much for this because it's really supposed to be as dynamic and fluid as possible. I think in terms of zooming in as associated with doing details. So if I were to get in like this and start working on the nostrils and little things like that, all of a sudden I drop out of that big idea mindset. I want to be doing big ideas. I'll think about small ideas later. But this nice wide tool gives me a few happy accidents, but ultimately it's still linear. I'm still thinking in things that have names, like teeth, for instance. It's easy enough to indicate teeth with a big fat tool without getting too detailed and worrying about value and tone. It's really, I'm just putting in objects. So maybe that's enough for that one. And I'm really just sort of thinking on paper. Sometimes I like to draw long lines in order to have fluidity, but it's also nice to draw a little longer than you anticipated because it kind of makes interesting mistakes happen. Once again, coming back to happy accidents, embracing that as part of the drawing process. And as you can see here, my ability to draw confidently in perspective is essential. What I'm doing here is skipping a lot of the foundational drawing stuff and just sort of doing shorthand. If you're not good at drawing in perspective, this sort of thumbnailing is going to be much harder because I'm not drawing a side profile of these. These are all drawn in 3/4. 3/4 drawings are good because they show a lot of information in a single drawing, but they're hard to do unless you know how to draw in perspective. But once again, you don't need to get too detailed at this phase. One of the things worth noticing while I'm working here is fluidity. I am being very intentional about drawing connected lines, thinking of ways where I can continue curves from one element of the drawing into the other elements. And what happens when I draw this way is just a nice rhythm to the entire design. Now, a downfall is that it's going to look a little sloppy. I'm going to draw lines too far and they're going to overlap other lines, but it doesn't matter. In the sketching phase that we're doing right here, all we're doing is dreaming up an idea. It's going to be refined, but that's for later. So right now, it takes a totally different mindset. I really like the way one of my art school professors described it. He talked about envisioning your pencil as like a figure skater, doing a figure skating routine, where you'd be gracefully flowing from one move into the next, moving your way around the arena. And clearly, I'm not as graceful as a figure skater, but I think the visual is a good one. To think about these lines not just moving quickly, it's not a race, but moving fluidly, that I'm connecting one curve into another ends up having certain rhythm to the final drawing. I also love the way that Michael Matisse describes this in his book, Force. He talks about the way that we balance ourselves and that our anatomy sort of naturally has this back and forth fluidity. And when you're drawing that, to think of your marks like a river, sometimes with wide curves, sometimes with tight curves. In fact, I should just take this moment right now. This book is great. If you have a chance, get Force. You won't regret it. But eventually, you're going to end up with your first round of thumbnails complete. Now, there's no guaranteed number you need for this, just enough that something's starting to look interesting. So here I picked 2 that are promising. And now I'm going to go into my favorite part of the thumbnail sketching phase. It's like editing an email before sending it. It's a good idea. If you just typed it all up and then just hit enter and sent it without even reviewing it, it probably wouldn't be the best email. The same is true for these thumbnail ideas. So here you can see I'm liberally using the brush and the eraser, and I'm just continuing on the initial hunch. What direction could this go in? I'm not really sure. It's often in this phase that I'll really find the real idea. The first idea might have been a little cliche or boring or not pushed far enough, but here I get to try out exaggeration and see different examples. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm only doing a few, but realistically, when I have a thumbnail that I like, I might do 10 or 15 variations of it because each drawing is so quick that it's worth finding out how it could look. The way I think of it, spending more time during this phase allows me to save time during the final image because I won't be fighting it. Here's where I'm doing my problem solving. So in this case, the brush and the eraser tool and the keyboard shortcuts that allow me to switch back and forth become thinking tools. I'm thinking on the page and just leaving myself a record as I work. So why did I make a clone just now? Well, what I do is instead of saving out a different version, when I hit a critical juncture, I'll make a clone because I want to leave the other one intact. That might have been the right idea, but it also might be the wrong idea. And so by making a quick clone like this, I'm able to continue down the rabbit hole. In this case, I'm using the warp tool, and Photoshop makes it so easy to just push and pull and skew the drawing around and allow me to try different proportions. It also has a really nice side effect of seeing before and after, because sometimes it's hard to know design in a vacuum. But if you have other examples of your work in progress, you can sort of judge relatively. Is what I'm doing right now better or worse than the old idea? Because it's definitely not always better. Sometimes you'll make a bunch of thumbnails and they'll get successively worse. Well, if you've been cloning them like this and then manipulating them in stages, you can just roll it back to an earlier one. Another way to think about it is like selective evolution. It's survival of the fittest. Each of these are another generation mutated slightly and hopefully for the better. But if they're not better, well, then they die off. But keeping my Photoshop process as simple as possible just allows me to focus on the design. So it's keyboard shortcuts, brush, and eraser, back and forth. Not worrying about layers, I'm just drawing flat. So I'm going to switch to the other thumbnail here, but really remember, were I doing this for personal work, I would do a number more of these. It's time so well spent. And this thumbnail here, I'd say is already pretty close. I wasn't recording at the moment, but you can see now this has a little more resolution than my original ones. But the thumbnail phase is a great time to keep working out those kinks. So here I'm really more clarifying than making radical changes or changing the proportions, but it's still an important step. And I think there's something psychologically useful about the term thumbnail. Because it's a thumbnail, or at least that's what I'm calling it, the stakes are low. I can make a messy drawing and I can not worry about clarity or I can not worry about layers. And I think that frees you up. I think the drawing ends up being better and lighter because of it. And sure, you could say that from a line quality standpoint, it's getting sort of tortured and overworked. But that doesn't matter. What I'm doing here, one more time, is I'm thinking. This is my thought process put on paper. Because when we switch to the next phase, now it's time to commit. Now I've brought that thumbnail into a new canvas and I've made it a white page. Why do I do this? There's no particular reason. I think it just feels more finished to have a white page instead of a gray one. So I drop the opacity and I just use it as a guidelines. Now, if you've watched the previous videos in this collection, this is familiar. I'm just getting in real close, picking a narrow brush, and committing to specific details. Here's where I'm looking for those overlaps and happy accidents, and then I'm making them actually look like stuff. Now, I don't want to bore you by showing you this over and over again, but this is the drawing that I end up with. It's clean, clear, it reads well, and really all that came because of the confidence of the process, the confidence of the tools. A big, wide, messy tool for ideas, a narrow, clean, tight tool for details. You really can't go wrong. All right, so far we've talked about individual little examples of different techniques. In one case, we started with tone and made big wide strokes. In another case, we were designing ideas with lines. Well, though those serve good examples, I want to show that all of these work in concert. So let's say this is what I want to design. I want to show you the various tools and rationale I have for going from the total rough sketch all the way to this finished drawing. And as you might imagine, the first step is making thumbnail sketches. For this fake assignment, I was thinking of Magic the Gathering. They have these really great item cards where it's some single jewel or something very geometric. So it has a great simple shape at a first glance. But then if you look closer, it's got all these little details. So as you see me making these thumbnails, know that that's what I'm going for. I'm going for something bold and geometric. But then once I do the final drawing, I know it's going to have a lot of little tiny shapes. And as you see me working here, it's clear that this is loose. Even though I know it's going to be a technical drawing when I'm done, the important thing here is to get ideas out quickly. And so, as I've shown in previous videos, this is what a nice wide tip is for. Here I'm ghosting, I'm overlaying, I'm switching to the eraser tool to erase these overlaps. It's all very fluid. I don't need to get too precious with these. Once again, it's getting ideas out onto the page. Here for this next one, I'm rotating the canvas. This is something that I actually do a lot more in my personal art than I do for recordings. Because when you're editing footage, it can be a pain to deal with rotating the canvas. But the truth is, this is something I do all the time. If you were to walk by me drawing on an average day, my canvas might be literally turned upside down just because that's the most comfortable thing for that moment. And notice as I make this idea, I'm drawing long overlapping lines. And this is definitely one of those cases where I find neat shapes accidentally. And then I just sort of roll with it. So I'm erasing away certain overlaps to make certain shapes stand out. I'm also trying to make sure that it has an interesting focal point and some general directionality. But as you can see, this is enough detail. I'm ready to call this one done. This third one here is the first example where I'm trying to overlap two different elements. So I have maybe two similar triangles connected by a cord. Maybe it's a necklace or a weapon or something. But this is one of those that I just have that feeling right away that it's not working. The design might be okay, but it's just not making use of this canvas format. There's a lot of unused space. So I'm going to go ahead and get past this one pretty quickly. But that's fine. The trick is to not get discouraged when you make drawings like these. That's why you're doing thumbnails. I'm only going to pick one of these anyway. So if I have 10 good ones, it doesn't really matter. All I need is the one good one. More often than not, what you have is 8 or 9 bad ones and one that's cool. For this one, I really wanted to play up on that idea of geometric contrast. So I want my subject, the necklace, to be a triangle. And if that's an angular, sharp triangle, maybe the background will be the opposite. So here I'm drawing circles. I'm not entirely sure at this point what the circles are, but a field of circles of different sizes really makes that triangle pop. So were I to take this one to the final, I would have to think, well, what are those circles? Maybe it's a pile of gold coins or it's bubbles, who knows? For now, I'm only thinking in terms of shape language. I'll figure out the details later. For this fourth one here, I'm trying to think of a different camera angle. So in the other ones, they've been more straight on. Well, this one, wouldn't it be interesting if it was sort of a higher camera angle looking down? And the goblet in this example might be an interesting choice because it could be very detailed on the outside, lots of embellishments, but then the inside of the drinking surface would be probably pretty bare, pretty clean. So having a big, bare element in the center of my composition, then surrounded by lots and lots of details, would give a nice contrast. It would give a nice focal point, surrounded by a sea of clutter. But I've certainly not decided one yet at this point, so I'm just going to keep working. This one here is going to be an interesting diagonal. Here, it's a little bit better fit in this composition if it's kind of turned on an angle. When you do that, it can really activate the image, but you have to figure out a way to counterbalance it visually. You don't want the image to feel too heavy on one side or the other. Now, this thumbnail immediately struck me as one that had a real opportunity. I was liking the combination of the circular shape with sort of radial details, but then also these interesting chains attached all around it. It immediately made me curious. And when a thumbnail kind of speaks out to me like that, what I like to do is to give it a little more detail. So I spent a little more time working on this thumbnail just to see if it was a good direction. And as you know, this is the one that I do end up completing. But the focus of the drawing at this point is still shape language. It's an interesting design. It's an interesting composition. I'm certainly not worried about line quality, and I definitely don't care about details. Right now, I'm trying to use this wide tip to do some exploration, some experimentation. But then I'll figure out all those little details in the later stages. So I look at all my thumbnails next to each other, and I am happy with the 6 chains. So I move that into a new document. And for me, this is just another phase of sketching, where the first round of thumbnails was, what is the object? The next round of thumbnails is, okay, I know what the object is, but what's the lighting? What's the staging going to be? I got to make it read well with light and dark. So to keep this lively and energetic, just like the previous phase, I'm using a wide brush. I'm also keeping the line work isolated. I got to make this easy for myself. So what I do is I keep the lines on the top of my document, set them to the multiply blending mode, and then all of the values just live underneath. So I'm going to be making a bunch of different layers, but they're all underneath those lines. Now, another thing I've done here is I've given myself a layer group with a layer mask. And all that does is just keeps me inside of the lines. Because if I was constantly worrying about painting outside of these borders, well, then I wouldn't be focusing on design. I need to make the document support my creativity. I need to just work on the ideas and the art, not the process. And here, even though I started with 3 value studies, I realized, that's not enough. I want to keep going. And I do this all the time. It's always time well spent to try a few more thumbnails. Because when you hit that right one, gosh, it saves so much time in the revision phase. And I think it's really amazing how different these can look with just a different arrangement of values. You can think of it as either the object as having a different local value, or you can think of it as lighting over top of the object. Either way, the arrangement of light and dark gives a totally different impression depending on what you choose. So I want something that's really going to highlight the details of this surface. I know it's going to have intricate little carvings, so there's got to be enough light on the front of the object. It might be more dramatic to have some rim lighting or some backlighting, but in this case, I do want to highlight the central details. Okay, as this is looking promising, I'm actually going to break out of my format. Traditionally, I'll have my line work above the values just so I don't accidentally cover them up. Well, here I need to add a little bit more detail and a little bit of rim lighting on top of those lines. So I just go ahead and make a new layer outside of the layer group and paint right on top. So in this case, I am making it a little more complicated, which is going to kind of slow me down, but it's worth doing because I'm pretty sure this is the direction I want to go in. So when I'm done with that, I look at all the different value thumbnails and I pick the one I want. And as you might guess, it is this last one that I was working on, and it often goes that way. So now I've established 2 things. I know what I'm drawing, and I know what the lighting and staging is going to be. So now it's time to get a little more detailed, because I don't want to get too detailed before I've answered the big questions. But with those out of the way, now it's time to take that thumbnail sketch, blow it up, and do another tighter round of pencils. You know how in those crime TV shows, they're always saying like, enhance, enhance, and the blurry photo from the subway station just gets clearer and then they know who the bad guy is? Well, that's what I'm doing here. I'm thinking of a very basic idea and I like the bones, but I need to add extra information. So here the tool is going to get a little narrower. These aren't my final lines, but I like to do one round of just design line work. This is when I figure out what the details look like. And this slightly narrower tool just helps me get slightly more specific. But this has circles, and I think circles are a great opportunity to switch to the circle tool. And if you've watched the previous videos in this collection, you already have this tool preset, and it just makes it so much easier. Because sure, I could freehand the circle, but especially in this design, there's a bunch of concentric circles, and well, they're very hard to do manually. So I think it is not cheating, and it's probably more efficient to define the details in this case by using a little bit of vector assistance. And here's where those technical drawing tips start to come into play. So I have some overlaps. Well, no problem. Now I just use a mask to hide away those areas that I want to cover up. If you've watched the technical drawing video, this is already familiar to you. But it is a really powerful technique to take advantage of both the clarity and precision of vector, but also the flexibility of hiding and revealing with masks. And at this point, I'm just knocking in those last important lines. I really like to work on the biggest shapes and the biggest lines first, and then I'm allowed to get into details. If I jump into details too soon, I risk wasting time, because if I draw a detail that's with the wrong proportions, it doesn't matter how cool it is, I have to start over. So the final step of this tighter line drawing is to just add in those little details. Now, clearly these are not too clean. I'm sort of implying detail that I know I'm going to clarify later. It gives me more information than the thumbnail did, but I haven't spent so much time being clean and picky. So now I'm ready to move on to the next phase. Now I put everything into a new composition, and then I'll use a gradient map adjustment layer to turn it blue. And the reason I do this is just because I want to have a lower contrast blueprint, and I'm going to do black lines on top, so I can just keep track of what I'm drawing versus my guidelines. So up to this point, what I've been using have been freehand tools. I used real wide sketchy tools and then progressively narrower tools, but at this point, I need to be precise. So some artists at this point will do still freehand tools. They'll just draw very, very carefully, very slowly. My preference these days is to use vector. Now, if you watch the technical drawing series, you know all about this. So I'm actually going to speed through some of these steps because they're really beyond the scope of this course. But the important takeaway is that the subject matter here lends itself to precision. I'm going to want to be able to shift things around without losing clarity, and I'm going to want to be able to have very, very clean circles. There are times when I will duplicate circles because they're concentric, so it's just easier to start with one in the right position and then duplicate others. I'm also going to change the line weight, and this is one of those really nice things that Vectors allows you to do retroactively. So I can have thin lines and thick lines, all of which can be transformed whenever I want. But the real challenge with this process is when things start overlapping. There's going to be extra lines you don't need, and anytime that happens, I use masking to hide it away. So I carry on in this way, locking in the major lines in this image. But at some point, I have enough established that I'm not so concerned about sticking with vector. Now, the next thing I want to include is the really fine details. If you look here at what we're going towards, we've got these interesting little radial loops, sort of like a trim piece. Well, this is a perfect opportunity for some Photoshop trickery. The way I'm going to make this is essentially to create a single design element, and then I'm going to repeat that design element, and then make a number of these designs in a single line. And once I have a row of them, then I can free transform it using the warp command. And then in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there's a drop-down menu called presets. This is where you choose the arch preset. And then pretty quickly you can turn that straight line into a half circle. And then once you have one half circle, you can duplicate it and have a full circle. This is really cool. So I'll take this, turn it into a smart object, which just means I can have a little more flexibility with free transforms, and then I'll put it into position. So this means that I didn't have to worry about drawing all those complicated little loops in perspective. I started simple, used duplication to my advantage, and then when the whole thing was ready, just skewed it in perspective. This is something I do all the time, and it is very handy. And then the next step is to just make more of these, because I wanted to have them at slightly different scales. So that means I'm going to have to start the whole repeat business over again. But it is a really effective way to have controlled, repeated details and delicate trim elements. They're really nice. Now, it's definitely not a hard and fast rule, but at this time, I feel comfortable switching to freehand pencil. There's going to be a lot more details on this thing, but I feel comfortable adding them by hand because I've established enough important landmarks. I personally don't have enough confidence in this sort of drawing to have started freehand, but with this much established, I can't really go wrong at this point. So here I'm just going to start ad-libbing and adding in little details with a lighter line weight just to kind of flesh it out, to add some more interest. Ultimately, the big lines and the major shapes that I put in at first are going to be the ones the viewer sees. That's sort of the initial read. Now I'm just doing secondary read, the cool little details. But eventually I'm happy with that. And then it's time to add in the chains. Chains are no fun, so I've been avoiding them up to this point, but I think this is something probably worth doing with vector. But as you might guess, these are repeated elements. I'm only going to make one, and then I'm going to clone it around the image. So the way I start this is with the rectangle tool using rounded corners, which is an awesome feature. And I essentially make one of each type of link. Then I clone one of each of these, move them into position, and then I assemble the actual links of chain. Finally, I clean up the overlaps and get it all looking nice, and I merge those all down into a single layer. Once I'm happy with that, then I'm just going to clone this 5 more times and move them into position around the image. The real takeaway here is to look for repetition. Something as annoying as a chain might make your image look cooler, but there's no honor in drawing it manually by hand 6 different times. If you can draw it once and repeat it, that's the smarter way to work. All right, now speaking of smarter way to work, there is something that is really just too cool for me not to mention. And that is this piece of Windows-only software called Lazy Nezumi Pro. And what this does is it takes my stylus input and then it sort of filters it. So if I were to just draw a normal squiggle and try and kind of trace this right here, it would be tough. As all the reasons we've talked about, it is a mechanical challenge and it takes practice. Well, an alternative to practice is using this filter. So here the preset I'm using is called Massive Smooth. And what that does is it adds lag to the brush and it smooths it out. It sort of averages what I'm doing. And the feeling of it is very odd if you're not used to it. It kind of has a delay, which feels a little weird, but it's doing that because it's doing this sort of moving average of the position of your tip. And you can do things that are not just position. You can have it average your pressure. There's really a whole bunch of settings. But when you draw your lines, it's really nice because, well, it kind of approximates using a ruler on traditional paper, although obviously it's not in straight lines. It does something that is kind of hard to explain that you really just have to feel. Now, this of course poses the question, is it a crutch? Will it make me worse at drawing? Will it prevent me from getting better at drawing? Is it worth using? I think there's no great answer for this. Because yes, it is a crutch. In fact, that's why I've waded this deep into the series to even mention it. Because maybe you think this would replace drawing with vector. Well, yes and no. It's a different sort of thing. I still use vector drawing all the time. These control handles are really hard to beat. But as I've talked about the tool having an impact on the way we think, I think there's something different between laying down control points and sketching. So here, I'm still sketching. It feels like I'm drawing, but there's just a little bit of software in the middle. Software sort of interpreting what I'm doing and then adding a little bit of its own touch. So in my mind, that's sort of a compromise between something that's very, very mechanical, like the pen tool, and something that's completely organic, like the brush tool. We could call Lazy Nezumi sort of a middle ground. Now, it does not train you to get better at freehand drawing. It essentially trains you to get better at using Lazy Nezumi, and you can get really great results with it, but they don't necessarily transfer to drawing with paper the way these actual mechanical hand-eye coordination skills do. Okay, but this piece of software has been around for a few years, so what I really want to show you is the updated feature. And this is something that I've just wanted personally for years, and I'm so thrilled they decided to put this in. So I'm going to change the preset to one called Connected Lines. This is the ruler that I always wish Photoshop had. So you can see here there's a new ruler element added to my screen, and that just gives me something to snap my line along. And you can see I can draw as far as I want. I can use pressure, light to dark. This is so nice. It's unbelievable. I have been doing the normal drawing method, which is click, shift, click. I've been doing that for years. If that doesn't work quite right enough, then I'll use a pen line. None of these feel the way I think Photoshop should operate. It seems like a no-brainer that Photoshop would figure out a way to put in a ruler that allows me to use the brush tool and to snap along a line. That's beautiful. It's simple. I'm not using any keyboard shortcuts. It's just sort of following based on when I let go of the pen. It gives me this new position so I can move the ruler wherever I want. Anyway, this is just, I'm speechless. This is a deceptively simple change or deceptively simple addition to Photoshop. But in my mind, this makes the $35 investment a no-brainer. If all you gave me was this little ruler, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. It's so great. Now, I'm not sponsored by this company. It's just an independent developer, so I love what he does and I want to spread the word. But it really does bring up an interesting question, which is how important is it for us to be able to do loose freehand drawing versus getting the drawing you want, but doing it with a mechanical aid like Lazy Nezumi? Okay, I'm done with my tangent. Let's get back to the drawing at hand. Okay, with all my chains sort of erased and cleaned up, I'm ready to call these my final lines. So the final step is to crop down the document, get rid of the blue background, and to merge everything together on a single layer. And once that's all cleaned up, making the render is easy. Now, it is outside of the scope of this course, but if you want to know about rendering in grayscale, check out the basic rendering series, and you can learn all about it. But the real takeaway here is how the line work allowed me to think of ideas. The tool I used helped to dictate the way I was thinking, because that's really where speed comes from. The ability to come to a clean drawing like this one was really my sense of strategy. It was knowing the right tool to use at each stage in the process. But you and I, we're different. You are going to prefer different tools for different jobs. But I challenge you to be critical about the tools you're using. Ask yourselves these questions. Is this tool loose enough to let me think of big ideas? Is it narrow enough to help me design tiny details and to have control? There's no perfect brush for every situation. And part of getting better at art is figuring that out for yourself. But learning is hard. I think more than other subjects, specifically doing line drawing takes a real amount of practice. If you've gone through all these 5 parts of the collection, don't expect to be really good right away. It takes discipline and tenacity. And if you really want to get better at drawing, practice like crazy, you'll get there. Now, if you bought these series as part of a bundle, you also have a portfolio builder. And once you've had a while to practice these skills, I'd encourage moving on to that and giving it a try. It's sort of a fun assignment that really puts these to the test. But whether or not you get that one, I just want to thank you for buying this series. Your support makes this site possible and makes a big difference to me personally. So thank you. Have fun drawing, and thanks for coming to the site, guys.